The Wheel of Fire still burns, the fated reunion. On top of a large cliff, Naruto and his team stood side by side as they gazed upon the small, quiet Banero town. The town itself looked to have an old Wild West theme to it, at least the team had assumed so from the movies they had seen during their youth due to the fact that they were based off of merely fantasy. The town was surrounded by vast forests and huge rocks that faced upwards in different directions, known as Banana Rock according to the map that Naruto had picked up at a previous town. The team were situated on the highest of these rocks. It had been about 30 minutes since they had detonated the exploding tags at Orochimaru's hideout, and thanks to the barrier Naruto had put up, it looks like nobody was aware of what had happened. This was to be expected since the barrier not only prevented sound from traveling, but it also limited any of the vibrations from within the earth to reach outside of it. This time lapse had given the shinobi of the team time for their chakra to regenerate, as well as recover from any wounds or mental stress they had accumulated through the course of the mission. From the chakra levels Naruto was able to sense, most of the villagers within the town were civilians. However, there were a few signatures that could borderline on shinobi levels. This meant that either they really were shinobi and were suppressing their chakra, they had shinobi training but had no affiliations with any of the villages, they were nuke-nin, or they were retired shinobi. They were too high up from the town for Naruto to be able to accurately sense them with his haki, so they were going to have to do this the old-fashioned way. But before that, I think it would be best if we gathered all of the storage scrolls and sent them back to Konoha in case something goes wrong with this part of the mission. I can't help but feel that something going to happen soon, though that may just be my imagination. Naruto spoke as he walked away from the edge of the cliff, towards the middle and knelt down on one knee where he began removing the numerous storage scrolls from weapons pouch and his flak jacket pockets. The other members slowly followed him and replicated his actions. They didn't know exactly why, but there was an odd sense of foreboding in the pit of their stomachs. That was the only reason they didn't dismiss Naruto's words as merely paranoia. Though that still begged the question of how they would get the scrolls back to the village. After everyone had emptied their pockets, 10 storage scrolls lay in the middle of the circle that the shinobi had created. Narumi and Natsuki were unfamiliar with the workings of storage scrolls and they had not been given an information retrieval mission, so they hadn't contributed any of the scrolls. Mikoto had filled up 4 entire storage scrolls, Satsuki had contributed 5, and Naruto had only recovered enough information to only need 1, and then there was the scroll that contained Yugo's dismembered remains. Nissan? How are we going to transport the scrolls back to the village? Is part of the team returning to the village early? Natsuki asked with a tilt of the head. She had been silent ever since they left the hideout as everything that she had done in the hideout finally settled into her mind. Though, she wasn't really hit with deep feelings of remorse or guilt like her sister had been, what she felt was nothing. It was something of an out-of-body experience. She knew she had killed those men, but yet, it felt like she hadn't at the same time. It was odd. She didn't receive a verbal response. Naruto merely stepped back a few meters and bit his thumb to draw a bit of blood, after which he placed his hand on the surface of the rock. He had mastered the summoning technique to such a degree during the reprieve between the second and third stages of the Chunin exams that he no longer required hand seals to summon any of his phoenixes. There was a large burst of smoke, signifying the use of the summoning technique from the actions that Naruto had previously preformed. Once the smoke cleared, the eyes of all 4 kunoichi widened, even Satsuki's and Mikoto's, who knew what kind of contract Naruto held. Standing, or rather levitating, in front of Naruto was a bird-like dragon. It possessed an aerodynamic body, with the lower half of its body colored blue with jet-plane wings and fin-like feet and white and blue arms that looked like they could be tucked into its body. On its chest was a red triangular mark. The upper half of its body was white and it had triangular ears and a blue face with a white pentagon in the middle. An outsider would find it strange for a dragon-like creature to be a part of the Phoenix contract, but the dragons were the descendants of the Phoenix, so it makes sense if one knew the relationship between the two species. It is rumored that the dragon contract is the most powerful of the summoning clans, but that is only rumor. There is no such contract. That is because the dragons lie in the depths of MT Silver or roam the atmosphere where no other creature would be able to survive. Just as the dragons have descended from the phoenixes, their abilities have also evolved and spread out so that their abilities do not lie solely with fire. From the looks of this particular one, it appeared to be specialized in speed, perhaps being able to fly so fast that it could be described more accurately as teleportation. Sorry for calling you out so suddenly, Latios. Naruto apologized merely out of courtesy. Latios was one of the phoenixes that he had taken a liking to him during that month he had spent on MT Silver. He may have been a dragon, but Latios was still considered to be a phoenix because he was their descendant. There was another interesting fact about Latios. He couldn't speak the way most of the other of his kind could, though it wasn't due to a lack of intelligence. Actually, he was one of the smartest of his kind. He possessed incredible telepathic abilities and communicated with others that way. "It's okay, Naruto, I told you that you may summon me whenever my presence is required. How may I be of service?" As Latios spoke telepathically to Naruto, its eyes turned a shade of light blue to signal the use of its telepathy. To outsiders it would seem that the interactions between the two were no different from any other animal, with the dragon giving off a small roar that sounded more like a sonar than anything. But it was obvious to the four still gobsmacked Kunoichi that these two understood each other very well. "I need you to transport these documents back to Konoha as quickly as possible. They're incredibly important and we still have a mission to complete. I'd normally just wait until we could bring them back ourselves, but I can't help but feel that something is going to go very wrong very soon." Naruto spoke as he unsealed a messenger bag from the scroll that held his personal effects, and placed the scrolls containing the information they had retrieved into it. "Very well, it shall be done. Once I reach your village, I will take my human form and deliver them to your sensei." Latios dipped his head down so that Naruto could strap the messenger bag around the dragon's neck. After which Latios raised his head back up and placed his arm around the bag, securing it so that it would not fall off when he reached top speed. "Sorry for all the trouble." Naruto apologized once more. He didn't like treating some of the most majestic creatures in the world like they were merely a delivery service to be used at his convenience. After giving one final nod of understanding to his summoner, Latios disappeared faster than the blink of an eye, leaving a silent sonic boom in its wake. After the dust cleared from the small explosion, Naruto turned back around, only to be greeted with the frozen, wide-eyed expressions of the four Kunoichi. What dash? Narumi tried to muster her voice, but was cut off by Naruto. "We don't have time for questions, we still have a mission to complete." Naruto spoke, not really wanting to talk about his summons right now. It's not that he was still trying to keep his abilities a secret, but a sonic boom just went off from Latios's departure. It was likely that nobody else heard it because of how quiet it was or heard it because of how tall the rock formation they were on was, but they should still disperse as soon as possible so that nobody would be able to sense their presence if they got close enough. Naruto walked back to the edge of the cliff to assess just how they would divide up the town. They couldn't just scout it out in a large group such as the one they were currently in. Their large chakra signatures would alert any shinobi in the area of their presence, especially with 2 Jinchuriki on the team. They would need to divide and conquer just like they had with Orochimaru's hideout. Even if he was the only sensor-type shinobi amongst them, the Kunoichi should at least be able to sense chakra signatures and the presence of other shinobi, even Natsuki and Narumi, who had abysmal chakra control and sensing capabilities. The population of the town was not too large, so locating and investigating their targets shouldn't be too difficult. The town had a population no greater than a few thousand people, most of which were farmers who worked in the fields on the outskirts of town. That meant it would be quite easy to spot someone who wasn't from High no Kuni since they would obviously be out of place. "We'll split up into the same teams that we had when we hit the hideout." Naruto didn't even turn his attention away from the townspeople that meandered through the streets of the town, mainly in the square and the shopping district, but he knew that the rest of his team had their eyes on HM and were vividly listening to his words. "Natsuki and Narumi, you'll take the eastern side of the town. Mikoto-chan, Satsuki, you'll take the western side. Since I'm the only censor here, I'll take the southern side where the town square, shopping district, and most of the residents are." He received an affirmative nod from each of the Kunoichi after they had received their assignments. Though a few of them furrowed their eyebrows after they had realized that one of the sections was missing. "What about the northern section?" Natsuki asked with a confused expression making its way onto her face. Unknown to the Kunoichi, but not to Naruto, the northern section was mostly for agricultural usage and where a majority of the farms laid. The only structures in those areas were farmhouses, stables, and silos used for holding grain. There were at most a handful of people in the area at the time. If there were any Suna or Oto shinobi remaining in the area, they would try to blend in a much more populated area. If they were to take refuge in the northern sector, they would stick out like a sore thumb. The northern sector is used for agricultural usage, any foreign shinobi would stand out far too much there. They would take refuge in the more populated areas of the town if they wanted to blend into their surroundings. That leaves the 3 other sectors which have far more people traveling through them constantly. Naruto informed the group as he finally turned around to face them. He received a nod in understanding from the girl who had voiced her confusion, after which, something caught his eye. The Konoha Hitaiate. That simple piece of metal strapped on in various different places amongst their group would undoubtedly alert the townspeople to their presence, especially since it was so far away from any of the shinobi villages. While the sword strapped to Natsuki's waist, as well as the additional shinobi equipment they carried would also be a giveaway, they would draw far less attention as opposed to the hitayatesh and the flak jackets that he and Mikoto wore. But before we split up, I've just realized we stand out far too much as it is. These people will be weary of our presence knowing that we're Konoha shinobi, which in turn will make it much harder to keep a low profile. Naruto lectured as he unclipped his hitayate that was acting as his belt buckle and took off his Chunin flak jacket, leaving his upper body only in his mesh shirt. It'll work best for us if no one even realizes we're here, but some attention can't be avoided. Our exposure will be limited without us wearing our hitayatesh or our flak jackets. After hearing Naruto's reasoning, Mikoto and Satsuki began taking off said items and storing them in their personal sealing scroll that held their personal effects, easily understanding that for a pseudo-undercover mission any clothing that gave away their origin would be out of the question. Actually, villagers way out in the middle on nowhere wouldn't easily recognize clan emblems, but none of the kunoichi here were wearing anything of the sorts anyways. Aren't shinobi always supposed to wear their hitayatesh while on missions to represent their village? Narumi asked incredulously, a bit reluctant to remove her hitayate after all the stories her parents used to tell her about bringing honor to their village and how a mark to the hitayate was a shinobi's greatest shame. That was why Nuke-Nins drew a slash mark through their former village's symbol. Though recently she had started to doubt a lot of what her parents had been telling her, especially through the course of this mission. The first was when she realized why her parents hadn't even mentioned their favorite form of shinobi art in front of her and her siblings, much less taught them the basics of Fuinjutsu. The second was when their current mission had been explained to them in detail in the forest on the first night after they had left Konoha. Her parents had always told her bedtime stories about how shinobi protected their village from all the evils of the world and strove to protect the people precious to them. Were all those stories just lies to get them interested in being shinobi? The third was when she found out really how much her parents' neglect of Naruto affected his mental state. She couldn't imagine what it was like to live every day of her life questioning whether or not if her being born was a good thing. Of course it was, and she was told that every day, though she had never thought people could possibly think that their very existence was a sin. The fourth and final straw was when she had taken her first life in that underground hideout. She may never be the same again after that experience, whether that was a good or bad thing, she had yet to determine. Yes, Narumi had undoubtedly lost a lot of faith on everything she had been told by her parents up to this point. Natsuki most likely had the very same thoughts running through her head. She couldn't help but wonder why her parents had been keeping so much from her for so long and if there was more that they were hiding. In this case, it would only hinder us completing our mission. Wouldn't that be a worse case for representing our village rather than not wearing a piece of metal strapped to some cloth? Naruto asked rhetorically, and he pulled the storage scroll out of his chest pocket and sealed away his flak jacket and his hitayate. Narumi nodded in understanding and began to untie the Konoha hitayate that was around her forehead, albeit a bit reluctantly. Natsuki, who had been listening to the interaction between her older brother and her sister, smiled at Narumi's compliance. Normally, Narumi would have stood her ground and continued to argue, but it seemed that the recent events had caused her to doubt her parents' teachings. Natsuki felt the very same way. Seeing that the entire team was now free of anything linking them back to Konoha, Naruto felt that he should continue with his orders. Now this part of the operation should take quite a bit of time. You are to locate any and all chakra signatures and determine whether or not they are foreign shinobi. If you determine they are, in fact, enemy shinobi trespassing in Hai no Kuni, you are to deal with them just as before. Do not eliminate them in the middle of the street or open area, rather, tail them until they are in a secluded area, then finish them off and hide the body. Understood? Naruto received affirmative responses from the 4 women now standing before him. This isn't a time-sensitive mission as it was before, meaning there is no need to rush or blow your cover. Naruto spoke, giving his final words of advice to his team. You'll be investigating these people and, if you deem them a threat, are to tail them where you'll eliminate them. This process will be slow and will require the utmost patience. Regardless of whether or not you've investigated all your targets or not, meet back at this location in exactly 4 hours to check in and report your progress. You know your assignments, move out. Not a moment later were there 4 gusts of wind and swirls of leaves where the 4 kunoichi had previously been, signifying the simultaneous usage of the leaf shunshin to reach the outskirts of their designated sector in order to inconspicuously enter the town. Naruto gave one last glance to the town before fading out of sight in his own shunshin. Southern Sector, Shopping District. Naruto could be found walking down the length of one of the streets within the southern sector of the shopping district. For a town with such a small populace, it was far larger than he had anticipated from merely studying it from so high up on one of the banana rocks. Though this may only have accounted for his sector, as it was the main attraction of the town and where the townspeople spent their day when they found the time. It had been close to 2 hours since he had parted ways with the rest of his team, and he had already encountered all of his predetermined targets as of now. He had located at least a dozen chakra signatures when he had been scouting the town for his team. 6 of them were located in the southern sector, 3 in the eastern, and 3 in the western. Naruto had set the 4-hour time restriction because he knew it would take the other 2 teams longer to do their parts. He had only had such an easy job with this because of his sensor-like abilities and his Kanbunshaku haki, though for some reason his haki wasn't able to reach a certain area, or perhaps it was being cancelled out. That couldn't be right because no one else should be capable of using haki due to it being such an ancient art. Naruto chose to push it to the side for now and merely chalked it up to him having not mastered his haki yet. Those 6 he had been tasked with investigating turned out to be quite a disappointment, or perhaps this was the better outcome. It really depended on how one looked at it. His first target was an old man at about 90 years of age with dementia. He couldn't even continue living day-to-day life like he once had, let alone continue with shinobi duties. The second target had been a muscular man in his late 40s who was clearly used to working in the fields. Chakra is a life energy that all living beings now possess, therefore, those who are accustomed to strenuous physical labor would have higher chakra levels than ordinary civilians, even if they haven't unlocked their chakra yet. The third was merely a child, not even 7 years of age yet, who had been abandoned as a child and left at the orphanage just after he was born. He had lived there ever since. The fourth was in a similar condition to his first target, only instead of dementia she was in her final stages of cancer. The elderly woman would likely be dead by the end of the month. The fifth target was a pregnant woman who was in her final stages of pregnancy. There was no possible way that she had participated in the invasion of Konoha while in that kind of condition. The sixth and final target was a teenager, about the same age as Naruto, who seemed to be nothing more than a common street thug. It appeared that even small towns such as this one were not immune to crime. It turned out that not one of his targets had been any shinobi from the remnants of the Suna/Oto army. That cemented the reasoning that investigating the town was purely a precautionary measure. Currently, Naruto was simply walking the length of his sector to kill time and to finalize that there were no foreign shinobi in the town. Though, he couldn't help but feel that he was overlooking something crucial. Perhaps it was connected to his imperfection with haki when he came closer towards a certain area of the town. Or perhaps it had to do with the feeling that someone was constantly watching him as soon as he stepped foot in town. Not those odd looks he was getting from the female population from only having a mesh shirt that was almost see-through, covering his upper body, nor was it from the townspeople or the targets he had been tracking. He didn't know why, but he felt an ominous feeling in the pit of his stomach once again. He shook his head, breaking him away from such thoughts. He couldn't afford to have his mind clouded at the moment. Perhaps the rest of his misfit team would be able to find what he couldn't. He would just have to put his faith in them for now. As he brought himself out of his inner thoughts and looked up at his surroundings, he noticed that he had traveled from the outskirts of the southern sector all the way to the middle where the town square was located. What was strange, though, was that compared to the bustling streets he had been traveling earlier, there was not a single soul in sight. What was even stranger is that Naruto could hear the crackling of lightning around him when there was not a single cloud in the sky for miles. It wasn't the sound of that lightning chakra that shinobi use, but natural lightning itself. As soon as Naruto realized that the cause of the noise was that the electrical sound waves that traversed the air around him had been turned into actual electricity, it was too late as the explosion of a thunderclap resounded around him as well as through the rest of the town. Eastern sector, minutes earlier. Natsuki and Narumi shared a simultaneous groan as they could finally slow down their pace now that they no longer had to locate and tail their targets. This kind of work had been much more difficult than they had expected, though that may have been the result of their personalities and favored fighting style. As far as their personalities went, they were quite different people, with Natsuki being almost a carbon copy of their mother and Narumi being somewhat of a tomboy and only putting up with the dresses and feminine clothing that her mother picked out for her for the time being. However, they did share the same base traits, with both being boisterous and exuberant individuals, being very picky eaters as seen by their steady diet of ramen, and their love for pranks. They also had a similar verbal tic, just like their mother, but unlike her, through years of training and discipline, they had managed to suppress it for the most part. Now it only made itself known when they were very excited or feeling incredibly strong emotions, positive ones in particular. Their fighting style also turned out to be similar since they were trained by the same people, though they preferred to rush into battle as opposed to thinking of the situation beforehand, one of their many faults. Due to these traits, they had accumulated a completely incompatible relationship with intelligence work and tracking missions. The level's patience and stealth required for these types of missions was far too much for either of them to handle. They had nearly blown their cover and given away their presence to their targets over a handful of times in just over 2 hours because of their incompetence in this particular field. While they were not a good match for this kind of work, they had managed to fulfill their part of the mission. All 3 of their targets had been duds. Their first target was a teenage girl who looked to be a severe drug addict. There was no humanly way possible that she was in any kind of condition for shinobi work, much less participate in a full-scale invasion of one of the 5 great hidden villages. Though to make sure they did tail her for some time in order to come to their conclusion. The second target was farmworker who was on his day off. It seemed he was the one who owned the farm in the furthermost section of the northern sector who provided the entire town with their supply of crops and grains, judging by the conversations he had and people who he had interacted with throughout the day. Their third and final target was an elderly man who was restricted to a wheelchair and whose sight was rapidly deteriorating, judging from what they had overheard his nurse say. In other words, the town looked as though it hadn't had a shinobi presence here in months, if not years. Though that wouldn't be very surprising since the town was pretty out of the way from any of the other towns. They still had 2 hours to observe their surroundings before they needed to meet back up with the rest of the team, so they were wandering aimlessly through the now empty streets in the direction of the northern sector because that area of the eastern side was the only place that they hadn't checked out yet. Though, now they could pose as regular girls walking down the street instead of having to stick to the shadows or blend into the crowds that had previously flooded the narrow streets. "Narumi, are you okay? You've seemed kind of out of it for a while now." Natsuki asked her twin sister worriedly. Though she had an idea of why she had been estranged and silent for the most part. Once again the blonde-haired girl refused to respond. She had only spoken when it was in regards to the mission, no more, no less. Natsuki sighed, knowing how thick-headed and stubborn her own sister was. It would be much harder than this to get through to her. "You're thinking about what happened back at the hideout, aren't you?" Natsuki was met with a long silence once more, causing her to let out another sigh. Just as it seemed that this conversation would die out, Narumi finally found her voice. "How do you do it? How can you be so normal right now?" Natsuki stopped walking and looked over at her sister who was clearly disturbed by what she had done. "You feel remorse for killing those shinobi back at the hideout?" Natsuki's response was a statement, not a question. I know I'm a shinobi, and I know I shouldn't feel like this, it's just, I can't help it. Then I look over at you and everyone else on the team, and it seems like taking another person's life doesn't even affect all of you at all." Narumi was trying hard to hold back her tears. She knew what she was getting into today and she knew the reasons for why she needed to do it, but every time she closed her eyes, even if it was only to blink, she saw all the faces of the people she had just killed. Natsuki was silent for a moment, not exactly sure what to say to bring comfort to her distraught sister. "I'll be honest with you and tell you straight out that it's kinda hard to explain, you know. On one hand I was there, I know that I killed those people and shed all that blood, but on the other hand, it feels like it wasn't me who killed them, or like I know I did it but I haven't been able to process it yet." "I see. Though the only thing that has been running through my mind recently is the story Nissan told us about his experience yesterday. I guess I feel that I just don't have the right to feel guilty or remorseful for what I've done, knowing his experience had to have been at least 100 times worse. He never had anyone to comfort him all his life, never to show them that they cared, no matter how much we try to deny it. But when we get back to the village Tusan, Kaa-chan, Tsunade-oba, Ero, Sanin, Kakashi-sensei, all of them there beside us, to comfort us, knowing that I wasn't there to help Nissan makes me feel that I don't have the right to feel bad for myself." Natsuki honestly answered Narumi's unasked question. After hearing her brother's story yesterday, she couldn't help but beat herself up for having such selfish thoughts when he had to go through all of this so early on and on his own at that. Narumi's eyes widened as she heard her sister's reasoning. She knew that her sister was attached to their older brother, perhaps more so than a sibling should ever be, so at the beginning of her explanation, the blonde simply disregarded it as her willing to do anything for him. But now that Narumi fully understood what her sister was trying to say, she couldn't help but feel a pang of regret in her chest, not because she was thinking about her recent kills again, but because she hadn't realized how selfish she was being. If what she had been feeling up until now was enough to drive her over the edge, then just how much pain had her brother gone through? How was a person able to deal with all of that mental trauma on their own? There was a long silence as Narumi went through all of these thoughts in her head, long enough for several minutes to pass and for them to reach the northernmost section of the eastern sector. Natsuki was looking over at her sister worriedly, wondering what kind of resolution her twin would come to. A small smile graced Narumi's face as she looked over to the redhead. Thanks Natsuki, I think I understand things a little better now. I am also sorry for accusing you of not feeling the same way as I did after all this time. I didn't even consider your feelings or what anyone else was going through. No need to apologize. Natsuki replied as she shook her head side to side. You were completely justified in what you thought, just don't assume that every person will have the same views of the world that you do. Personal beliefs and ideals are derived from our past experiences. If you don't share those experiences, then your interpretation of reality may be different than another's. Even though you and I have pretty similar experiences, doesn't mean we'll always have the same opinions or react the same to everything. We're two different people after all, even if we are twins. Were you quoting Nissan just now? Narumi was slightly amused, a complete 180 as to how she had been feeling just minutes before. He does have a way with words, don't you think? He always does know just what to say at the exact right time. Narumi responded, though when she looked over, she noticed that her sister was already in one of her fantasies with a bit of drool coming out of the corner of her mouth. A shiver went down Narumi's spine. She didn't even want to know what her twin was imagining. On the topic of family, something did come to mind though. Hey, Natsuki. What is it? Said girl responded as she turned around once more. What do you think Tusan and Kaa-chan would have said if I'd had this conversation with them instead of you? Narumi asked, wanting to know if her sister had been having the same doubts as she had been having. Natsuki paused for a minute to think about that before coming up with her answer. They probably would have said something along the lines of, some people are just better at covering up their feelings than others. In fact, you should feel guilt and remorse every time you take another's life. It's what makes us human. If you don't even feel a little remorse for killing someone, then you're not even human at all, something similar to that. Narumi stared silently at her sister for a moment, studying her reaction. Seeing the look that Narumi was giving her, Natsuki waved her arms in front of her defensively. Don't get me wrong, I love Tusan and Kaa-chan, but lately I've just been seeing everything a bit clearer and, I guess I'm just having trouble believing everything that we've been taught up till now. Haven't you been feeling the same way? Natsuki had been thinking about the time she had learned the truth about Kurama during the invasion and the numerous times that they had conversed afterwards, and while he hadn't been very forthcoming with telling her everything she wanted to know, she had learned more about the history of this world from him than from her own parents. Yeah, that's why I asked. Narumi responded dejectedly. Natsuki looked over at her sister with a wide-eyed expression. Out of the two of them, Narumi was far more stubborn and thick-headed and loyal to a fault. That was why she hadn't told her about the meeting with Kurama yet and why the chakra had been ripped out of Nawaki. Now that Narumi openly admitted that she didn't have the blind faith in their parents like she previously had, it might be easier to tell her the truth about Kurama and the Biju. Though that talk would have to wait for another time. I love them, but I can't help but feel that they're, I don't know, subconsciously trying to use us to further their own goals. I don't mean to make them sound evil or manipulative or anything, but think about it. Pushing us to become shinobi since we could speak, telling us bedtime stories about how shinobi were heroes and fought selflessly for their village, pushing us towards the dream of becoming Hokage, that stupid prophecy, making us Erosenin's apprentices. I just can't help but feel like they were setting all this up so that we would fulfill their dreams of finding peace because they couldn't. I guess I can kind of understand why they want to find such a thing now, but... Natsuki trailed off at the end, trying to find the exact words she wanted. But? Narumi asked, trying to push her to spit out the rest of what she wanted to say. Narumi had an idea of what her sister wanted to say. These were some of the very things that Naruto spoke of with their father and Jiraiya just after the Chunin promotional ceremony. She hadn't really paid much attention to what he had said then until now. It's noble and all, trying to find world peace, but the world will always be at war. There will always be some kind of conflict. It's just human nature, you know. That doesn't mean it's right, but to find peace you'd have to completely redefine the human nature of every single person in the world, and even then there will be people who will stand against what you're trying to do and lead some kind of rebellion, leading to yet another war. I guess what I'm trying to say is that conflict is inevitable and that won't be changing anytime soon. Just look at the recent invasion. We had been in a peacetime before they decided to invade to show their power and secure a location at the top as one of the strongest villages. If people are so willing to risk the lives of others just for superficial reasons like power or political standing, do you really see peace in this world coming anytime soon? Before Narumi even had a chance to respond, a large crash of thunder resounded through the town, followed by a flash of lightning, causing the two of them to jump at the loud outburst and turn towards the direction it came from. The two of them looked up into the sky, expecting thunderclouds to have gathered while they had been immersed in their conversation. However, there was not a single cloud in sight, so it just wasn't possible for there to be thunder, let alone lightning. At least, not naturally. That could only mean that sound came from the southern sector. Narumi spoke, now on guard for anything that came their way. That's Nissan sector. Let's go. Natsuki responded, earning a nod from her sister. After they had come to an agreement, the two Uzumaki Namikaze sisters bolted towards the direction the thunderclap came from. They would have normally just shunshined there, but they were in the northernmost section of the eastern sector, which meant it was too far of a distance to do so, and repeated use of that particular jutsu would be too chakra intensive. And judging from the amount of chakra that was being emitted from the southern sector, they would need every last drop. Western sector, minutes earlier. Completely opposite of Natsuki and Narumi, Satsuki and Mikoto were actually quite adept in this field of work. As of now, they were currently exploring the further outskirts of the western sector. They had determined within the first hour that not one of their targets had been foreign shinobi. It seemed Obito had just been paranoid after all, therefore they had decided to scout and explore the entirety of their sector, since they had never seen a town of such a design, aside from the movies. They had been casually walking through the mostly vacant streets of Banero town for the last hour and had finally made it to its border. It had been just over 2 hours since they had separated from the rest of the team, and they still had 2 hours to kill before they were required to be back at the meeting place. The two female Uchiha briefly pondered as to why Naruto had given such a long time frame for the mission before realizing that it was most likely because Natsuki and Narumi were utterly inexperienced in this sort of task and may need a lot more time than would be expected to recover the necessary information. Though even then 4 hours was a bit much, even for those inexperienced in the area of information gathering. A task this simple should take no more than 2 hours. Perhaps the extra time was meant to deal with any unforeseen circumstances. Though they had to admit that their job would have been a lot more time-consuming if they had actually found any foreign shinobi that needed to be dealt with. Their targets had been quite easy to mark since their sector was comparable to that of a ghost town, with only having passed a few dozen other people aside from their targets. Out of the 3 sectors that had been assigned, the 2 of them had received the most unpopulated. Naruto tasked himself with the largest sector and the one with the most targets, since his sensor capabilities would make the job much quicker, where it would have taken the rest of the team the entire 4 hours to investigate the targets due to the sheer number of people within the southern sector. Though the reason as to why Natsuki and Narumi received the second most populated area was still a mystery. On second thought, they probably were assigned that sector because it was the perfect balance between the southern and western sectors. They would no doubt fumble a bit with their task, so if they were in a vastly unpopulated area tailing their targets, they would end up standing out quite a bit. If they were in an area where the population was too high, then they would have a much harder time even finding their targets, much less validating them. Naruto really had thought of everything. Though, not everyone seemed to realize how much planning he had gone through for such a mission. "How'd we get stuck with investigating the ghost sector anyways?" Satsuki complained as she interlocked her fingers behind her head. "I'm bored. We finished scouting out the area over an hour ago, we've just been wandering around since then. Why couldn't we have gotten one of the more interesting areas?" Mikoto sighed exasperatedly at her daughter's antics. The younger Uchiha had been complaining for the better part of the last hour, though Mikoto had been tuning her out and simply letting her rant, but now it seemed like a good chance to intervene. Satsuki had never been the patient type, so walking around and doing nothing didn't fit her usual style. Sticking to the shadows, tailing targets, the typical nature of these missions she was quite skilled at, but aimlessly walking through the empty streets of an unfamiliar town didn't exactly pique her interest. Because Naruto-kun was doing his duty as a team leader. Mikoto answered Satsuki, causing the younger female to look towards her mother with a confused expression. "We were selected for this area because he knew we would be able to stay inconspicuous, even though the low population of this area would cause more attention to befall any outsiders. He got the most populated area because his sensor abilities would make it easier to find his targets and track them. Narumi and Natsuki are unfamiliar with this kind of work, so they would need a perfect mix of the two in order to come out successful." Satsuki took in all of her mother's words before huffing in annoyance. It seemed she didn't like the fact that she overlooked such an obvious answer. Though that was just a front, as internally she was thinking over all of her surrogate brother's actions and decisions since they left the village. Every single action as a team leader was flawless, as if he was born to lead and take command of those willing and unwilling to follow him. It only cemented the feeling that she wasn't cut out for a position of leadership, as she would have never thought of some of the plans or decisions that he had made. Are you starting to understand the reasoning behind his actions? Mikoto asked in a tone that suggested she was scolding a child. I guess, but it still irritates me that those two always get special treatment. It was true, the Uzumaki Namikaze princesses did get special treatment from the entire village, but Satsuki was referring to their mission records and incompetence at almost everything they had been assigned through the course of this mission. Back before the Chunin exams, they had always been assigned easy escort and delivery missions where they really didn't have to do anything resembling shinobi work in the slightest. It was as if they were too precious and pure to get their hands dirty, as deemed by their senseis and the Yondaime Hokage. Meanwhile, Team 11 had been basically forced to pick up all the slack that the Hokage's children left because their team had the best mission record. To her, Team 7 was nothing more than a group of spoiled children. Though she knew that Naruto wasn't showing them special treatment because of who they were. It was the exact opposite really. She had seen the look of annoyance that made its way onto his face whenever he was forced to make decisions regarding the mission. It was because of how pampered and inexperienced the two girls were that he had to make sure they got assignments where it was hardest to screw up. You know that's not how it is right now. Mikoto sighed, trying to come up with an explanation for the two Uzumaki Namikaze girls. Now that she thought about it, their parents and those close to them did spoil them far too much. Sure they're given preferential treatment by their parents and people like Kakashi, Jiraiya, and Tsunade, but that isn't by Natsuki and Narumi's choice. They were born into their family just how you were born into the Uchiha clan. While you may not be their biggest fans now, you're all still young and have plenty of room to grow and mature. I'm sure that when the three of you mature and get past your differences, you could turn out to be great friends. So don't be too hard on them. Mikoto knew that besides Naruto and Hana, Satsuki didn't have very many friends. While the bond between the three of them was stronger than even family, that didn't mean she should limit herself to having only 2 friends. Mikoto understood that her daughter really couldn't stand a majority of her graduating class for various reasons, such as them being annoying girly fangirls, cocky, annoying, arrogant, silent, lazy, and so on. So in reality Natsuki and Narumi were the only other girls that Satsuki could possibly form a friendship with. Mikoto's only real friend that was still alive was Kushina. But she had begun to distance herself from the redhead ever since she found out about how Kushina had treated Naruto when he was a child. In fact, the first time they had talked in years was at the Chunin exams, and that was only since Kushina had decided to sit next to her and reminisce about the old days when they were on the same team and taking part in those exams. When most of your other friends fall in combat or for whatever other reason, it can certainly become lonely. Mikoto didn't want her daughter to feel the same way that she had over the past few years. I don't ever see the three of us being friends, but I guess you're dash. Satsuki was cut off by large crash of lightning and the roar of thunder, causing the 2 female Uchiha to jump at the sudden noise. With weapons immediately drawn, Mikoto and Satsuki frantically turned towards the direction where the outburst originated from. What the hell was that? Satsuki all but screamed, completely at a loss of what such a noise could have been when there was not a single storm cloud in sight. I don't know, but it came from the southern area. Mikoto responded, her body and hearing recovering from the shock that the sudden, incredibly loud echo sent into her system. Quick, let's go. I know Naruto-kun's strong, but I think he'll need all the help he can get if whatever that jutsu was anything to go by. Without another word spoken, the 2 Ravenettes quickly took off in the direction of the thunderclap. Neither of them could exactly pinpoint exactly where in the southern sector the explosion came from, but they assumed that there would be many more to follow which would help them immensely. Though that line of thinking was a bit disconcerting considering that Naruto would be the target of such explosions. They just hoped they'd make it in time. Southern sector. Naruto clutched his bleeding left ear as he knelt down on one knee atop of a wooden rooftop that overlooked the street. He had managed to jump out of the way of that burst of lightning, but the shock and sound waves that followed through him across the air onto the rooftop he was currently occupying and ruptured one of his eardrums. Just what was that? Naruto thought to himself in between his fits of panting as he stood back up, despite his loss of balance from hearing loss. He hadn't suffered much damage, but such a thing happening so suddenly took a lot out of the young man. Even with his left ear successfully deafened alongside the ringing in his right ear and coupled with his now blurry vision, he was able to notice the large hotel that he had passed by earlier being flung at him from above. Pushing any thoughts of what was currently happening to the side for the moment, he was forced to take action. With a simple wave of his outstretched arm, Naruto activated his Enkai, flame commandment, amassing a large amount of crimson-orange flames around his body. The move itself wasn't meant to deal with the falling building, in fact it wasn't even an offensive technique, however it was a prerequisite for what was to come. In the epicenter of the spiraling flames, Naruto, activating Hibashira, Fire Pillar, crouched down until his hands were touching the wooden surface below him, causing the flames to rise and rotate around him more fiercely, after which Naruto shot the collected flames straight upwards, piercing straight through the hotel, causing the remnants to scatter in all different directions, as the sky was alit the color of his flames for a few moments. As the flames dispersed, Naruto's vision began to come into focus once more. Though he was thankful for his sight back and that the ringing in his ears had subsided, even with those ailments he had saw how bright his flames were as they lit up the sky and how loud the destruction of the hotel had been, not to mention how loud the previous thunderclap had been. That begged the question, why had none of the townspeople come out of their shops or homes to see what was going on in the streets? What the hell is going on in this town? However, before Naruto could mull over the possibilities, two powerful presences in the immediate area demanded his attention. So you managed to survive that, huh? An, obviously male, lazy voice asked rhetorically as him and a shadow-like being emerged from one of the alleyways and casually walked into the middle of the street. I must commend you on your efforts, even though they'll prove futile in the near future. Naruto's head instantly whipped towards the direction of the voice as he hadn't been able to sense their presences until this very moment. They must have been the ones who had been countering his haki since he had stepped foot in the town. Something told him not to take them lightly. Who are you? Naruto asked with narrowed eyes as he sized up the two new arrivals. Naruto's eyes were immediately drawn to the slashed hitayate that was worn around the taller one's neck, signifying that he was a Nuke Nin from Kumogakure. After that, he took in their physical appearances, neither of which could be classified as normal. However, his eyes narrowed even further when he focused on the second person, who looked like a humanoid black mass with no visible hair or orifices and two yellow eyes that lacked sclerae or pupils. It felt like he knew this being from somewhere in his past, but he just couldn't place his finger on it. Actually, he could feel familiar presences within both of them, but he was at a complete loss as to what that could possibly mean. I'm surprised that you aren't aware of what organization we belong to, seeing as how your sisters are our targets this time. We know for a fact that Konoha is already aware of our existence due to Jiraiya's intelligence network. The shirtless man spoke with an air of arrogance to him. We are known as the Akatsuki, not that it matters since you'll be dead in a matter of minutes. Naruto froze after absorbing the man's words. If they were after his sisters, then the Bijou were most likely their organization's goal, either that or for the fact that they were practically royalty as far as Konoha was concerned. But if that were the case, then he and Nawaki would also be their targets. The fact that they only mentioned Natsuki and Narumi cemented the former. But how could they possibly know that Nawaki was no longer a Jinchuriki? That development only happened during the invasion. There was no possible way that information could have spread that fast, and even if it could, there was no one around to do so. This meant that at least one of them had to have been there during the invasion. An entire organization devoted to the capture of the Bijou did not spell good news. It was then that another thought came to mind. If they were after the Jinchuriki for their respective Bijou, then why were they here in front of him? They already proved to be skillful enough to avoid detection from even a skilled sensor, so they should have easily been able to capture Natsuki and Narumi without making their presence known. Why risk unnecessary people knowing of their goals? Even if they planned to kill any witnesses, they could have killed the rest of his team already, yet he could still sense their presences. Just what is their goal in revealing themselves so openly? You're after the Bijou. It was not a question, but a statement, though Naruto did not voice any of his other previous trains of thought. He was well aware that the rest of his team had heard the explosion and were now rushing towards his general vicinity, but they were still a ways off and probably wouldn't arrive for quite some time. Though Naruto was aware that these two shinobi were at too high of a level for him to take on alone, any of his other team members would only serve to get in the way and would most likely be killed in the process. Maybe Mikoto would be able to bail him out, but with her weakened body he couldn't be sure of anything at the moment. This meant he had to take them both on by himself now if he wanted his team to have any chance at survival. It was quite the predicament, a losing battle no matter which angle he looked at it from. Looks like we have a winner. Enel congratulated sarcastically. Though for the time being, our purpose is only to test how strong they currently are for when we initiate our actual plans. Things wouldn't work out very well if tried to capture them now, it'd actually be more trouble than it's worth at the moment. Enel, shut up. Naruto's attention was brought from the Kumo Nuke Nin and onto the shadow-like being as he spoke, who was staring at him with unrelenting hatred while subconsciously releasing massive waves of killing intent. He's mine, just stay out of the way and deal with the rest of his team when they arrive. TCH, from their chakra levels I can already tell they won't even be able to put up a decent fight. Why can't I play around with him a little Zetsu? Naruto's eyes widened to epic proportions as he heard what the man, Enel if he remembered correctly, called the pure black being. Zetsu was the manifestation of Otsutsuki Kagaya's will that she created just before she was fully sealed. As for why he was created in the first place, Naruto hadn't had the slightest idea. All that he knew was that Ace had spent countless years tracking him and chasing him down until his prime passed him and he became unsure if he would be able to deal with opponents of such a high caliber as he once had. That was why he originally decided to reincarnate the fruit and set up so many failsafes. Though Ace had never actually fought Zetsu head-on, the being had always managed to escape at the first chance he found. From what Naruto was aware, Zetsu wasn't a frontline fighter and would have easily been killed all those centuries ago, but he couldn't be sure if that still held true after so many centuries had passed. To think that I would have run into him so soon. Wait! This Akatsuki is going after Jinchuriki for their Biju, and he was created by Kagaya, who was the progenitor of all chakra, so he's well aware of what collecting all 9 of them could do once extracted. Naruto's eyes widened in realization after piecing everything together. He's trying to revive the Jubi and later resurrect Kagaya. Naruto braced himself as best he could and focused his presence purely on Zetsu as Enel moved off to the side and the being of black mass slowly began to walk forward into the middle of the street. He couldn't worry about how the rest of his team were doing at the moment or even how far out they were from here. Naruto knew that things were going downhill fast judging from the malicious smirk that made its way onto Zetsu's face. I'll enjoy eradicating your existence from the face of this world. You were always her favorite. She had always tried so hard to make things right, even going so far as to create the Mugen Tsukuyomi for the purpose of creating a world where you and her could exist together alone, in harmony. It wasn't difficult to realize the feelings of utter loathing that laced each and every one of Zetsu's words. She couldn't see it, but I can. Your existence would only bring more pain and suffering to her. I will not let her suffer anymore. Then it will be just me and her together. Only then will I be worthy of Okasama's love. Naruto didn't fully understand what Zetsu was rambling about, but he managed to comprehend that it was related to Kagaya and that Zetsu had more of an interest in killing him than going after the Jinchuriki here in town like a member of this Akatsuki should have. The fact that his partner was completely dismissive that they weren't going after Jinchuriki was also a cause for concern. He needed to make the first move. Heiken, Fire Fist. Rearing his fist back while turning it into fire, Naruto launched a column of flames forward with power and size that would be able to pierce through a majority of the buildings in the southern sector that would be taken down along with Zetsu. The lone Konohanin put as much power into it as he could without destabilizing his favored technique. Calling it a jutsu just didn't feel right. With the intent to vaporize Zetsu with this first move, he couldn't risk giving the being a chance to counterstrike. However, that plan was never meant to come true as with a single motion of his hand, Zetsu created an equally large vortex of black mist that seemingly absorbed Naruto's prior attack, leaving the Ravenet stunned for a moment as he ceased his futile attempt on Zetsu's life. Seeing the boy's confused expression, Zetsu thought to rub salt in the wounds. This ability has chosen me. With it, I have become the strongest of this generation and so many before. Even among the Logias it's unique. Your body is fire, right? I am darkness. With those words said, Zetsu produced a spiraling vortex of darkness from his back that rose into the air causing the brightness of the cloudless day to dim with its presence. Darkness? Naruto questioned, not having ever recalled a chakra fruit of that nature. There should only be 5 fruits which represent the 5 natural elements, those being fire, water, earth, lightning, and wind. Though the darkness being emanated from the person before him was undoubtedly a chakra fruit ability, easily noticeable by any wielder of a chakra fruit. That's right, you can't touch me. The arrogance in Zetsu's voice was not a small amount in any sense of the word, but with the amount of power he was releasing, he had the right to be. Out of all the chakra fruits grown by the Shinju tree, the one with this power is known as the most evil of them all. It cannot be found the same as all the other fruits. I was born with this power when Okasama created me while she was still merged with the Shinju. She knew all the Shinju secrets and gave me the greatest of them all. Naruto had not known any of this. His knowledge of the history of Kagaya and the Shinju tree was limited to what Ace knew, meaning that since Ace was unaware that such a fruit existed and that Zetsu had possession of it, Naruto could not have possibly known such a fact. He was traveling in uncharted territory at the moment. The influence of darkness could possibly be limitless. Why don't I give you a little demonstration? Killing you won't be entertaining unless you struggle. Zetsu spoke as the darkness emanating from his body increased tenfold, blocking off most of the light given off by the sun and leaving most of the area as if it were night. Don't worry, I'm not going after you, yet. Just stand there and take a good look at the town. Black hole. Channeling all the darkness that he had released into the atmosphere already back towards his body, Zetsu thrust his palm towards the ground and spread his darkness across it, mimicking the motion of waves of water crashing onto that shore. The darkness quickly began to flow and spread across the earthen ground as if it had a mind of its own until it covered the entire area of the southern sector. With one final push, the ground began to shake with a similar intensity of an earthquake as the pull of darkness became more intense, swallowing up everything in its path. Buildings, houses, trees, monuments, everything was swallowed up by the darkness and crushed by its influence until it simply ceased to exist as it reconverged with Zetsu and the technique subsided. The only remaining structure in what remained of the southern sector was the small shop that Naruto was perched atop of. Naruto finally realized the utter hopelessness of the situation as he was forced to watch an entire section of a town be crushed by the influence of darkness until it simply ceased to exist. Naruto had no illusions that this man could have easily done the same for the entire town if he had wished so, and had only not done so since that was only a demonstration of his power. The differences in their power were just far too vast. Darkness is gravity. The power to pull in anything, and spare not even a single ray of light. Darkness is a void that devours and crushes everything. Zetsu voiced, regaining his previous composure as the darkness returned to him until it only coated his hands. Now why don't I show you what became of it? Liberation. Releasing the spiraling mass of darkness from his back once again, Zetsu expelled all the remains of what his darkness had swallowed up all at once. Shattered pieces of wood, crushed portions of buildings, flattened houses and so much more was expelled all at once until the wreckage created a large ring around them that stretched on for miles, leaving only a clearing in the middle of all of it where the three of them stood. This looks like a pretty troublesome ability so far. I don't know where the townspeople were, but if they were in those buildings, they're probably dead at this point, though something else has bothering me so far. I've never heard of this darkness fruit, but he claims it's a Logia type just as the others are. If so, then why did he need to absorb my Heiken instead of letting it pass through him? Were Naruto's thoughts as he stared down at his enemy from the single building still standing in the area. Coating his fingers with fire, Naruto put his index fingers together in a cross shape, emanating a cross-shaped ray of light which locked onto his target. Traveling across that lone ray of light, Naruto launched a large column of cross-shaped fire at incredible speeds towards Zetsu only moments after he had finished releasing what remained of the southern sector. Jujika, crossfire. Unknowingly proving Naruto's prior theory correct, Zetsu conjured a barrier of the black mist to absorb the powerful attack rather than avoiding it like any Logia should have been capable of. As the Akatsuki member dispersed the darkness after completely nullifying, his smirk turned into a frown when he saw the analyzing look that the boy was giving him. I see you've already noticed one of the glaring weaknesses of my chakra fruit. Naturally the greatest of all powers would have a drawback or two. Zetsu commented emotionlessly, shifting his piercing gaze from the boy to the building he was still standing on. He had left that lone structure standing in the area simply to demonstrate to that insect the power that he held, but now it seemed as if it would get in the way of the slaughter that was to come. Raising up just one of his arms, Zetsu targeted the building and all the area surrounding it, singling out just the gravity aspect of his abilities instead of a combination of the two as he usually did. With a single flick of his wrist, the gravity surrounding the entire area of the lone structure increased until it became unbearable for the building to remain standing, let alone a person. In less than a span of a second, the entire building gave into the incredible increase of pressure, cracking and collapsing until it was a mere pile of shattered wood just like the rest of the surrounding area. The damage did not just stop at the building though. The ground surrounding was forced to crack and cave in, making it impossible for anyone in the targeted area to remain standing. Expectedly, Naruto was forced down onto the remains of the structure he was previously perched on as he was held there by the immense force of gravity. He had realized just how powerful gravity could really be when Zetsu had destroyed part of the town, but seeing and being subjected to it was a completely different experience. Naruto felt like an insect facing off against a dragon. He had never truly felt fear in his life before. Was this what it felt like? If he wasn't currently being crushed by at least 100 times the normal gravity, he was sure he would be trembling at the moment. Though he could still feel the cold sweat that had broken out on his face. Had he not been made of fire, he would surely been dead by now as the shattered pieces of wood had pierced his body when the building had collapsed. Even fire had been subjected to gravity. Nothing could escape gravity's influence. Summoning every bit of strength he had within his grasp, Naruto struggled against the omnipresent force that was rendering judgment upon him and forced to one knee. gritting his teeth as hard as he could while clenching his hands with enough strength to draw blood. With one final push, Naruto managed to force himself back on his own 2 feet. Despite gravity trying to force him back on his knees, Naruto took a single step forward. And then another. He just kept repeating the impossible process of walking under such intense pressure. He put everything he had into the simple movements of walking until he managed to step off the remnants of the collapsed structure and onto the broken ground before him. Portgasti, Naruto would not kneel for anyone. Seeing as how Naruto wouldn't be forced to his knees anymore, the gravity suddenly returned to normal, causing Naruto to stumble forward at how light he felt before catching himself. He looked up from the ground that had occupied his vision for the last few minutes and caught Zetsu's smirk. That had only been another demonstration of his power, Naruto realized. I already told you, darkness drags in everything. Shuriken, kunai, swords, fire, and even lightning. I can't dodge attacks like the rest of you do. I can't turn into my own element. Actually, my body absorbs much more pain because of the Yami Yami no Mi. But with this much power at my disposal, I think those drawbacks are only minor annoyances at this point. Once again the black mist began to radiate from Zetsu's back and shoulders, though this time it wasn't in the form of the vortex that was used to release whatever it absorbed. Zetsu continued to speak, but in exchange for those risks there's one more thing I'm capable of absorbing. Kuruzu, Black Vortex. Extending one arm forwards, the black mist surrounding Zetsu's hand began to move in a spiral-like fashion. The gravity of darkness can accurately absorb the entity of chakra fruit users. Naruto stood there for a moment with a questioning look on his face since nothing was happening as of yet, but as soon as he began to wonder if the technique was a dud, an immense pull of gravity pulled him forward until he was in Zetsu's grasp a second later. One moment he was standing over 30 yards away and the next Zetsu was manhandling him. Naruto's eyes widened as he felt Zetsu's hand gripping his shoulder with strength not reflected by his physique. He had expected his enemy to be aware of Haki and have a high level of mastery over it, but he had never expected his intangibility to fully be cancelled out. This was not the work of any kind of Haki. How does it feel? Have you figured it out yet? Zetsu mocked as he eyed the boy that was now within his grasp. No way. Just as Naruto realized what was going on, Zetsu reared his free arm back and brought his fist right into the disoriented Naruto's gut with strength that made Yugo's feel like a love tap. The force behind the punch forced Naruto to cough up a bit of blood before he was flung across the clearing into one of the boundaries of the battlefield that was a home that had been ripped in half earlier. After feeling untouchable for so long, Naruto cursed his unfortunate luck for coming across 2 people who could actually harm him in the same day. His body screaming for mercy, Naruto pushed himself out of the crater on the side of the house the impact had created, forcing his body to slide down the wall until he reached the ground with his back still leaning up against the structure. Naruto took his index and middle fingers and wiped away some of the blood that was leaking from the corners of his mouth, almost unbelieving that this could possibly be happening even though he had gotten beat fairly well only a few hours ago. But this guy, he was on an entire different level. You understood the moment I grabbed you. The other thing my darkness can absorb is the chakra fruit powers. In other words, by being touched, those with abilities of the chakra fruits are unable to use their ability for that time, though it works best on chakra fruit users and those with a certain intangibility. My powers can nullify the chakra of any being as long as I'm touching them. As Zetsu boasted about his strength, Naruto slowly made his way back on his feet. So it's fine as long as I don't get caught. Naruto spoke quietly, more to himself than Zetsu, with several different scenarios already running through his mind. However, Zetsu seemed to hear his whisper. I've already proved to you that you can never escape from the influence of darkness, yet you still have hope? I'll make sure to correct that. Looks like I don't have much of a way out of this. Naruto ripped what was left of his torn mesh shirt off his body and clutched his bleeding shoulder. He would need his phoenix flames as much as he could later, so he couldn't be wasting them on the few wounds and fractured bones he had at the moment. Instead they were focused on the shattered and snapped bones within his body. If his assessments were correct, he only had enough of Marco's chakra left to fully restore his body once more after wasting so much of it during the Konoha invasion and his prior battle with Yugo. Those flames were the result of Marco implanting his phoenix chakra into Naruto's body. It wasn't natural to him, therefore the chakra wouldn't regenerate within his body. The only way to regain those flames was to make a trip to the realm of the phoenixes and implant more of their chakra within him. He really wished that he hadn't used so much of them in his earlier fight. Then again, if he hadn't, that punch probably would have shattered most of the bones in his chest. Naruto wasn't exactly in the greatest position at the moment. However this went, it was certain to be an uphill battle. Kuruzu, Black Vortex. Once again, Zetsu extended his left arm forward with the spiraling darkness surrounding it, causing Naruto to be pulled forward from the effects of gravity. Shit! Not again. Naruto was caught off guard the first time that Zetsu used this technique since he had no idea what it would actually do. However, this time he had time to analyze his current situation due to having experienced this before. The pull of gravity was too strong for him to try to escape it. Even a Shunshin or Shinsaku, extreme speed, would be useless to escape from its pull. That didn't mean he was completely out of options, however. Shinka, Shiranui, Sacred Flame, Unknown Fire. Igniting his hands with large bursts of crimson-orange flames while in midair, Naruto hurled long lances made of fire forward, both piercing Zetsu's chest while simultaneously burning his insides, forcing him cringe before letting out a large roar in pain. However, Naruto didn't get off easy either as Zetsu swung his right arm down into Naruto's neck, forcing him to grit his teeth while a large amount of blood was still coughed out and causing his eyes to roll into the back of his head. That wasn't the end either, as when the lances piercing Zetsu's chest ignited with even hotter flames that began to spread and eat away at his innards, he flung Naruto across the clearing once again and into the foot of another building. When the dust cloud cleared from where Naruto had landed, he was clutching his neck in pain after getting back onto his feet once more. Damn, he almost broke my neck. Quite a troublesome ability he has. I can't afford to let him do that again. I'll need to keep my distance. As Naruto was getting a bearing of the situation after regaining his senses, Zetsu was screaming in pain as he grabbed onto the flaming lances and absorbed them from his chest with his darkness. Though it couldn't be seen and it was unknown whether he had internal organs or not, the fact that those lances had such an effect did not change. It meant that even though he is the manifestation of Kagaya's will, he could still be killed, albeit it will much more difficult than a normal human. Naruto staggered forward, his eyes never leaving Zetsu as he clutched his shoulder as it continued to bleed heavily. He was pretty sure it was broken at this point, or at best fractured. A physical fight would be beyond his ability at this point, even if he had never planned to do so in the first place. Still, he could not afford to let it hamper him. Enjomo, Flaming Net. Waving his arms out towards his sides, Naruto erected a large wall of flames that circled the entire clearing and reached high into the sky, bathing the battlefield a shade of crimson-orange, heating up the atmosphere dramatically and preventing anyone from entering or leaving other than himself, though Zetsu could probably absorb it with his darkness if given enough time. But running away wasn't what he was planning here. Actually, most of his plans had gone to shit after finding out about Zetsu's abilities to nullify chakra, so he was pretty much thinking on the fly as on now. He really didn't have much of a choice. Standing several miles away from the clearing atop of some of the wreckage, Enel whistled in appreciation as he looked upon the wall of flames that rose high into the sky. The kid was putting up a much better fight than he had expected. Hell, the boy was even pushing Zetsu back a little. Not bad, kid, not bad at all. Enel smirked as he wished he could get a little action in, but for now he was tasked with taking care of any unwanted attention, along with observing the Jinchuriki, of course. Though he really didn't care much for that, they would no doubt be a letdown. Very few could stand up to the power of lightning. These Jinchuriki would not fit into that category. They were still a ways out anyway, but the sounds of fighting would be sure to make them pick up the pace. Maybe then he would be able to test out the little fire brat for himself. Though, Zetsu's nowhere near done with you yet. With how adamant he was about coming here, you won't be leaving this graveyard unless it's as a mutilated corpse hanging over his shoulder. Back in the clearing, Naruto had jumped up onto the wreckage, which was now burning from the intense heat that the atmosphere become acclimated to, as Zetsu had recovered from the pain of having two lances shoved through his chest and had filled the holes with extra black matter from his body. While physically fine, his cloak had become singed and covered in soot from the presence of the flaming walls. What was the point of all this? You've seen how easily I was able to absorb part of this town. What makes you think these little fireworks will be any different? Zetsu questioned critically. He was quite annoyed that the brat had actually managed to injure him. Not bothering with a response, Naruto simply waved his hands, causing the net of flames to rush towards Zetsu at once, resulting in a massive firestorm centered at the middle of the clearing. As the inferno raged, Naruto did not let up one bit and continued to fuel the flames with an even greater intensity, knowing full well that even something that could kill any other human may not be enough. Naruto kept the massive firestorm going on with everything he had for well over a minute until he was forced onto his knees, panting from exhaustion. However, even with him no longer fueling the fire, the flames still raged. Is this the extent of your power? How disappointing. Naruto's head jerked back to the clearing with so much torque that it was surprising he didn't snap his own neck when he heard the voice that he had come to recognize so well. He didn't even have time to react when several chains conjured from darkness erupted from the ground under him and pierced him through his legs, chest, and abdomen, forcing no small amount of blood to spill from his mouth before the chains dispersed into black mist. Suddenly, a large burst of wind erupted in every direction with the inside of the inferno acting as the epicenter. The ferocious winds traveling well over several hundred miles per hour tore up the ground, sent the wreckage of the town flying in every direction, and completely snuffed out the flames that had been roaring in the clearing. Naruto was thrown well into the wreckage, unable to move from the pressure the winds put on him. Being crushed by winds moving as fast as an actual tornado, perhaps even faster, was even worse than being crushed by gravity earlier. As soon as the winds picked up, luckily they soon stopped after the flames died out instead of forming into a tornado. Naruto fell to the ground panting as his wounds bled out heavily into a pool of blood surrounding his body. Though every cell in his body was screaming in agony, Naruto managed to force himself onto his arms and knees as he looked to see what damage had been done. Large indents had been carved into the ground, creating a massive crater where the clearing had originally been, and the wreckage of the crushed houses and buildings had been picked up by the winds and were now no longer in sight. Before him stood Zetsu, absolutely unscathed from the windstorm that had just torn apart the battlefield, along with what was left of the town. As Naruto laid there motionlessly, he activated his phoenix flames within his body to regenerate the fatal wounds he received to his vital organs, along with mending together most of his broken bones. He needed to focus solely on the regeneration of his internal organ foremost. With the regenerative chakra he had left, he would be able to restore them partially but wouldn't have enough left to stop the internal bleeding that had already been produced by his wounds, nor would he be able to heal his superficial wounds that covered his body and leaked blood like a faucet. Well, what was that? Naruto's breath was still shaky from being thrown around like a rag doll in the storm, coupled with the blood loss from his prior wounds. Zihahaha! Zetsu bellowed darkly, clearly elated for finally forcing the boy to bow before him once again. I thought I already told you that my powers let me absorb other chakra fruit abilities. Did you really think that only meant nullifying their powers while I'm in contact with them? That's impossible. Why couldn't have possibly dash? Naruto tried to refute Zetsu's claim, but was incapable of voicing his thoughts as the blood welled up in his throat and forced him to cough no small amount up. True, I may not be able to physically eat another fruit, but that doesn't matter. The Yami Yami no Mi allows me to absorb the power from the actual fruit itself. It took centuries to find, but I now hold the power of the Kaze Kaze no Mi as well. Banero town was in ruins. Even now the huge banana rocks that served as landmarks for the agricultural town crashed and crumbled to the ground where the outskirts of the town used to be, leaving the town completely barren. The earth was scarred with not only the large craters and ditches, but cracks and fissures that ripped apart the terrain as well. Naruto wasn't stupid. This kind of damage could only have been by the Kaze Kaze no Mi. No mere futon jutsu could compare to the might on one of the 5 elements of nature, but the implications of what he was saying were unbelievable. If he absorbed all 5 of the natural elements, he could essentially destroy the world. So that's why you're after me? To take the Mera Mera no Mi as your own? Naruto deduced, spitting out the last of the blood that remained in his throat. Zihahaha. The Akatsuki already has 4 chakra fruits belonging to their members. Earth, lightning, wind, and darkness. In fact, if Enel finishes off your little friends early, you may get a look at the Goro Goro no Mi. Zetsu's deep voice resounded throughout the massive crater as he moved closer to the helpless boy before him. I would sooner die than absorb that Mera Mera no Mi in your possession. Having it would only remind Okasama of her pain and suffering. I don't want to see Okasama sad ever again. This guy's absolutely insane. Insane and monstrously strong is never a good combination. Naruto thought to himself, trying to bring himself back to his feet but to no avail. As Naruto continued to stumble trying to get back up to his feet, Zetsu continued to slowly walk towards the downed Konohinin. No, I refuse to take that power. That chakra fruit is something I will make sure is erased from existence along with you. Make no mistake, you will die here, and by my hands. I think I deserve at least that much. Actually no. Death is too easy for someone of your line. Torture, mutilation, slaughter. Yes, that's much more appropriate for this occasion. Zetsu stopped right before Naruto's bloody and beaten body before reaching down and gripping the boy's throat with his right arm, lifting his near-lifeless body until the shorter boy was at eye level with him. If looks could kill, Zetsu would have been turned to ashes already as Naruto glared murderously at Kagaya's will. He could barely see straight, yet Naruto's eyes remained defiant to the end. Blood swelled up in his throat as he gasped helplessly for air, though it may not have made any difference whether his throat was being crushed or not as one of his lungs may have been pierced earlier. His mesh shirt had long since been forgotten and ripped off, revealing the numerous puncture wounds and gashes that marred his body. His usual black pants were bloodied and torn. Many of the bones in his body were broken, or at least fractured to some degree, while his face was bloodied from the wounds on his forehead. His mind spun madly as he struggled for oxygen, but he refused to give into unconsciousness. Have you noticed I haven't once called you by your name? That's because I've refused to learn it. When we first saw you at the Chunin exams, my white half tried to get me to remember it for our mission report back to the Akatsuki, but I forced myself to forget it. You know why? Because you're nothing more than that man's will. Just as how I'm Okasama's will, but I'm also her son. The world that we have envisioned has no place for you in it. I will become the perfect son Okasama has always wanted, then she'll forget all about you. But first, I'll need to pay you back for what you and your will has done to Okasama. A black and purple, smoke-like miasma began to dance around Zetsu's left arm as he spoke. So let's begin your slow and excruciating execution. This is one of the most fearsome aspects of my power, the ability of eternal darkness, meaning, death and decay. Enjoy. Reaching out his left arm, Zetsu tapped Naruto's right hand with just one of his fingers, transferring the smallest amount of the miasma possible before throwing him a good 100 yards into the side of the crater to let everything play out. Naruto grunted in pain as he impacted the earthen wall after being thrown by Zetsu's tremendous physical strength. This time, however, he didn't leave a crater or a mark on the wall due to how dense the earth was, and slid down until he collapsed on his face once again. Not knowing exactly what it was Zetsu did to him, Naruto brought out his right arm out of pure habit to bring himself to his feet, but a sickly snapping and crunching sound stopped him dead in his tracks. Looking over at his right arm, Naruto's eyes widened to incredible proportions as he saw that what should be his right hand was now pure bone that had snapped from the pressure he put on it, with the purple-black miasma eating away at the rest of the biological components of his arm. It had already decayed up to just above his wrist and would continue to decay his body from his arm if nothing was done about it. Only now did everything sink in. Raha! Naruto roared in pain as the feeling of every bone in his hand and arm shattering, coupled with the agony of having his flesh being eaten away, finally hit him. Oh, I was right. Zetsu commented with a smile on his face. Not an insane one or a malicious one like earlier, but a smile of pure delight. It is entertaining watching you suffer. I'll have to make sure that you won't leave here unless it's as a pile of blood and guts that I can gather up and take home as a souvenir. Naruto didn't pay any attention to Zetsu's commentary, not that it would have done him any good, and instead chose to focus on his current state of emergency. With the sense of panic and adrenaline taking over his body, Naruto's prior pain and exhaustion was forgotten in favor for his arm. Jumping to his feet at speeds that he hadn't possessed since the beginning of the fierce confrontation, Naruto's mind was going at 100 miles a minute, thinking of any way out of this, seeing as how he couldn't access his chakra fruit abilities, or any chakra for that matter, with Zetsu's darkness in contact with him. With all those thoughts running through his head, there was really only a single viable option among them, with the miasma having made it all the way to his bicep already. Pulling the single kunai he stored in his pants pocket in case of emergency, he stabbed the single blade into his mid-bicep and cut away at his flesh and bone until his arm was fully severed at that point and fell limp on the ground before even the bone was eaten away. As the blood spilled from the stump that was left of his right arm, Naruto stared at it, not fully comprehending that he just mutilated his own body. It was only after hearing Zetsu's cackling that Naruto bellowed in pain once again while clutching his bloody stump before igniting it with his regenerative flames to stop the bleeding, as it was impossible for him to regenerate an entire missing limb in his current condition. "Did you enjoy that little taste of what's to come?" Zetsu asked while still laughing maniacally, earning a heated glare from the half-dead boy. "I call that my Respira, breath of death. Though, I can do far better than that. Let's see if you can survive against what it can really do." Raising just a single finger, Zetsu released a large wave of the Respira, breath of death, radiating outwards of him, immediately rotting anything it came into contact with, including the earth they were standing on to a certain extent. With so much adrenaline pumping through his body, Naruto's sense of pain and exhaustion was dulled, thus allowing him to counteract. Igniting his remaining arm with flames as he raised it upwards, Naruto released a roaring wall of intense flames as he swung his arm down for a counter. Kaioken, Mirror Flame. As the two destructive attacks met in the middle, large shockwaves were sent all across the land, causing sections of earth to shatter as they were torn from the ground due to the impact. Darkness clashed with fire in a fierce battle of dominance and survival. Flames burned away the darkness while darkness absorbed fire in a clash that looked to be evenly matched. The next moment, the two techniques exploded, sending both parties reeling back as a large dust cloud erupted from its epicenter. Naruto clenched his fists and gritted his teeth in reluctance as he felt some of the miasma enter his lungs. Apparently, he had breathed some of it in while the two techniques had clashed. It was far more potent than he had hoped, and there was only one option he could think of to prevent the inevitable. Using the last of his regenerative Phoenix Chakra, Naruto focused solely on repairing the damage done to his lungs and burning away the miasma that would have eventually destroyed his body from the inside out, but he wasn't able to cure everything that had been afflicted by the eternal darkness. When the dust cleared, Zetsu and Naruto were both standing near similar positions as they started at. The only difference was that both of Naruto's eyes were closed, presumable to keep the dust out as far as Zetsu was concerned. However, that couldn't have been farther from the truth as Naruto's eyes suddenly snapped open, revealing a 4-point pinwheel design in his right eye. It seemed he needed his Mangekyo Sharingan after all. Zetsu seemed to notice this, but didn't bother concerning himself because Naruto wasn't even bothering to make eye contact. Therefore, he deduced that it was either a ninjutsu-based Mangekyo or the boy was unaware of its unique abilities and was relying on it to read movement better. Either way, it wouldn't be much of a help at this point. At least those were Zetsu's thoughts on the matter. Naruto braced himself as if preparing for another clash, but really he was just playing the part to not raise any suspicion. Kodo Amatsukami. Activating what was known as the most powerful genjutsu in existence, Naruto entered Zetsu's mind to manipulate him by giving him false experiences in order to make him believe that he would be doing things of his own free will. He wasn't strong enough with the technique to make large changes inside the mind, but he could at least make sure that Zetsu doesn't use that decaying technique again. That much was easy, anymore, and Zetsu would easily pick it up though. What was unique about this just was that it didn't even require eye contact and was practically impossible for the target to become aware that they were being manipulated. You will not use those decaying techniques anymore. One drawback was that it couldn't be used multiple times in the same month. Even with his Otsutsuki Chakra, Uzumaki Blood, Distant Senju genes, and Distant Uchiha genes, the Kodo Amatsukami was so powerful that it had its limits. Perhaps after he trained with it more and perfected his ocular prowess he would be able to use it multiple times in the same week, but for now he was limited to once a month. He also couldn't give more than one order at a time. Naruto would have liked to order Zetsu to stop using his devil fruit altogether, but that would take several orders and put a lot more strain on him than just prohibiting the use of a single technique. For the rest he could rely on regular high-level genjutsu. Logia types were extremely susceptible to genjutsu. The only explanation Naruto could come up with was that Yin release is a reflection of the spirit, which is a similar concept to Haki, only a lot less complicated and watered down. Seeing as how he was preparing for an attack earlier not to make Zetsu suspicious of his inactivity for several moments, the one-armed teen needed to follow through. Higan, fire gun. For a moment Naruto forgot that he now only had one arm, but after recovering his fault he pointed his index and middle finger at Zetsu like a gun. After turning his fingertips into flames he shot a volley of bullets made of fire towards his current enemy. Is that the best you've got? Zetsu mocked while, once again, creating a shield of darkness to block the incoming projectiles. Unlike before however, it was similar to what he was using at the start of the battle rather than that cursed miasma. Naruto didn't let up though as he continued to unleash his Higan, fire gun, in Zetsu's general vicinity as he ran diagonally fairly wide of Zetsu's right side. When Naruto got within range, he switched his hand from a gun-like position into where his palm was facing forward in preparation for a switch in offensive maneuvers. Kajiro, Heat Haze. From the palm of his lone hand, Naruto spread a barrage of heat-seeking beams of highly condensed fire towards Zetsu in a fashion similar to a volley of arrows. The original technique was meant to blast only a single stream, but that would have been easily countered just as his Heiken was at the beginning of the fight, so right now he could only improvise. One thing that Naruto noticed earlier was that each volley of fire bullets had pierced about an inch or two into Zetsu's darkness shield before being subjected to nullification, only noticeable due to the Sharingan. Zetsu's darkness was capable of absorbing chakra, but that took far more time than the simple nullification and was mainly targeted for larger-scale attacks. The nullification was faster but still needed to identify what kind of chakra it was before dealing with it, or perhaps it was because his flames were mainly composed of natural energy. Whatever the case was, this was an opportunity that Naruto could exploit. If that same barrier of darkness went up against something with enough speed and piercing power, it wouldn't be able to hold for long, resulting in a similar outcome as when Zetsu was pierced with the Shinka, Shiranui, Sacred Flame, Unknown Fire. As expected, Zetsu enveloped his body with a barrier of darkness, thinking that it was a perfect defense because it was created of chakra nullification properties. He smirked as the volley of compressed flame projectiles made contact with the shield, knowing that it was a futile attempt. However, his eyes widened and his smirk fell as the dozen small beams of fire pushed their way through the darkness and pierced through it completely, and him along with it. Because it was a volley meant to cover a wide area, not every single one of the streams hit their intended target, but nevertheless, Zetsu was forced to drop the ineffective barrier as close to half a dozen beams pierced his upper body and clipped his arms and legs. Zetsu grunted in pain as he reached towards one of the holes in his chest, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw the silver liquid that covered his black hands and body. Was that his blood? He had never been wounded ever before in the millennia he had existed on this plane. Was this what his blood looked like? Was he going to die? No, he would not die. He needed to resurrect Okasama so they could finally be together again. To create the perfect world that Okasama had always wanted before those despicable brothers of his got in the way. He refused to fall to one of the kind that betrayed Okasama. Zehahaha. Zetsu bellowed furiously, the silver liquid pouring from his body as he staggered forward. No. I refuse to die. Not before I fulfill Okasama's lifelong dream. I refuse to fall to some insect like you. Naruto watched on as Zetsu flooded the atmosphere with his darkness, creating a dark mist all around his side of the crater. With a thrust of his arm, Zetsu caused the wind to pick up and morph into a series of rapidly spinning, thin tornadoes that had fused with the black mist in the atmosphere. These black tornadoes continued to circle around Naruto as if stalking their prey. Araburu Fuga no Yashiro, Shrine of Turbulent Fang. Unable to do anything at the fierce wind snuffed out any flames he tried to conjure up, Naruto could only stand there helplessly as the winds converged on his form, morphing into an even more massive tornado that enveloped him and sent him flying in the air. Naruto roared out in pain as the adrenaline in his system died out and could feel each and every blade of wind slicing up his body as he weathered to merciless storm with everything he could until he was eventually tossed out of its range and into the wall of the deep crater. Using every ounce of willpower in his possession, Naruto staggered to his feet and limped forward, blood pouring from his wounds with every step as not an inch of his body could be found that hadn't been scarred by his battle with a force of nature itself. He couldn't even see straight any longer as his vision had been impaired by the severe amounts of pain he had been subjected to, alongside the waterfalls of blood that flowed over both eyes originating from his forehead. Even as his vision blurry and turned red from having the blood seep into them, Naruto's eyes never lost their defiance or will to fight. Seeing as how in his current state he wouldn't even be able to walk straight, Naruto released a rippling shockwave that cracked the air and washed over the surroundings, having a similar effect that Zetsu's wind had on the terrain earlier, albeit on a much smaller scale, before forcing in back inwards on himself to dominate his sense of pain. It would only last as long as his haki remained active, but it was only meant to be a temporary solution anyways. Zetsu frowned as he recognized what that strange energy was. So you do have it, proof of one who has the qualities of a king, though you haven't even seemed to scratch the surface of what haki can really do once its full potential has been achieved. That was nothing more than the fake version of it. As the feeling of having every cell in his body screaming in agony faded away completely, Naruto's posture straightened, but a confused look made its way onto his face as if to question Zetsu's words. The whisper was barely audible, so he may have just heard his enemy wrong, but before he could question what they meant, a flash of lightning illuminated the darkening sky as dusk fell. TCH. He's overdoing it again. Zetsu muttered as he glanced upwards toward one of the ledges that overlooked where they were standing within the crater. His attention seemed to have been brought off his prey for the time being. Naruto, who was standing on the complete other side of the crater after having been tossed around like a rag doll once again, looked up to where Zetsu's attention had been focused while the blood pooled beneath him as coughed up another lungful of the red liquid. He may have dominated the pain with his Haoshiku haki, but that only eliminated the sense of pain. It did nothing for the effects of his condition. However, his focus quickly shifted to his left as he felt a build-up of familiar chakra that was reminiscent of a shunshin, though he made sure to only verify the presence using his peripheral vision. He couldn't afford to let Zetsu out of his sight. He was already outmatched when he had his complete focus on the black being. Getting distracted would prove to be fatal. Though, it was obvious Zetsu was not of the same opinion as his gaze was still focused on the outskirts of the crater. Not a moment later did a panting, slightly disheveled Mikoto appear in a swirl of leaves holding her barely conscious daughter in her arms. Both of their clothes were torn in a fashion reminiscent of a fierce confrontation, sections of their skin were singed from light burns, their bodies beaten fairly well, and covered in small amounts of blood. Their condition overall was nowhere near the state that Naruto was in, but he surmised that they ran into the other Akatsuki member who he had lost track of in the earlier stages of his own fight. Satsuki, you've gotta stay conscious. I can't fight someone like that and take care of you at the same time. I need to go back for Natsuki and Narumi too. They were in an even worse state than we were. Mikoto's voice was panicked as she shook her daughter, trying to break Satsuki out of the pain and exhaustion that looked to be overcoming her. "Kaa-san, he's too strong, we can't fight him." It wasn't any louder than a whisper, but Satsuki managed to grumble those few words in between wheezes for breath. She struggled to get to her feet, but was forced back to her knees as she clutched the right side of her abdomen. Naruto caught this and concluded that her ribs were fractured with the help of his Sharingan. Mikoto probably shunshined to this exact location because she was able to sense his chakra signature but had forgotten about it in her current sense of panic. Though he was genuinely relieved to see that they got out of a battle with someone of such power relatively unharmed when compared to the state he was in. "Mikoto, Satsuki, are you two alright?" Naruto spoke up, trying to get the two to break out of their trance and realize their surroundings. The two female Uchiha immediately perked up at the voice, easily recognizing who it belonged to. "Naruto, thank goodness dash." Mikoto started to say, but her eyes widened in horror as she took in his disfigured, blood-soaked appearance. "And Naruto? Oh Kami, what happened to you? What's going on?" Satsuki was in a similar state of panic, but instead of freaking out like her mother she was frozen in shock, her voice not able to leave her throat as she continued to open and close her mouth subconsciously. "Don't worry Mikoto, nothing more than a few scratches, I can still fight." Naruto smirked slightly at them over his shoulder. He didn't have much hope for what the outcome of this battle was going to be, but he refused to outwardly show it. Right now he needed to be strong for the two of them, especially if the other Akatsuki member, Enel, he remembered, would be joining the fight. But Naruto? Why your arm?" Mikoto cried as she stared at the stump that had once been his right arm. "There's no time for that right now." Naruto snapped, causing the two girls to flinch. He couldn't afford to be subtle or sugarcoat things at the moment. If nobody had the will to stand up and fight or keep on walking forward no matter the odds, then this town would be their graveyard. "Get ready, it looks like the other one is already here." As if on cue, Enel stepped forward onto the ledge overlooking the crater, Natsuki and Narumi's unconscious and charred bodies being dragged along by their throats as Enel surveyed the surrounding area before his eyes landed on Naruto's own. Smirking, he tossed the two unconscious girl towards the boy as he disappeared in a flash of lightning and reappeared by Zetsu's side. Naruto's blood boiled like never before as he reached out his lone arm to catch one of the girls, having to settle with breaking the other's fall with his own body. While his mind was filled with rage, he was still able to think clearly. Looking at the two girls' beaten forms, he reached out his arm to check their pulses. Much to his relief both of them were still alive, only unconscious and would be for some time judging by wounds. Laying them down by Satsuki's side, he whispered a short, "Take care of them, you're in no shape to continue either." Standing back up, he turned to Mikoto and considered all his options at the moment. They were extremely limited, if anything things just went from bad to worse with that appearance of this Enel. Zihahaha. The Akatsuki already has 4 chakra fruits belonging to their members. Earth, lightning, wind, and darkness. In fact, if Enel finishes off your little friends early, you may get a look at the Goro Goro no Mi. If Zetsu's earlier words were anything to go by, then they were most definitely in for a lot more trouble now. It wasn't very surprising that they weren't able to fight him off when they couldn't even touch him. So he's lightning. Naruto thought to himself, wondering just how the hell they were going to get out of this fine mess. "Mikoto." Naruto whispered to Mikoto, who was still crouched down on one knee and panting fairly hard. "I'll be perfectly honest, I don't see an outcome that doesn't end with all of us dying." Mikoto's eyes looked downwards despondently after hearing Naruto's blunt assessment of their current situation. Though she couldn't deny any of the facts. Natsuki and Narumi were down for the count, Satsuki was barely conscious, Mikoto herself wasn't in great condition either, and Naruto was in worse condition than all of them combined. She couldn't even comprehend how he was still able to stand. But, whatever. Naruto let out a deep sigh as he walked forward. "There's not much you can do here. You won't be able to touch the taller one and the black one can nullify any kind of chakra once his influence touches you. I should be able to hold them off for a little while longer, just back me up when the time comes." Naruto continued to walk forward towards the middle of the makeshift arena, not bothering to acknowledge the cries of objection from Mikoto as he continued to venture forth into what may very well be his last battlefield. Stopping at the very center, Naruto opened both eyes as he glared murderously at the two imposing figures who appeared to have been waiting for him. His Mangekyo Sharingan spun idly as the two Akatsuki members stood completely still, not a trace of fear or uncertainty present in their chakra signatures. Normally after using the Kodo Amatsukami he was forced to shut his eye until he was able to use it again, but that side effect had been bypassed through the use of Haki. He would not allow anything to hold him back from his very best in this situation. though even that may not be enough. You know? Enel drawled on with that ever-lazy expression on his face, though it was soon replaced by a smirk. I really do hope you put up a better fight than those girls did. The Jinchuriki were especially disappointing, couldn't even stand up after a single bolt of lightning. Though from that look in your eyes I don't think I'll have to worry about that. No words were spoken by Naruto as his arm pulsed black with the essence of Busashoku Haki. 3 sets of eyes locked onto each other momentarily before the one that stood opposite the other 2 vanished from existence. Though unmastered and untested by him, Naruto had utilized the Shinsaku, extreme speed, to cover the vast distance between him and the Akatsuki members faster than the eye could blink. It was possible to use such a high-level speed technique of the Phoenix clan without the use of a partial Phoenix transformation, but it was incredibly risky and strenuous to one who had yet to master the basic version previously. Appearing right behind Enel, Naruto spun around to deliver a palm strike to the unexpecting S-rank Nuke Nin. Though just as quickly as Naruto arrived to his position, Enel charged his golden staff into a bladed trident by superheating the metal with lightning, which was immediately covered in Busashoku Haki as the former Kumonin countered the Konoha strike as their respective spirits fought for dominance. Knowing that he would be at a disadvantage if the battle wasn't kept at a fast pace and if he let them access their vast amounts of power, Naruto began his counterattack. He quickly grabbed hold of the trident and leapt into the air, coating his right leg with Haki as he spun in midair to deliver a hook kick to the side of the taller man's head. For as strong as Enel was, he had a bad habit of underestimating his opponents, so he shouldn't have been too surprised when he was pushed back a few feet from the impact of that kick. So you are a strong one indeed, but in the end, nothing can stand up to the raw power of lightning. Enel, while only possessing average strength for a shinobi and only having basic knowledge of Haki due to not bothering to learn much about the ancient art, was nearly untouchable once he began to fight seriously using the powers granted to him by the Goro Goro no Mi. Slamming his trident on the ground, Enel released a widespread current of electricity that tore apart the earth's surface as it raced towards Naruto. Seeing this, Naruto attempted several back handsprings to maneuver out of the way, but after realizing the current wouldn't stop following him, he jumped high into the air. Katan, Goka Meshitsu, Fire Release, Great Fire Destruction. After gathering the necessary amount of fire within his lungs, Naruto breathed out a massive stream of intense flames that were meant to engulf the target in the wide sea of flames it produced. Though instead of consuming the 2 Akatsuki members, the stream of flames were forced to the ground where they died out after being subjected to an increase in gravity courtesy of Zetsu. It seemed that he wouldn't just sit back while Enel entertained himself. Naruto landed back on his feet after a backflip in midair to counter the recoil that the short increase in gravity produced. He dug his hand and feet into the ground to slow how far he was pushed by the shockwave before finally coming to a standstill. Naruto looked up just in time to see a bolt of lightning racing right towards him. Kajiro, Heat Haze. A beam of highly condensed fire shot out of Naruto's palm to intercept the bolt of lightning before it could reach him. While normally not mentioned unless the 2 powers are in a relationship of superiority, each of the abilities granted from the chakra fruits is capable of combating the others. This is due to granting the user with a high capability with natural energy, one of the only effective ways of even touching those who are intangible. As the 2 attacks met in the middle, they fought for dominance as they were continuously supplied with more energy. Just as it looked like it would remain a standstill until one side gave in, the 2 techniques exploded from the center in a storm of fire and electricity. Neither side moved a muscle until the smoke cleared, revealing that not one of the individuals had been on the receiving end of the force of the explosion. When they locked eyes once again, Naruto instantly vanished with his Shinsaku, extreme speed. Not even a moment later did Naruto reappear in front of Enel as he brought up his Haki-coated leg and tried to smash it into the side of Enel's head once more. This time Enel was prepared though. Lightning burst around his trident as he struck forward and drove it straight through where the boy's heart was. Intangibility or not, with lightning that was created from the purest form of natural energy, that single strike would put an end to the battle. Not bad boy. Enel spoke as he lazily lifted up his trident with one hand so that the boy was lifted off his feet but still horizontal to him. It ended a little sooner than I had hoped, but it was to be expected for someone so young. I wouldn't be so sure about that just yet. Naruto taunted as he reached out with his hand and gripped the trident that was currently impaled into his chest. Enel frowned, not knowing what the boy was attempting to do, so he merely amplified the amount of electricity being channeled through his weapon. Intent on putting the boy out of his misery, it was rather pitiful watching Hai try to struggle when he already had 1 foot in the grave. Instead of being vaporized by the high voltage and temperatures, Naruto burst into a flock of crows that cawed loudly and obstructed the vision of the Akatsuki member, disorienting two of his major senses in the process. Karasu Bunshin, crow clones? Isn't this one of Itachi's jutsus? Enel questioned to no one in particular as he blocked his vision with an arm from the flock of crows. Ryusoken, Cane, Ryuo, Dragon Claw Fist, Flame, Dragon King. The real Naruto suddenly appeared behind the disoriented Enel, his hand pitch-black with haki as it formed a three-fingered claw hand strike and ignited with crimson-orange flames, before slamming his claw into the base of Enel's spine and twisting his claw with incredible force, causing the man to spin violently as he was thrown through the air after being blasted away by the subsequent vortex of fire that had originated from Naruto's claws. Naruto was not able to follow up with his onslaught, however, as a large arm that was eerily similar to the Susanoo grasped him in its hand and began crushing the body within its grip. Naruto recognized this as Zetsu's work since he was unable to call upon any of his chakra right now. Without being able to let out a constant flow of his haki, all the pain that Naruto had received returned to him full force along with the pain of his bones being snapped and shattered as the hand that surrounded his entire body save his head continued to crush him. Naruto let out a blood-curdling scream as all his senses were overloaded at once with nothing but pain. This lasted for a good few seconds, then nothing. He couldn't feel anything, not even the arm that had been crushing him throwing him into the earth as he was released with the ground shattering beneath him. Naruto wasn't sure exactly how, but he managed to get back to his feel. It was a strange sensation. He knew that he was now standing, but he couldn't feel his legs. He looked down at his hands and saw them clenching into fists, but he felt like he couldn't have been the one controlling that movement. He didn't even feel the snapped bones that were protruding from his ribs, legs, and arms. He just felt numb. The best conclusion Naruto could form in his hazy state was that his senses had been so overloaded by pain that they shut down completely. He looked back at Mikoto and shook his head in the negative as he saw he about to get up from her knees and rush to his side. As much as he hated to admit it, her charging into battle would do more harm than good here. He couldn't be worrying about her with every move she made while trying to fight off these two at the same time. Before he could continue that line of thought, Naruto jumped back several times as the electrical sound waves that traversed the air had been turned into electrical explosions and set off in a linear fashion from each and every place he had been standing. These explosions were similar to the one that signaled their presence within the town in the first place. Naruto didn't know how he managed to escape those explosions, his body was acting more on instinct than anything. His body only stopped moving as the explosions came to a close. He spoke too soon as another flash of lightning appeared right next to him. This one was different however, it was far faster and didn't build up its energy for an explosion. It confused Naruto for a moment before his eyes widened and he tried to jump away once more as the lightning dispersed and revealed Enel, his back partially charred from the attack that Naruto had dealt to him only minutes prior. Enel reached his arm out and gripped his shoulder hard before Naruto had a chance to get any distance between them. You really shouldn't have done that. I was fine with letting Zetsu deal with you and only having a little bit of fun here and there, but you've annoyed me for far too long. Before Naruto could even open his mouth, electricity burst to life around Enel's arm and shocked his body. Naruto, whose body was still unresponsive, didn't even flinch as the right side of his body was shocked from neck to toe. The lightning was so concentrated that it refused to move about like a current as it usually did and chose to burn a single spot much like fire. Enel grew more annoyed as Naruto didn't even let out a scream of pain as his body started to steam and char over. Zihahaha. Zetsu bellowed maniacally as he stood on the other side of the battlefield. Must have been put through so much pain that his body's no longer responding to him. Probably can't even feel a thing anymore. Why don't you see how much he can take before that changes? Enel dispersed the lightning in order to get a better look at the boy in front of him, flicking the protruding bones to see what kind of reaction he got. He only received a murderous glare in return. You know, he's right. You're pretty much dead already, but I can still have a little fun with you, even now that defiant glare remains. Let's see if we can't change that. Before Naruto could understand what those words meant, Enel already had his hands over Naruto's left eye. Naruto tried to pull away, but found that his body was now completely unresponsive as opposed how it was acting out of pure instinct before. Seeing no way out of this, Naruto braced himself for the feeling of having his eyeball ripped out of his skull. An explosion of flesh, tissue, and blood was what he saw through his right eye instead, just as he found was suddenly unable to see out of his left. Maybe it was incorrect to say that he couldn't feel pain. His mind couldn't register it, but that did nothing to stop his physical body from collapsing to its knees as his consciousness wavered. He watched as blood and chunks of flesh and tissue dripped onto the ground below, unable to understand fully as to what had happened to him. It's quite interesting, you know. Naruto managed to somehow raise his head enough to look up at the man who had done this to him. Bioelectricity, that is. I caused the electrical signals in your neurons to explode outwards after they gathered at an epicenter, which just so happened to be your eye. Though I can only do that when I'm in contact with the person, it'd be unfair to be able to do this remotely, don't you think? Without waiting for an answer, Enel vanished in a flash of lightning until he was casually sitting on the edge that overlooked the crater. He was done with his fun, now he'd let Zetsu take care of the boy just like he had originally wanted. Naruto's remaining eye opened as he managed to raise his arm to the left side of his face. It was true, his eye was no longer there. That wasn't the worst part though. For a good portion of his face, he could feel nothing but bone. No skin, no muscle tissue, no more blood, just his pure unobstructed skull. The surrounding world seemed to freeze and all noise from the crumbling environment became eerily silent. Quite aware of malevolent atmosphere that bathed the area despite his diminished senses, Naruto raised his head to face the source of the aura that he knew all too well. Zetsu slowly stalked forward, the insane and maniacal expression that he had worn for most of the battle had been replaced by stern and serious one. As he walked, the skin of the palm of his left hand opened up so that a short, bone-hilted bone sword, formed from what looked to be a humerus bone, could be drawn out by his right arm as if it were a scabbard. This was the single bone in his body. This was a gift from his mother on the day of his creation. It was a shame it would be destroyed immediately after usage. Your blood and will alone have shaped into a sin that I cannot allow to exist. Zetsu's deep voice resounded throughout the area as he drew out the last of his bone sword and held it pointing towards the ground. Tomogoroshi no Haiketsu, all-killing ash bones. One of Okasama's favorite abilities, and her final gift she granted to me as I was created. It only seems fitting to kill you how Okasama should have millennia ago. Naruto could only watch on as Zetsu rushed towards him with long bone draw back, intent on silencing him for good. It was useless, he couldn't even move a single muscle. Even if he could, he wouldn't have gotten very far with the kind of state his body was in. It seemed his time was up. In the span of a single moment his entire life flashed before his eyes. There were so many things he could have done different, so many words he should have said, so much time that he had wasted, but his only regret was not knowing if everyone else would find some way to escape a tragic end such as his. With those final thoughts in his mind, he closed his eyes for what may have been the last time and waited for the sweet embrace of death. It never came. Wondering if death had been so swift that he never even felt it, Naruto slowly opened his eye. His lone eye widened in horror at the scene that played out before him. Standing only a few feet in front of him was Uchiha Mikoto, her back towards Zetsu as she clenched the bone sword that was embedded through her abdomen to prevent it from piercing all the way through her in a last-ditch effort to save his life. Mikoto coughed up a lungful of blood that stained her chin before she fell forward onto Naruto's body while the blade quickly deteriorated into nothing more than ash. The puncture wound left by the blade began to produce thin cracks all over her body as the area closest to the wound slowly began to decay into ash. Time seemed to freeze for Naruto and Mikoto as they knelt there in the middle of the battlefield. Naruto's body was trembling in shock with his eyes still wide, not wanting to believe what was unfolding right before his eyes. He could feel her warm breath panting uncontrollably on his neck and her left arm wrapping over his shoulder to keep her upright, but it felt too much like a nightmare for any of this to be reality. Not all those conscious reacted in such a way though. K.A.Chan. Satsuki, who was still watching over the motionless bodies of her other two female teammates, could only stare on helplessly while tears streamed down her face as she watched her mother suffer what looked to be a fatal wound while protecting her brother figure. Feelings of anger, fear, despair, and distress flooded her senses, and fueled her ocular powers as her three Tomo Sharingan subconsciously activated and began to evolve. Each of the Tomo slowly spread out with each passing second and converged along the edge of the iris, taking on the appearance of three intersecting ellipses. Satsuki was unaware of what was happening to her, all she knew was that her eyes felt like they were being ripped out of their sockets, so when she saw that Zetsu was approaching her mother and brother again to finish the job that he had intended in the first place, all she could do was scream. No! Stop! Opening her left eye as something inside her willed her to do so, Satsuki concentrated solely on Zetsu, the man she wished to stop from harming her family any more than he already had. Large waves of black flames materialized all over the battlefield near her focal point, causing the man to jump out of the crater to avoid the sea of unquenchable flames as they circled around the pair in the middle of the crater, forming a protective wall. Immediately after such a display of power, the pain of awakening the Mangekyo Sharingan took its full effect. Satsuki's eyes quickly reverted back to their onyx color as she collapsed onto her face, her consciousness fading from the pain and exhaustion. Naruto didn't even glance at the sea of flames burning away the land around him as his attention was focused solely on Mikoto. Using what remained of his physical strength, Naruto wrapped his arm around Mikoto's waist as she rested her chin on his shoulder. The rotting of her physical body was starting to spread. Was this really it? Was this really happening? I'm sorry, Naruto. Mikoto managed to breath out in between her fits of heavy panting. You were fighting so hard to protect us, and me doing something like this feels like I wasted all your effort. Please forgive me just this one last time. What are you talking about? Don't say stupid things like that. Naruto desperately yelled despite his trembling voice as tears freely fell down his face. It's no good, I can tell when my own end has come. I'm not coming back from this, so Naruto, listen up. Mikoto spoke quietly as sweat, tears, and blood all mixed on her exhausted face. She was glad they weren't looking at each other right now. She wanted Naruto to remember her as the strong woman who was always there right beside him, not as the weak, dying woman she was now. What are you talking about, Mikoto? Mikoto, please, you can't die now. His voice never sounded so desperate and afraid before. Begging on his knees didn't suit him at all, but she could understand given the circumstances. No. You promised you would never leave us alone. You told me, didn't you, Mikoto? You said you wouldn't die. Yeah, you know, if it weren't for falling in love with you, and having a daughter like Satsuki to raise and take care of, I would never have even wanted to live. Nobody else would have wanted me after all, so it's only natural. Naruto could feel Mikoto's tears falling onto his back, making him sob even harder as he felt like a piece of him was being torn away. I know now you'll somehow manage to get out of here alive after all of this, so could you please tell Satsuki goodbye from me? I wish I could do it in person, but I don't think I'll make it over there. I won't let her die, I won't let any of them die. Naruto declared as his sobs became more pronounced. I have a few regrets. The only ones that really matter are not being able to grow old with the man I love, and not being able to see my daughter grow up into the fine woman I know she'll be. Make sure to take care of her. Mikoto clung onto Naruto even tighter. She felt her time was coming to an end as she felt even more of her body decay. Naruto didn't say anything, no matter how much he wanted to. He still had so much left to tell her, so much more time he wanted to spend with her. He didn't want her to leave yet, but he knew this wasn't a time for him to be selfish. These were the final words that he would ever hear from the woman that could never be replaced in his heart. My voice is getting too quiet. Naruto, I want you to listen to these final words I have to say now, and tell it to my daughter afterwards. Though she knew she would get these words out with her final breath, a soft smile graced her lips as the tears fell down her face. Satsuki, Naruto, even though I was never the perfect shinobi like my clan and the village wanted, even though I carry the blood of a cursed clan bound by hate, even though I was never the perfect mother, and couldn't give either of you the perfect family you deserve, thank you, for loving me. With those final words said, the life faded from Mikoto's eyes and the arm that had been clinging onto Naruto's shoulders so tightly relaxed, causing her to lose her support and fall to the ground as the rest of her body decayed to ash and was carried away by the wind. Even though he knew this was going to happen from the moment that blade ran her through, even though he accepted she died for his sake, even though he promised to fulfill her final wishes, he still couldn't accept that she was gone. That he would never see her smile again. He would never hear her laugh again. He would never hear her tease him again. He would never see her again. So could you please tell Satsuki goodbye from me? I won't let her die, I won't let any of them die. Not being able to see my daughter grow up into the fine woman I know she'll be. Make sure to take care of her. My voice is getting too quiet. Naruto, I want you to listen to these final words I have to say now, and tell it to my daughter afterwards. He felt an unimaginable amount of pain in his right eye, even in his numb state, but he didn't care. The only thing that mattered was keeping his promise to Mikoto. He would protect her. He would protect everyone and make sure they got out of this alive. But he couldn't. He felt his world slowly begin to shatter as he lost the feeling of loving the woman he loved most consumed him. He felt his mind slowly beginning to break as he fell back onto his knees, his body and mind not capable of going on any longer, but his will remained strong. He felt his haki reach out and wrap around each and every one of them to protect them. It wasn't his usual haki either, he was out of chakra to do so. Naruto's entire consciousness was quickly becoming consumed by white. The last thing he felt was the incredible surge of power in his remaining eye and the feeling as if someone else was linked to it and looking through it. His mind went blank as the image of the full moon above him was burned into his sight. Had he remained aware a few moments more he would have heard the whisper of a woman. Don't worry my son. This time I'll make everything right. This time I'll protect you, so let your mind be at peace. We'll be together soon enough. The will of fire still burns, cruel reality. Self-deception. Desperation. Loneliness. Isolation. Regret. Anger. Hatred. Abandonment. These were the traits of suffering that Naruto had expected to endure when he was overcome by unconsciousness, when his mind shattered from the grief of Mikoto's death. However, he felt none of that. His entire body retained the numbness that it had during battle as it floated across the vast expanse of white that made up the world that he currently resided in. Even his mind felt numb, as if something was forcibly blocking those negative emotions from flooding his senses for the time being. Where am I? Naruto couldn't help but feel an odd sense of nostalgia as he felt the waves of white energy harmlessly roll over his body and seep into his open wounds. He couldn't see where he was as the majority of left side of his face had been ripped off and the odd sensation that was occurring within his right eye which forced it to remain shut, but he was fairly certain that he had never been here before. His suspicions were raised even further when only seconds after the energy invaded his body, did he enter a state of high-speed regeneration. He felt the wounds and burns that plagued the majority of his body start to close up or grow new skin and tissue. His entire body cracked at every joint, vertebrae, and bone was mended back together and repaired until they were stronger than ever before. It mattered not whether they were only fractured or shattered until they barely existed. Nerves and tendons reached out from where flesh still remained on his face and connected their ends until bone was no longer showing, though this wound was rather slow healing as it was his nervous system in that area that was destroyed as well. Of course there were always limits as the stump of his right arm healed, but failed to grow a new limb. The same could be said for his missing eye. You're finally awake, Sochikuin. You had me so worried about you. A woman's voice spoke softly. Naruto was startled by the sudden appearance of another person, but he didn't flinch or jump as he was still unable to move. He tried to muster his voice, but for some unknown reason no sound came out. Then there was the voice. It sounded eerily familiar but he just couldn't place it. And why was she calling him her son? It certainly wasn't Kushina, nor was it Mikoto. If his emotions weren't being numbed, he was sure he would have felt a pain in his chest right where his heart was. Your body isn't strong enough to speak yet, it needs to focus on regenerating itself. The feminine voice was barely more audible than a whisper, but Naruto heard it as if it was spoken right into his ear. He heard a certain fondness in her voice as the energy that was surrounding him comfortingly wrapped itself around him even more. But you felt it before your mind broke, Sochikuin, you finally awakened your haki. Not the pseudo-replication of it, but the real thing, the power that we used before the birth of chakra. Naruto took a moment to process everything that this woman was saying. Awakening haki? Had he not been using haki before? He remembered reading Zetsu's lips previously, where he mentioned something about fake haki. Before the birth of chakra? He now recalled that before the birth of chakra haki was used as a main form of combat, but he had never connected their use of haki with not possessing any chakra within their bodies. Yes, haki has existed long before chakra. It was a power so fearsome that it enabled mankind to wage countless wars against each other until nothing in their world existed besides war and conflict. However, its strength and usage would vary between every person. You remember how different your haki felt when you were on your last legs, didn't you? You didn't just awaken your haki, but reached an awakened form of haki as well. Though his peaceful expression did not change, the woman could tell that Naruto was deeply confused by her words. She smiled softly, noting how serene and innocent he looked. It looked as if he was sleeping since he wasn't able to open his eye just yet. Reach out with your haki, Sochikuin. Use it to communicate your thoughts and feelings. Reach out to me just like you did with those girls. The woman whispered to Naruto as she gently stroked his hair. Not entirely sure of how to do what this woman was saying, Naruto released the strange energy that he had felt coursing through his body. It wasn't chakra nor was it that white energy that was accelerating his regenerative abilities. Was this what haki in its true form felt like? He felt the haki flow outwards of him as he willed it to gently wrap around the woman who was idly stroking his hair. He didn't know how to control this evolved form of haki, so he was acting merely on instinct. Naruto was confused as to why his haki was responding so lovingly to the woman as he was sure they had never met before, it had never done something like this before. Perhaps it was because it was able to sense the love and adoration that was radiating off of the woman. Unsure of how to do the rest of what the woman spoke of, Naruto let his thoughts travel through his haki so that the woman could understand them. Who are you? The woman smiled warmly at him, knowing that he wasn't able to see her with his haki quite yet, he could only sense her. Why, I'm your Kaa-chan, of course. My Kaa-chan? Naruto thought to himself, confused. The woman smiled softly once again as she tapped him on the nose with her index finger. She enjoyed being able to interact with her son in such a way. it finally felt like she was being given a second chance at life. A chance where she wasn't corrupted by the power she once held. Her biggest regret in life was losing her son because of her own fear. Fear that if chakra fell into the wrong hands, then the world would be thrust into its war-torn state once more. Chakra corrupts, my child. It is a power that humans were never meant to wield. The woman spoke, choosing to answer his question with her personal story. I've made many mistakes in my life, but only a few were important for me to remember. I went mad with the power given to me by the Shinju, but I always had good intentions, though I suppose that doesn't make up for everything. Even though I became a tyrant, the world was getting better. Wars had ended, violence was at a minimum, the only real threat was the resistance to my reign. Do you know who I am now, Sochikuin? Naruto was left speechless for well over a minute as he let everything the woman said imprint itself into his mind. If he was able to open his eye, he was sure it would have widened as much as humanly possible as he laid eyes on the form of Otsutsuki Kagaya. You're Kagaya. Do you know why I refer to you as my son? It is because you are my son's will. You inherited his will, and that is why you know of his past, his life, his experiences. That is why you are able to wield his power and why your flames reject my very existence. Naruto did nothing to acknowledge that he had heard Kagaya. His mind remained quiet as he let the woman continue to speak. I loved him, you know. I'd let the entire world burn if it meant protecting him from harm. Kagaya whispered as she brought her hand onto Naruto's cheek. That's why I had to push Ace away. I couldn't let him get involved with anything related to chakra. That's also why I forbid him from interacting with his brothers. He may have seen it as favoritism, that I didn't care for him at all, but I truly loved him with all my heart. My biggest regret was killing that woman, Portgasti Rogue I think it was. I killed her out of jealousy. Jealousy that she could have the perfect life with my son, when it was the only thing that I had ever wanted. I suppose that it was ironic that it was that action that caused him to turn on me. Naruto remained quiet once again, however this time it was in utter shock rather than by choice. You've seen what the world today is like. All the violence, war, and senseless bloodshed was what I had been trying to prevent, though I may have gotten a little lost along the way. Hagoromo and Hamura couldn't see the world for what it truly was, they couldn't what it would become. They were always far too trusting, even being so naive as to wish to spread chakra to every person in the world. They couldn't see that doing so would lead to the world's eventual collapse, but I suppose that it is too late for such worries now as everything is already in motion. Kagaya sighed as she knelt down and placed Naruto's head on her lap, gently stroking his hair once more. I regained my senses and was cured from my state of madness after my chakra was separated from my body and I was sealed away in what is now known as the moon. You should know as well as I do that the true gift of the Shinju isn't chakra, but the natural energy that now makes up our entire beings. Even after I was sealed, I watched from the moon in this ethereal form to see what became of the world that I hoped to protect. Kagaya sighed once more as she paused from her story. As he always intended, Hagoromo spread his teachings of Ninshu all across the world. However, following his death, humans began using their newfound power of chakra to fight against one another, thus widening the rift between humanity instead of bringing forth harmony. Harmony? Naruto questioned, unable to equate the woman who he had thought a tyrant to the gentle woman before him. Though everything that he had thought he knew about her had been constantly proven wrong. He could tell that all of what Kagaya had spoken was the truth, as the veil of haki that he had wrapped around her for communication purposes could also determine a person's intentions. Once upon a time, Sochikuin, but that is no longer my wish. I believe you know that abomination that I created. I cannot apologize enough for what he has done to you and your family, nor do I expect you to forgive me for creating him once your mind is right again. He was created while I was still caught in my madness with the purpose in instigating my revival and the Mugen Tsukuyomi so that I could return humanity to what it should have been. Kagaya sensed that Naruto was about to respond, so she placed her index finger on his lips to silence him for the time being. It wouldn't do well for him to develop any opinions too fast before knowing the entire story. But now I realize that I must let mankind find their own way. I no longer wish to guide them to the proper solution. For the numerous millennia that humans have existed without me, there has been endless wars and bloodshed. What good is bringing peace to people who only wish to fight and rule? No, they must find their own way this time around. I only wish that one day you may accept me as your Kaa-chan, Sochikuin, maybe even live together as a family someday. Yes, that would be more than I could ever ask for. That last part was nothing more than a whisper that Naruto only managed to make out parts of. More thoughts than should be possible were racing through Naruto's mind as he listened to Kagaya's story. What he was just told was something that completely altered history and the birth of the current world. How different would the world be if Kagaya had remained the ruler of the world? How many lives could have been spared if people knew of Kagaya's intentions? It seemed that neither side were right in their actions, nor were they completely wrong. Why do you keep calling me your son if you know we're two different people? Naruto questioned as the last bit of Kagaya's story made its way into his mind. Kagaya smiled warmly at her pseudo-son as she gently cupped his cheek. I told you already, you've inherited my son's will. I know that you're two very different people, but you're also quite similar. I see a lot of what he used to be within you. You remind me so much of him that I almost can't stand it. Did you know that I originally created the Mugen Tsukuyomi with the intention of creating a world where I could have a second chance at being a mother for him? I think he somehow found out about everything and led me to you for that wish instead of having to involve the entire world with my selfish desires. Almost immediately after Kagaya spoke those words did the world that they currently occupied illuminate a bright white as the surroundings around them began to rumble. What's going on? What is that? Naruto thought frantically as he was unable to feel what was happening around him. His haki was still wrapped around Kagaya and was still far too unskilled with its new form to use it for various purposes simultaneously. It seems our time here is up. I wanted to talk to you for much longer, but it took a long time for your body to reach a condition where you return to consciousness. You've been asleep for over a week and now you're finally waking up. For reasons that were still beyond him, Naruto was reluctant to leave this sanctuary. Part of that reason was because he didn't want to feel the overwhelming sense of pain and loss that would overtake him from losing Mikoto. He knew that it sounded like he was running away from his problems, but part of him still refused to accept that she was really gone. She had been one of the constants in his life, and more importantly, one of the few people that he cared about in the entire world. The other half of the reason was that he would miss Kagaya. Will I ever be able to see you again? Kagaya smiled gently at the boy once more, something that she found that she had been doing a lot of recently, and did something that surprised the boy greatly. She cupped his chin with her index finger and thumb, after which she leaned down and placed a loving kiss on Naruto's forehead. Do not fear, Sochikuin, you'll see me again eventually. You felt it earlier, didn't you? You're right, I now connects us. Should you ever need me, I'll be there for you. That is why we met so soon after all, because you needed me. Next time I hope it will be on better terms though. The vast expanse of white that surrounded their world radiated even brighter before it became unbearable. Just as white overtook all of his senses and surroundings, Naruto heard Kagaya whisper the final words he would hear from her for the time being. Goodbye, Sochikuin, remember Kaa-chan will always be there for you. Konoha Hospital. What's the damage report? Obito's rather calm demeanor betrayed the rapid pace that he and Tsunade traversed the hallways of Konoha's hospital at. It had been over a week since the team he had sent to the border of Hai no Kuni arrived at the village gates via a spatial rift with all the returning members in an unconscious state. Wounds ranging from severe burns to mental trauma to severed limbs, it was hard to tell at first glance just what happened to the team. The Uzumaki Namikaze girls had woken up half a week ago and had been discharged the following day but had been prohibited from any kind of physical activity for at least 2 weeks, neither of which could relay just what happened after they made contact with the enemy. Satsuki had only awoken from her short coma only a day ago, and in her broken state was only able to relay details about her mother's presumed death. Naruto was still deep within his coma and was not expected to wake up anytime soon with the severity of the wounds he suffered. They would have to wait until then, as his condition suggests he was the one who fought whoever they encountered head-on. What Obito was referring to though was relatively unrelated to the condition of his former students and their team. Just this morning was Uzumaki Namikaze Nawaki reported missing from the village by Haruno Sakura, who made contact with him last night before he rendered her unconscious so that he could leave the village. With the village's forces spread so thin, the best shinobi that could have been assembled consisted of several members of the rookie class alongside Madogai's team. The last member that had been dispatched had already arrived back in Konoha, Nawaki nowhere to be found. It was presumed that he was taken to Orochimaru by his own accord if the reports of the Chunin leader in charge, Inuzuka Hana, were anything to go by. Tsunade sighed, knowing just how many of the shinobi sent out were seriously wounded on the retrieval mission. Akimichi Choji and Hyuga Niji are both in critical condition, but I have the best medics here working on them, so their condition should be stabilized by the end of the day. Inuzuka Kiba is suffering from internal bleeding, Tenten has several broken ribs, and Nara Shikamaru only has a few broken fingers. Rock Lee and Inuzuka Hana are virtually unscathed save a few bruises, flesh wounds, and lacerations. Obito sighed deeply at how many of shinobi he had sent out were wounded. He was relieved that none of them had lost their lives on such a high-ranking mission, but he was still worried at the fact that some of them were in critical condition. He supposed that a mission such as this should have been nearly impossible for a group of inexperienced genin and a lone chunin to complete. Especially if the verbal report that Hana had given to him was accurate. None of them were ready for a mission of this caliber, but we didn't have much of a choice considering that most of our manpower had been severely depleted after the Suna/Odo invasion. Obito said more to himself than to Tsunade. Nobody could have known that something like this was going to happen. You just got forced into a bad situation because of the state the village was in when you were sworn in as the Godame Hokage. Tsunade consoled Obito as she went over medical charts on her clipboard while they walked. Though I suppose we should have put more thought into Nawaki's mental state as soon as it began deteriorating. Even if we need the Guardian's permission to see what's going on in a child's mind and initiate any kind of therapy, we should have been able to come up with an alternate decision. I still don't see why Minato and Kushina-chan were so reluctant to let a Yamanaka enter Nawaki's mind. Many believe that when one becomes a shinobi, then they are considered a legal adult. That is partially true, but it is also a popular misconception. This law dates back to the Shinobi Wars when children became shinobi at a very young age, some even graduating from the academy as early as 5 years old. It would be wrong to let a 5-year-old drink alcohol and make important legal decisions when they weren't ready for it. Therefore, a civilian cannot be considered a legal adult until the age of 18, whereas a shinobi cannot be considered a legal adult until the age of 16 or until they reach the rank of Chunin. Though the Uzumaki Namikaze quadruplets were all technically over 16 years of age, those who had the Kyuubi's chakra sealed within them were regarded as only 13 years of age in the eyes of the law. Sticking a giant mass of chakra into children who were just born would generally have adverse effects. When dealing with the Biju, it takes time for the body to adapt and assimilate the chakra into their bodies. Because of this, their aging is slowed for the first few years of their lives until the chakra can be adapted safely. Therefore, while Nawaki, Natsuki, and Narumi are all 16 years old, they have the mentality and bodies of those who are only 13. It probably had to do with their fear of the Kyuubi, not that I can't understand that. Obito responded after a moment of silence to think about his sensei's actions. Being spoiled rotten as a child, given special treatment for housing the Kyuubi, used to being in the spotlight as the son of a Kage, expected to be the best no matter the odds, then barely winning his preliminary match, being defeated so easily in the Chunin exam tournament despite being personally trained by Minato-sensei for a month, and finally having what made him special and gave him his power ripped out of him. I suppose that would be enough to drive any child over the edge, especially with his mentality. Seeing the confused expression that made its way onto Tsunade's face, Obito chose to elaborate on his previous train of thought. As his sensei, I naturally grew curious about Naruto's dislike for his family. It took some time and trust, but he eventually informed me of the inner workings of Uzumaki Namikaze's family and what made each one of them tick. He's a smart kid, you know. He had to be to keep his sanity in that kind of environment growing up. It played a lot on his emotions. Obito ignored Tsunade's raised eyebrow and continued with what he knew as they rounded another corner. Anyways, Nawaki has always had very large inferiority and superiority complexes, so with his crushing defeat recently and the loss of his most prominent source of power, it isn't too surprising that he would seek power elsewhere. Tsunade's eyes widened at the implications Obito was making. Sure, Nawaki had always wanted to grow stronger, but that was only natural in the kind of world they lived in. And the inferiority and superiority complexes were news to her, though she supposed it wasn't too surprising with the boy's most recent mental state. Would he really abandon the village just because he no longer had the Kyuubi's chakra? The village is all he's known his entire life, having only been outside its walls a handful of times. What if the Sound Four, I think they were called, didn't give him any other choice? Tsunade suggested, remembering how much she used to coddle the boy and how much he used to remind her of her deceased little brother. I wanted to believe that and give him the benefit of the doubt since he's Minato-sensei's son, but reports from both Haruno Sakura and Inuzuka Hana clearly state that he left of his own accord and the Sound Four was tasked with escorting him to Orochimaru while he went through the process of awakening the second stage of the cursed seal en route. Obito responded with a shake of his head, crushing any hopes that Tsunade still held firm. But, Tsunade started to say before she was cut off by Obito. Try to look at this objectively, Tsunade. As the child of a Hokage, there are naturally very high expectations from shinobi and civilians alike, putting a lot of pressure on them from birth. Then there's the fact that Minato and Kushina had already neglected one child, albeit unintentionally, because he didn't have any of the Kyuubi's chakra sealed within him, which could make him paranoid that if he was no longer a Jinchuriki then his parents wouldn't love him anymore and throw him off to the side like they did Naruto. Tsunade immediately looked at the current Hokage incredulously. You can't seriously believe that Minato and Kushina-chan would do that, would you, Obito? Hold on, Tsunade. Obito waved his hands in front of his face defensively, not wanting to end up like Jiraiya always did when he did something unbecoming of him in front of Tsunade, before retaking his Hokage persona. Personally, no, but try to think of everything that had happened recently from Nawaki's standpoint. Inferiority and superiority complexes at their finest, unimaginable amounts of paranoia, hatred towards his brother for scarring his body, now only at the level of an ordinary genin without the cursed seal, already strapped to a bed like a common prisoner, and having no visitors while in the hospital due to his psychiatric state. I personally believe that all that would be enough to drive a 13-year-old past their breaking point. Before the conversation could go any further, though there was not much left to say on the topic at this point, the two finally arrived at their desired destination, where a disheveled-looking Shizune emerged from the double doors of the operating room as the "in surgery" sign above them was automatically shut off. "Ah, Tsunade-sama. Hyuga Niji, his condition has finally stabilized," Shizune informed as she wiped the sweat from her forehead. "We were forced to use the child's hair as a medium and had to be exact in restoring the cell ratio to the damaged area where every strand in hair needed to be manipulated with the use of medical ninjutsu, but we finally managed to repair the damaged tissue and organs. His life is no longer in danger, but it'll take him close to 3 weeks to be back at full health." That was good, far quicker than was expected. It had been just under 5 hours since the two that were in critical condition were brought in. It spoke volumes of Shizune's prowess in medical ninjutsu for someone who was on the verge of death to be stabilized so quickly. Obito gave a nod in thanks whereas Tsunade continued to question the obviously exhausted woman. "Have you heard anything of Akimichi Choji's condition? That would have been our next destination, but it would be best to know beforehand if my presence is necessary there. I've been working hard to get this medical department up to snuff and am greatly impressed with the level of skill of the doctors here. I have no doubt that with time many people here will reach my level." Needless to say, Shizune was shocked into silence for a moment by Tsunade's statement. Tsunade was widely known for holding the title of best medic in the elemental nations. For her to admit that those under her would reach her level in time was an evaluation that an medical nin should be proud of. Thank you Tsunade-sama." Shizune responded with a deep bow to Tsunade, her face showing obvious surprise by her sensei's praise. "I haven't heard from the doctors that were working on him directly, but the assistants that swapped in informed us that Akimichi Choji's condition had stabilized. The continuous cell destruction effect of the Akimichi clan's pills were stopped by an antidote created from a recipe that you created years ago, Tsunade-sama, when treating Akimichi Choza. He should have been moved to a recovery room just over an hour ago." Obito smiled at the news that Shizune had just relayed. The mission had been a failure, but everyone had come back alive. That was what was really important this time around. No longer would shinobi needlessly sacrifice their lives solely for the purpose of the mission. There will always be times when sacrifice is inevitable, but it had become a far too common occasion ever since the Nidame's reign. Even Minato had led by that philosophy. No longer would children become sacrifices to create Jinchuriki. No longer would entire clans be sacrificed on the premise of peace. There were more than a handful of innocent Uchiha that had been unjustly slaughtered on the night of the Uchiha massacre. They just never were as outspoken against the coup d'état as Mikoto had been. No longer would shinobi be forced to live in shame for choosing their comrades' lives over the mission, like Kakashi's father had done. Important changes would be coming to Konoha over the next few years. Before the conversation could continue any further, a violent explosion garnered their attention as the vibrations of the shockwave produced could be felt even where they were standing. Out of pure reaction, each of their heads immediately jerked towards the direction the explosion came from to determine if there was any kind of threat. "Tsunade-sama, Hokage-sama. What was that?" Shizune questioned frantically, not entirely sure of what was going on at this point. It came from the isolated wing of the hospital. "Shizune, come with me," Tsunade ordered as she quickly rounded the corner as Shizune rushed after her, leaving an ever-calm Obito behind. Obito sighed as he knew exactly who was causing such commotion. Obito calmly strolled after Tsunade and Shizune as if he had all the time in the world. It would be best to give the boy some time to adjust to his surroundings, seeing as how the last thing he remembered was fighting enemy shinobi or something of the like. It was likely that things would only go downhill from there once he recalled the events that transpired before his sudden return to the village. Yes, knowing how destructive the boy could be, it would be best to give him some space for the time being. Though that was not the only thing that concerned Obito at the moment. There was no denying that Naruto was strong. He had gone toe-to-toe with the boy countless times during the time that he was Naruto's sensei, and while the Chunin had never once beaten him, he had never once lost either. His intangibility was something that Obito was never able to figure out. It would have given him enough of an edge to best enemies that would otherwise been out of his league. That begged the question, just who could have pushed Naruto so far? Obito paused for a minute as he glanced at the identification next to the door that held the patient's name. Portgas D. Naruto was the name displayed within the lone occupied room in the isolated ward of the hospital. After hearing Satsuki's recount of what happened on their mission, he had thought it best for Naruto to be moved to a more secluded area of the hospital as to not injure anyone when he woke up. Naruto, while composed and highly controlled a majority of the time, was quite aggressive and violent when he let his emotions run wild, and if he was anything near the mental state of Satsuki at the moment, they would definitely have their hands full. Obito breathed out a deep sigh before stepping through the open doorway and surveying the condition of the room. The majority of the surfaces of the room were singed a light black, small clusters of flames flickered across the floor every now and then. Tsunade and Shizune were quickly going through the medical report that were still intact with confused expressions on their faces, but what drew his attention the most was the wall that was currently missing from the hospital room. The entire wall that faced towards the forest was now nothing but a pleasant view of the landscape, minus the heavy rainfall of course, with flames flickering along the edges of where the wall should have been. It should also be noted that Naruto was nowhere to be found. Well, it's be expected, I suppose, nothing is ever normal with him. Obito sighed once more as he shook his head. At least other patients were put out of harm's way with his relocation to this room a day prior. Tsunade, though you said that he wouldn't come out of his coma for who knows how long. What could have possibly caused him to recover in such a short amount of time? Tsunade tossed one of the reports she was skimming over to the side, seeing that it contained no relevant information as per the current situation, before handing another to Shizune and looking over towards Obito. If the medical reports were any indication, then Naruto should have remained in a comatose state indefinitely. Though there were some strange notes that referred to a white energy that wrapped itself around his body like a veil for a period of time, the attendants at the time had merely thought it was an advanced form of the Uzumaki clan's regenerative abilities. There's no possible explanation for him to be capable of cognitive thinking after only a week. Uzumaki regeneration be damned. A large portion of the left hemisphere of his brain was severely damaged by whatever happened to the left side of his face. There was even a fairly large possibility of him never waking up and remaining on life support until we were given permission to pull the plug. Obito overlooked Tsunade's current aggression as it was to be expected. She was renowned throughout the world for her astounding medical prowess, so it was natural for her to feel frustrated after misdiagnosing a patient. That's not the thing that bothers me the most either. Tsunade mumbled to herself as she massaged her temples, unknowingly earning the undivided attention of Obito. What do you mean? Even if the Uzumaki regenerative abilities were able to restore his body, it wouldn't have been able to. Tsunade sighed. This entire situation was causing her one massive headache. She really needed a drink after all this was resolved. I didn't mention this earlier, nor was it in any of the reports, because it shouldn't be possible. His entire chakra network is gone. Obito made the perfect expression of a fish out of water for a few long moments before letting what he had just heard sink in. I'm sorry, Tsunade, I think I misheard you. Could you please repeat that one more time? His confusion was understandable. Every living being possessed a chakra network even if it was never used. Even in cases such as Rock Lee's where the individual was incapable of molding chakra externally due to a disability, they still used it as a life source and a source of energy. Many had theorized that every chakra network was tied into a person's lifespan, and such cases like opening all 8 of the inner gates resulted in the death of the user after all of their chakra had run out. Naruto's entire chakra network is gone. As you know, the chakra network is enmeshed into the body and, like blood vessels, it touches and interacts with every single living cell and passes through every internal organ. It didn't just mysteriously vanish either. Whatever happened to him out there caused his entire chakra network to decay until it disappeared from existence. The final traces of his chakra disappeared around half a week ago. That was also around the time that the white energy began to be reported making its appearance. What I'm saying is that I've never seen a case like this in all my years as a medic. Once again Obito was shocked into silence. This time Shizune had also stopped searching through the medical reports as she stared at Tsunade with wide eyes. She had not been privy to any of those details. Sure, she was aware that Naruto had been in critical condition and for some strange reason medical ninjutsu had little effect on him, but she would have never come to that conclusion if it had not been stated right before her by the best medic in the elemental nations. Many medical jutsus worked by injecting the medical chakra into the patient's chakra network, after which it was sent to the afflicted area through the use of precise chakra control. Every person was born with a chakra network, which is why any person could become a shinobi, even if they only had the chakra reserves of a civilian. Medical ninjutsu could be applied to the wounded area directly without the need of an individual's chakra network, but those methods were quite outdated and not nearly as effective as the alternatives. Was that why Tsunade had been looking over old medical books as of late? Why she had been focusing so much of her attention and energy on Naruto over the course of the past week? After several minutes of silence, Obito finally accepted what Tsunade's explanation. It actually did explain a few things. Natsuki and Narumi had been allowed visitors the day after they had arrived at the hospital, as their only injuries consisted of second-degree burns, though they were spread over a majority of their bodies, and mild bruising, neither of which were life-threatening. That being the case, Minato and Kushina had come to visit them the second after they were allowed, which eventually snowballed into Kushina hysterically searching the halls of the hospital after hearing the rumors of what kind of condition Naruto was in. Kushina, while being one of the best sensors that Konoha had, was unable to find her son due to his lack of a chakra signature. She was eventually restrained after suffering a mild mental breakdown in the middle of the lobby from assuming the worst when she was unable to find her son. This little event did raise a few questions at the time. What of these flames then? Obito asked as he walked towards one of the edges of the room that was alit with small flames. Surely these can't be created from chakra if he no longer possesses a chakra network. I couldn't tell you, Obito. Tsunade said as she sighed once more, something that she found herself to be doing a lot of recently. All I know is that Naruto is no longer capable of molding chakra. If you want anything more than that, then you'd have to find out directly from him. I'm worried about him, Obito. Mikoto was like a mother to him. Obito was about to respond, but something caught his attention. From his spot near the edge of the room, he noticed a small trail of flames on the ground below that led into the forest. He made note of the observation before pulling out a Fukahoin, fire sealing method, scroll that he prepared earlier in the week should Naruto have decided to burn the hospital to the ground when he woke up. It was only by pure chance that Naruto had decided to wake up today. Tsunade, Shizune. Why don't you go and check on the other patients that had arrived today? I'll clean up these flames, then I'll go out and check on Naruto. I think he could use a little time for himself at the moment. Obito suggested before unraveling the scroll. This was going to take some time. Konoha Cemetery. A single tear slid down from his lifeless, three-tomoed crimson eye until soon, a steady stream of salty tears flowed its way down his pale cheek as it was camouflaged by the steady fall of raindrops, releasing the sadness and sorrow that had been held inside him for all this time, but still he did not utter a sound. The unrelenting downpour of rain was enough to vacate the cemetery of its usual visitors. However, one lone figure remained. At the very front of the cemetery next to the Will of Fire monument, where all of Konoha's previous Kage are buried, was the memorial monument, a long wall created from black stone, where each and every one of Konoha's shinobi who have fallen in the line of duty are remembered. Naruto's bandaged, disfigured frame traced the newest name that had been engraved. Uchiha Mikoto. As he cried, there was a certain rawness to it, like the pain was still an open wound. Those wounds that he had received from the Uchiha massacre all those years ago felt like they were being ripped right open again before salt was then added to them. The sobs were stifled at first as he attempted to hide his grief, then overcome by the wave of his emotions he broke down entirely, all his defenses washed away by that tide. When he forced himself to look back up at that lone name, he was the picture of grief, loss, and devastation. It was the face of one who had suffered before and didn't know if he could do it again. The area surrounding him had suffered for his rage and refusal to believe that she was really gone. His newfound haki had torn the ground to pieces, ripped trees in half, and shattered the small cliffs that surrounded the cemetery. It did not dare to touch the memorials or the graves though, even with it was being released unconsciously because of his inner turmoil. Naruto's will would not dare to desecrate the final resting place of those who had fallen. The scene of her death was burned into his memory courtesy of the Sharingan. Even if he wanted to delude himself into believing that all it was only a dream or he was just trapped in some horrible genjutsu, he couldn't because those memories were burned into his mind and continued to repeat themselves. It was as if he was locked in a living nightmare. I'm sorry, Naruto, you were fighting so hard to protect us, and me doing something like this feels like I wasted all your effort. Please forgive me just this one last time. It's no good, I can tell when my own end has come. I'm not coming back from this, so Naruto, listen up. Mikoto spoke quietly as sweat, tears, and blood all mixed on her exhausted face. She was glad they weren't looking at each other right now. She wanted Naruto to remember her as the strong woman who was always there right beside him, not as the weak, dying woman she was now. Yeah, you know, if it weren't for falling in love with you, and having a daughter like Satsuki to raise and take care of, I would never have even wanted to live. Nobody else would have wanted me after all, so it's only natural. Naruto could feel Mikoto's tears falling onto his back, making him sob even harder as he felt like a piece of him was being torn away. I know now you'll somehow manage to get out of here alive after all of this, so could you please tell Satsuki goodbye from me? I wish I could do it in person, but I don't think I'll make it over there. I have a few regrets. The only ones that really matter are not being able to grow old with the man I love, and not being able to see my daughter grow up into the fine woman I know she'll be. Make sure to take care of her. Mikoto clung onto Naruto even tighter. She felt her time was coming to an end as she felt even more of her body decay. My voice is getting too quiet. Naruto, I want you to listen to these final words I have to say now, and tell it to my daughter afterwards. Though she knew she would get these words out with her final breath, a soft smile graced her lips as the tears fell down her face. Satsuki, Naruto, even though I was never the perfect shinobi like my clan and the village wanted, even though I carry the blood of a cursed clan bound by hate, even though I was never the perfect mother, and couldn't give either of you the perfect family you deserve, thank you, for loving me. Disappear. Disappear. Naruto screamed in agony, the memories too painful for him to bear, as his haki turned a bright white as the ground around him shattered, causing large cracks to spread throughout it with him at the epicenter where the earth shifted. The winds rapidly began to pick up and surged into the sky as he begged for the memories to stop. Even the storm clouds above were not immune to the overwhelming release of haki as a rift was caused, giving the impression that the heavens were splitting. Naruto fell back onto his hand and knees as he let the tears flow freely down his face. His anger replaced with despair and grief, causing the weather to return to normal as the unrelenting downpour of rain once again began to soak the bandages that covered every inch of his body where wounds began to reopen and bleed through before being sealed closed by his innate recuperative abilities. After a few silent minutes of letting his tears stain the ground, Naruto sat back on his knees as he stared at the memorial with an unfocused gaze. Instead of rereading the name that he dreaded to see up there most once over again, he gazed at the glossy, black material of the wall that mirrored his reflection. He chuckled humorlessly at how pitiful he looked. His body was covered in bandages from head to toe, only revealing his hair, the right side of his face, and his mouth to the outside world. The stump that was once his right arm gave him a disfigured appearance, but otherwise was nothing notable. Blood stained the majority of the bandages as well as the pair of shorts that he had woken up in. Overall he looked pitiful, pathetic, weak. The scars that he had received as a child had begun to fade until there was no longer any trace that they were ever there just after he had first received Marco's chakra. Judging from the amount of bandages that covered his body, he was bound to have a few more now. It was funny in a way, having your body restored to what it should be only to have it broken even further only a month or so later. I'm still so weak. Mikoto would probably have teased him relentlessly as she saw how pathetic he was acting right now, but he couldn't bring himself to stop the tears. Just the reminder of her name alone was enough to break the dam of tears that were beginning to dry. Naruto was no longer sobbing though, he simply let all of the raw emotions flood his system as the tears freely flowed down his face. I've already pinched my cheek hard enough to tear it right off. If this was a dream, I would have woken up by now. This isn't one, is it? Naruto asked seemingly to no one as he stared back lifelessly at his reflection once more. The memories of Mikoto dying in his arms still fresh as though it had happened mere moments ago. Mikoto died, didn't she? There was a moment of silence where only the sound of rainfall colliding with the surroundings could be heard along with the occasional roll of thunder. Normally the composition of Naruto's body would have turned the raindrops to steam the second they came into contact with him, but nothing was normal today. His flames were responding to his emotions, his sadness and grief causing his flames to turn cold. It was an odd sensation, the cold side of the flame. After a long silence, the voice that Naruto had been expecting finally spoke up. Yes, Mikoto is dead. The voice of Obito answered bluntly. He had once been where Naruto is now, he knew fully well how much pain his student was currently in, but just as he had done before, Naruto needed to find his own path through the darkness. Naruto clenched his eye closed as hard as he could, causing tears of blood to fall. He gritted his teeth and clenched his lone fist hard enough to draw a steady stream of blood. He did whatever he could to prevent himself from feeling the pain of Mikoto's death, even if it meant replacing it with physical pain. Why? 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 Naruto screamed as he clutched his head with his hand. Why did she have to die? It was supposed to be me, I was the one who should have died. Why would she sacrifice herself for someone like me? Obito looked at his student seriously, recalling all the events that led him to where he was today. Mikoto was dying, she'd been sick for a while now, but only came to me recently. I only found out about her condition when she requested to join your team for that mission. Apparently it was a disease that only runs through the Uchiha clan. I had never heard about it before due to its rarity, having only a 1 in 1 million probability of being contracted by an Uchiha. The disease eats away at a person's chakra from the inside out, along with the organs and cells that the chakra network was intertwined with, deteriorating the body until it became fragile and weak, where it was no longer able to function properly. Obito paused for a moment to let everything sink in before continuing. I was given permission to look through her medical records by Tsunade. Mikoto probably inherited it from one of her parents, though which one is still unknown. There was a test done when her children were born to see if they contracted the disease from her. Itachi inherited a diluted version from his genes, though Satsuki was clean. From what I could gather, if the parent has it then the child is more than likely to inherit it as well. Naruto sat there in silence, listening to every one of Obito's words. How could he have been so blind all this time? She was suffering for so long, yet he hadn't even noticed it until recently. He claimed to have loved her as a mother and as a woman, yet he wasn't aware of something so important. He truly was despicable. So that was why? Naruto asked as he calmed back down, his voice hollow. Because she was going to die anyway? No, she sacrificed herself for you because she loved you. She sacrificed herself for you because she couldn't bear to see another loved one die before her eyes, Naruto. Even had she been at the peak of health, she would have still taken the blow for you. That's what it means to love someone, to protect them no matter the cost, even if the cost is your own life. Obito looked at Naruto as he let the silence settle. He could tell that Naruto was starting to understand the depth of what Mikoto had done for him. The tears that now fell were ones of longing and regret rather than sadness and despair. Though he knew that the reasons for why she was gone could never replace her presence in his life. Let me tell you a story that only a few have ever heard. Perhaps it will help you understand that you are never alone in what you're feeling. Obito's voice grew a little softer as he walked over to the boy and knelt down beside him. There was a time when I felt the same way that you do now. Back during my days at the academy, I was the useless dropout that no one expected anything of, even though I was a member of the famed Uchiha clan. I never knew my parents and was placed in the care of my grandmother before she passed away. I felt alone in the world and so I set my sights on the title of Hokage so that the village would be forced to acknowledge my existence. There was only one person who ever acknowledged me, Noara Rin. I fell deeply in love with her during our days at the academy. How could I not? To me she was perfect, kind, beautiful, sweet, gentle, and she was just so passionate. To my joy we were placed on the same genin team together alongside Hatake Kakashi with your father as a sensei. Those were easily the best times of my life, though that was never meant to last seeing as how we were in the midst of the Third Shinobi World War. One day we were sent out on that fateful mission to destroy the Kanobi Bridge, which would hinder Iwagakure from using Kusagakure as a relief point. Only days before the mission took place, Kakashi was promoted to the rank of Jounin, so he was tasked with leading the mission while Minato-sensei was called to the front lines. We were discovered by Iwa Nin patrolling the area along the way and Rin was captured. At this point in the story, Obito let out a deep sigh. Kakashi elected to abandon Rin, believing it was more important to finish the mission before concerning themselves with her safety. I became enraged at the idea and insisted that we focus on her rescue. When Kakashi refused, I left on my own, telling him that he was worse than trash for abandoning his comrades. I eventually located the cave the Iwa Nin were using as a hideout, but was found by one of the Iwa Nin before I could do anything. Kakashi, having a change of heart, arrived in time to save me from the attack, but lost his left eye in the process. In this time of need, I awakened my Sharingan with my desire to protect Kakashi. We infiltrated the cave and released Rin from her restraints, but one of the remaining Iwa Nin caused the cave to collapse all around us. We tried to make it for the exit but Kakashi had difficulty avoiding the falling rocks because of his damaged eye. When I noticed that he was about to be hit by a falling boulder, my body moved on its own to push him out of harm's way, causing me to be the one trapped beneath the boulder. With the right side of my body pinned down and no way for all three of us to make it out of there alive, I accepted my fate and offered to replace Kakashi's injured left eye with my Sharingan. Sort of an apology for not getting him a present when he was promoted to Jounin. Obito chuckled as reminisced about this particular event. I forced Rin and Kakashi to get out of there before they were trapped by the rubble too. At that point, I had accepted my death. My only regrets were that I had only just started getting along with Kakashi, and that I had never confessed to Rin that I loved her. There was something that didn't quite add up to Naruto. If you died then how are you here now? Obito smiled at Naruto's response thus far. It seemed that he was successfully getting his student to focus on something other than the sadness and grief caused by Mikoto's death. Though, this next part was meant to be a learning experience as well. I was getting to that, no more interruptions. Obito quickly stated before continuing with the retelling of his past. This next part may or may not be hard to believe for you, but I assure you that everything I tell you here will be nothing short of the absolute truth. Obito informed a confused Naruto as he closed his eyes, remembering just exactly how the events unfolded from there. When I closed my eyes for the last time as the rubble continued to collapse around me, I expected nothing short of death, imaging my surprise to waking up again in an underground hideout with my injuries healed and the body parts that had been crushed were replaced with the limbs that I have now. The man who had been caring for me was a frail, elderly man with a pair of Sharingan eyes, who once went by the name of Uchiha Madara. Naruto looked at Obito with wide eyes at the claim. Uchiha Madara was killed by the Shodame Hokage at the Valley of the End not too long after the formation of Konohagakure no Sato. Though it would have been more unbelievable if he hadn't spoken with Otsutsuki Kagaya, the progenitor of chakra, mere hours ago. Though I didn't believe he was who he claimed to be at first, I felt indebted to him for saving my life. I began a long rehabilitation process, with the intention of returning to Konoha to help my friends and the village with the still ongoing war. During my rehabilitation, one of Madara's creations informed me that Rin and Kakashi were in trouble. I left the hideout with the intention of never returning once I saved them. When I finally arrived to their location, I found Rin and Kakashi surrounded by Kirinin and Kakashi plunging his Chidori through Rin's heart. Obito took a long pause, remembering Rin's death like it happened just yesterday, how much pain and sorrow it caused him. Seeing Rin die right before my eyes caused my Sharingan to evolve into the Mangekyo Sharingan. Kakashi's did the same, though the process caused him to pass out right there. I felt so many emotions washing over my body as I watched her body fall to the ground lifelessly. Pain, sadness, despair, anguish, grief, regret, anger, rage, but the one thing that I regret most was that I chose to believe that it wasn't real. In my rage I slaughtered all of the Kirigakure shinobi before cradling Rin's lifeless body in that sea of blood as I refused to accept that it was reality. Obito looked directly into Naruto's eyes as he wrapped up his own experience. I returned to Madara, vowing to do anything for him if it would bring me together with Rin again. I became his student and he imparted all of his knowledge to me, intent on having me carry out his plans once he was dead. We wanted to cast the Mugen Tsukuyomi, something that we believed would replace the current world of violence and death with one where nobody ever needed to die, and at the time, I was determined to create a reality where Rin and I could be together. Everything changed though when I took up Madara's name and took the first step towards carrying out our plans together. I came upon 3 AIM orphans, who had suffered just as much as I had. Their parents had died because of Amigekure's involvement in the Second Shinobi World War, leaving them with only each other, some dying right before their children's eyes, yet they kept moving forward and vowed to grow stronger to protect each other. That really hit me hard. It made me realize that I was only running away from reality, that I was nothing more than a child who couldn't accept that not everything goes your way. Though the pain is still fresh in my heart, I've learned to keep walking forward, that whenever I fall so low again, this time there will be someone there to pick me up and stop me from walking down the wrong path again. Naruto shifted his gaze from the ground to Obito's eyes, finally understanding why he told him all of this. It was foolish for him to think that memories as painful as the ones that kept playing over and over within his head would ever go away. They would stay with him forever because they were a part of him. Those memories were his reality, and even the worst nightmare could never be as cruel as reality. You are still able to see the world clearly, you haven't lost yourself. Obito smiled at his student before comfortingly placing a hand on his shoulder. That brimming confidence which led you to believe you could overcome any obstacle, your own great strength, which you never doubted for an instant, the unsurpassable hordes of enemies who cruelly shattered those beliefs apart, the woman who was always your guiding light in such a dark world. Certainly, you have lost much, but you are allowing that obstacle known as the world to block out your entire field of vision. At this rate, you'll lose sight of everything, you will be engulfed by dark clouds of self-condemnation and regret. Obito stopped speaking for a moment to let Naruto absorb everything that he had spoken. What he was saying was a lot to take in for anyone, let alone someone who had part of their brain damaged, though it was unknown whether that still applied or not. It may be hard right now, Naruto, but you must silence those thoughts. Stop counting only those things that you have lost. What's gone is gone, there's no getting what you have lost back. So ask yourself this. What is there, that still remains to you? Obito's voice continued to rise as he got more into his speech. If there had been someone to tell him this when Rin had died, so much could have been different. He may have finally achieved his lifelong dream of becoming Hokage, but he had changed so much along the way. Naruto's eyes started to water once more as he looked down at his hands and counted the people off on his fingers. He cursed himself inwardly for forgetting about the people that were still here with him that he needed and that needed him. Mikoto's death consumed his entire conscience, giving Satsuki, the girl that he saw as his sister and who was suffering just as much as he was, if not more, no more than a passing thought. I still have my friends. Naruto's tears turned into sobs as he remembered just who would always be there for him. Satsuki. Hana. Even Natsuki and Narumi. And you, Obito-sensei. I still have all of you. Memories flashed through Naruto's mind once more. They weren't of her death this time, but of her final words, words that he had promised to tell Satsuki. I need to see her, I need to see Satsuki. Naruto managed to say as he struggled to get to his feet, the tears not fading in the least. Konoha Hospital, Satsuki's room. Teardrops stained the white bed sheets of the hospital room as they fell from Satsuki's bloodshot eyes while she was leaned up against the headboard with her head resting on her knees. Kaa-chan. The girl whimpered as the silent tears quickly became sobs. She had been like this ever since she had woken up. She couldn't even sleep since every time she closed her eyes, all she could see was her mother being impaled over and over again. It was like she was stuck in a time loop that kept on repeating itself. The worst part of it all was that she passed out from exhaustion and pain before she could hear her mother's final words, or even see her final moments. Gachin, why? She asked to no one in particular. Why did you have to leave? Why did you have to leave us all alone? When she had first woken up, she had thought it to be nothing more than a nightmare, that she would wake up in her room as always and walk into the kitchen where she would be greeted by the smiling face of her mother cooking their breakfast and her pseudo-brother half asleep at the kitchen table while sipping on a cup of homemade coffee. Neither of those occurrences had been the case. Realizing that she had woken up in the hospital was the final straw, causing the memories to hit her harder than ever. Her mother, one of the only constants in her life, was gone forever. Why was it always her? Their family had already suffered so much. The Uchiha massacre, the loss of her clan, the loss of her father, the loss of her cousin Shisui, knowing that her brother was the one to kill them all. The Uchiha massacre was something that still weighed heavily on her mind and haunted her dreams at night. Though the vast majority of the memories that flowed through her mind were of that nightmare that was their mission, many of the memories that she held closest to her heart resurfaced as well. She smiled as she remembered one of her fondest ones. Every Christmas all of the remaining Uchiha gather at the main house and celebrate together. None of them have any family besides each other, so it was sort of a way to remind everyone that even though they no longer had any immediate family, they still had people who cared about them. Obito wasn't included in this little event because he was still in Kirigakure working as a liaison at this point in time, leaving Mikoto as the only adult amongst the bunch. She and Naruto were enrolled in their last year of the academy at this point in time as well as many of the other Uchiha children albeit at least a year below them, and since it was a holiday, everyone got the day off from class. Due to the younger children, wanting to show off everything they learned in the academy, a yearly tournament amongst the Uchiha enrolled at the academy were held at the compound's main training ground. Naruto was pretty much accepted as a full-blooded Uchiha at this point, so he of course was one of those favored to win aside her. Those that were too young to be enrolled at the academy were only allowed to watch and cheer on the others. Satsuki stopped her tears for a moment and chuckled softly as she remembered that day. On that particular day the Uchiha children were all pouting because of how easily they were beaten by her and Naruto, so he challenged all of them at once. She covered her eyes in embarrassment at Naruto's actions, but once she opened them, she couldn't help but laugh. Across the training field, Naruto was standing atop of a pile of beaten Uchiha children, with him beating his chest like a gorilla. After the tournament, they had their annual Christmas banquet. Though the boys had turned it into an eating contest and subsequent food fight, but in a strange turn of events, this time it was Mikoto who was standing atop a pile of food-covered children as she flashed a victory sign. Satsuki couldn't help but let a small smile grace her face as the memories resurged full throttle. Her family really was one of a kind. That momentary break from the pain didn't last long as the tears began falling from her face once more, realizing that her family would never be complete again. That they would never have more memories like those to make since she was the one who always made those little events fun and come to life. Her bandaged hands trembled as she brought the in front of her face before clutching her head, knowing that for every fond memory she had, the despair afterwards would be too much for her mind to bear. Why? Why do you have to keep haunting my mind? Satsuki screamed out to her memories as she clutched her head in pain. Why can't they leave me alone? Why can't I just forget them all? So many emotions were trying to overwhelm her, but none more so than loneliness. Loneliness that she hadn't felt since the day after the Uchiha massacre. In a way it was easier then because Naruto had been the one to help Mikoto and her through the loneliness and pick up all the broken pieces that Itachi had left behind, despite him being in just as much pain. It was easier then because even though she was suffering, she knew she would never be alone because Mikoto would be there right beside her, learning to accept the emptiness together. This time, everything was different. This time there was no one to pick up the pieces. Naruto would try if he could, but from what she heard from the doctors, he was comatose, unknown when he would wake up. It didn't matter, she had broken her promise. All those years ago at the funeral for the Uchiha massacre victims, she had promised herself that wouldn't let any of them die, that she wouldn't let any of them feel the same sadness that they had that day. She had failed? And the consequences were even more painful this time around. Satsuki's gaze drifted to the window, more precisely the rain that was falling. It was raining that day too, the day of the funeral that is. She wasn't so naive as to think that the heavens were weeping for Mikoto's death or for all the lives that were lost during the Uchiha massacre or anything like that. Maybe in a perfect world, but this last mission showed just how cruel the world can really be. Her gaze didn't shift when she heard a knock on the door and someone say that they were coming in. It didn't matter who it was, there were no words that could help her through this. Though she was mildly surprised that instead of a nurse putting a tray of medicine down next to her bedside, she felt the bed shift when someone sat down next to her. "I'm sorry, Satsuki," she heard the voice say after a long silence. Immediately recognizing who that voice belonged to, Satsuki jerked her head towards the newcomer. Sitting right next to her was her older brother figure, covered head to toe in bandage that were soaked in blood and dripping wet from most likely being out in the rain. She didn't care about any of that though as the tears welled up in her eyes as buried her head into his chest. "Nisan," he heard her whisper as he gently wrapped his lone arm around her small frame. "I'm sorry I left you alone, even if it were just for a single day." Naruto whispered into her ear as he felt her tears fall onto his bandaged chest. "I'm the reason Mikoto is dead, she died protecting me." "That's not true." Satsuki's voice was barely audible, but Naruto was still able to pick it up due to their close proximity. She dug her fingernails into Naruto's chest, drawing blood, as she shook her head furiously. "That's not true." Naruto didn't so much as flinch at having her fingernails dragging through his chest. He had been through far worse. The pain in his chest was from seeing the look in her eyes. "Satsu," he tried to say before he was cut off by a swift slap to his unbandaged cheek. "It was hard for me to understand at first, it still is, but Kaa-chan died by her own choice. She was the one who chose to sacrifice herself for you. Don't you dare try to take that away from her." Satsuki yelled furiously before seemingly losing all of her previous vigor and burying her head into his chest once more. "Besides, if it's anyone's fault, it's mine. I was too weak to fight back. I couldn't help either you or Kaa-chan. If you hadn't been protecting all of us, then we'd all be dead, not just Kaa-chan. We owe our lives to you. I owe my life to you." Naruto was quiet for a moment, not entirely sure of what he could do or say. For now he just let her cry into his chest while stroking her hair, not uttering a single word. Neither of them had cried since that day at the cemetery so many years ago. He had already emptied himself of all the tears he could shed, now it was time for her to do the same. "You know, I made a promise to tell you something, and it's about time I fulfill that oath." Satsuki brought her head out of Naruto's chest and looked up at him, her red tear-stained eyes filled with intrigue and confusion. "These words have been replayed so many times in my head that I know them by heart now." Mikoto's final words. Naruto's voice softened significantly as he relayed their mother's final moments, just as he had promised to her. Uzumaki Namake's estate, training facility. Blood dripped from Narumi's bandaged hands as the punching bag in front of her ripped in half from the damage it sustained, causing the sand that filled it to fall to the floor. Narumi stood there panting heavily, staring at her blood-soaked, bandaged hands. They were still trembling uncontrollably from all the electricity that had overloaded her nervous system. Even after a week her nerves were still shot. To be honest, it pissed her off to no end. She clenched her hands tightly into fists upon remembering her pitiful performance during that last mission. One attack was all it took. One bolt of lightning was all it took to send her down for the count. Was that all her training was worth? All those years of training under her parents, learning their jutsu, refining her chakra control, trying to control the Kyuubi's chakra, sparring with her siblings, all her training after she finally became a genin, was that all it was worth? For some nuke-nin to tear all her hard work down with a single jutsu? Narumi let out a cry of frustration when she recalled what her father had told her yesterday. Satsuki's mother, Uchiha Mikoto, had died on that mission. Narumi couldn't believe it. That kind older woman that she had come to like throughout the course of that mission was gone, perhaps even because of her own uselessness. That sounded like the Mikoto she had come to know. She had probably protected her and Natsuki's unconscious bodies along with making sure that Satsuki had gotten to safety. Narumi slammed the side of her fist into the wall, causing small cracks to appear from the impact. If only she had been stronger, if only she had pushed herself further, if only she had fought through the pain instead of giving into unconsciousness, then maybe they wouldn't have lost a teammate that day. Narumi had gone to see Satsuki after she heard that she had woken up. The two of them had never been the best of friends, but they were teammates, even if it was only for a short time. After seeing Satsuki's broken state from the other side of the door when a nurse went in to give her medicine, Narumi had decided it was best for her to leave before making her visit. There was nothing that her pity and condolences could do to help the female Uchiha. They'd be nothing more than a classmate showing courtesy. No, Satsuki was a strong woman, she didn't need her pity. What really set her off now though was hearing that her brother, Nawaki, had defected from the village. Yet here she was, unable to do a thing about it or even help with the retrieval mission due to her previous injuries. Damn it! Of all the things that stupid idiot could have done. Narumi yelled as she started her assault on another punching bag, not even sparing a single glance at the pile of broken ones that were already in the corner. Though if she were being honest with herself, Nawaki's actions weren't much of a surprise. Perhaps actually defecting from the village was a bit of a shock, but it should have been expected for him to take some sort of drastic action sooner or later. It had already been made perfectly clear that he wasn't mentally stable, what with trying to kill his own brother in front of the entire village alongside his questionable actions and attitude all throughout their time as a genin team together. That's not even counting what he was like in the academy. The Chunin exams only cemented any previous notions. Damn! Narumi muttered to herself as she looked up at the ceiling, the punching bag before her already ripped in half from the anger and frustration behind each of her strikes. Why does everything have to go straight to hell now of all times? Uzumaki Namikaze's estate, kitchen. Natsuki motionlessly sat at the bar within the kitchen of the main house of the Uzumaki Namikaze estate, staring out the window at the falling rain outside as she cupped the mug of hot cocoa in her hands. Her mother always made her hot cocoa when she was feeling depressed. She couldn't remember when that little tradition, if that was the right word for it, started, but whenever she was feeling down, it was assured that a mug of peppermint hot cocoa with extra mini marshmallows and whipped cream would be waiting for her on the countertop. Natsuki took a sip of hot cocoa before shifting her gaze from the ever-falling rain to the clock on the other side of the wall. It's almost midnight. Kaa-chan and Tusan got back a few hours ago after receiving a message from the village for them to return home because Nawaki, I can't remember when they said they'd be back. They said something about going to the hospital, but they never really said why. Natsuki's mind immediately shifted towards what had been happening recently. She and Narumi had woken up over half a week ago, but both Satsuki and Naruto were in far worse condition than either of them. Satsuki's injuries were never life-threatening, but her condition was far worse than her own had been. Natsuki had been saddened when she heard of Mikoto's death, but she hadn't gotten to know the woman very well. Still, she couldn't help but wonder how Satsuki was coping with the loss of her mother. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to lose her mother or father, but Satsuki had lost just about everyone in her life. It made her appreciate how privileged her life was when compared to someone who had lost their entire family. Sure, she had lost her older brother, but he was still alive and in the village, though he no longer considered them to be family anymore. Thinking about Naruto made the girl wonder about his condition. The extent of his wounds were kept from just about everyone, including her parents, so she had no idea when she would be able to see him again. She really hoped that he would be okay. Then there was the brother that she could say that she had actually lost. Neither her nor Narumi had gotten the news that Nawaki had defected from the village until their parents had arrived home, much earlier than expected to make sure that they were all right and unharmed. Nawaki was housed at the mental ward at the hospital before his escape, but who was to say that he wouldn't return to his home for some kind of revenge or something of that nature? Narumi had headed across the estate to the training facility to vent her frustration, no doubt making those poor punching bags suffer her wrath. Natsuki sighed. Her sister had never been great at expressing her feelings unless it was through violence or aggression. She, on the other hand, had retreated to her room for a while to sort out her thoughts and come to terms with what Nawaki had done. It took some doing, but Natsuki had finally come to terms with it and had come downstairs, only to be met with a hot mug of cocoa and a note from her mother, giving a brief message of where they were going and for how long they would be gone approximately. Natsuki's grip on the mug subconsciously tightened before her hands shot back open, causing the mug to fall to the floor and shatter, staining the ground with all the liquid that it held. She brought her trembling hands up to her face and stared at them in agitation. Every now and then it felt like a surge of electricity would flood her system. It wasn't as bad as Narumi, whose nerves had been fried by the lightning, but there would be times that she would lose all the feeling in her body for a few moments because her nerves went numb from the shock. That small jolt only served to remind her of her recent defeat. Tsunade had said that all of the extra electricity should be gone within the next week or so, but it was still a pain to deal with. The medics at the hospital had done their best to remove all the electricity that flooded their systems, but that last small bit was transversing their nervous systems and was moving too fast for any of the doctors to remove directly. They just had to wait for it to run its course. Natsuki clenched her bandaged fists so tight that blood began pooling on the countertop. She was pathetic, that much had been made perfectly clear. To be defeated by a single bolt of lightning had wounded her pride just as much as her body. She couldn't stay as she was now. If she did, then she was sure she wouldn't survive next time. TCH. This leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Next time I won't be taken down so easily. Konoha Hospital, Tsunade's office. You know, since legally you're not his legal guardians, I'm technically not allowed to speak to you about his condition because of doctor-patient confidentiality. Tsunade stated as she looked up from her paperwork and into the eyes of Namikaze Minato and Uzumaki Namikaze Kushina, who sat across from her on the other side of the desk. But I suppose that with the circumstances that have been surrounding all this and the Yondaime Hokage being the one asking, I can bend the rules a little. Kushina's eyes visibly lit up at Tsunade's response to her pleading. Minato, however, kept the serious expression that had been displayed on his face ever since he received the urgent message to return to the village. He knew all too well that if Naruto had been perfectly fine or had only suffered from mild injuries, then Tsunade would have told them. He didn't know if Kushina could take any more bad news today. Tsunade, please. Any information at all will be more than enough. Kushina begged, wanting to know that at least one of her sons was still okay. The knowledge that Nawaki had defected from the village was weighing heavily on her mind, but if she at least knew that her other son was all right, then that would be enough to stop her from breaking down right there in the office. I just need to know if Naruto is all right. I need to know if my son is okay. Tsunade sighed, not knowing if hearing about Naruto's condition would break her will or not. I'll be upfront about this and say that I've withheld how serious of a condition he has been in since we first admitted him into the hospital over a week ago. His condition was easily the worst of all those that had been brought in that day. By all means he should have been dead. Now I have both some good news and some bad news. It would be better for you to hear if we broke them up. Which would you like to hear first? Both parents' eyes widened as they heard Tsunade admit that their son should have died. Though he no longer wanted anything to do with them as a family, he was still their child and they never stopped loving him. Even if they could never be a real family ever again, him being all right was more than enough for them. Tsunade. Why? Why would you hide this, Fro? Kushina yelled as slammed her hands on the desk before being cut off by her husband. The good news. Minato gave his wife a look that told her to settle down and listen to what Tsunade had to say first, before going off on one of her emotion-filled tirades. Tsunade glanced at Kushina as the redhead removed her hands from the desk and sat back into her chair with her arms crossed, an ashamed look marring her face. The good news is that Naruto has finally awoken from his coma, just earlier today in fact. He'd been in a comatose state ever since he arrived back at the village gates, but he's fine now. Evidence of that is when he broke out of the hospital earlier today, though he returned of his own free will just a few hours ago. Kushina gave a deep sigh of relief in knowing that her son was awake. She hadn't known he had been comatose up until now, but knowing that he had recovered enough to get up and walk around was a huge weight off her shoulders. She had been coming to the hospital every day that she had been in the village since their team arrived back at the village gates. Her daughters had been released half a week ago, but nobody would mention what her son's condition was to her. And the bad news? Minato on the other hand had no outward reaction to Tsunade. He had let his emotion take more of a hold on him recently, but he was Yondaime Hokage for a reason. He knew that things were far more serious than Tsunade was letting on. The bad news far outweighs the good, I'm afraid. Tsunade stopped for a moment to open up Naruto's medical file, which had been updated from the tests they had conducted once he returned back to the hospital. As I said earlier, by all means he should be dead. Life-threatening injuries marred nearly every inch of his body. Even with his innate regenerative abilities he should have died, but I suppose I'll stick with the most prominent ones for now. Like you, Minato, his arm was severed, though what really worried me was that he had the majority of the left side of his face ripped off, causing him to sustain severe brain damage. Tsunade trailed off at this point, expecting some kind of outburst. However, when none came she looked up at Minato and Kushina to see them shocked speechless with their mouths agape and pale as ghosts. Tsunade thought it best to continue her assessment before they started causing a commotion. Though I'm not too sure if that last one still applies, seeing as how he is capable of high-level though processes and motor function. What I'm trying to say is that Naruto will never be the same person again. He may be more receptive of your presence, or he may try to kill you. I think it would be best to leave him to himself for the time being. Whatever happened to him out there in the field, it affected him in more ways than one. Though it wasn't a complete lie, Tsunade really disliked having to do this to Minato and Kushina. As of now there were too many unknowns to start carelessly handing out information, even if it was to a former Kage and his wife. Even though Naruto lost his chakra, he was still able to produce his flames. Obito had speculated that it could be an innate form of senjutsu, and now that there was no chakra mixed in with it, it could only be sensed by sages themselves. Not to mention the fact that he was capable of some unknown power. If any of that got out, the council would no doubt want that kind of power, perhaps even going so far as to sanction human experimentation. It's not as if some of the counselors were above going behind the backs of the village to get what they wanted either. Danzo had done so before his disappearance. This wasn't by her choice either, it was a direct order from the Godame Hokage. No one outside of her and Obito knew about Naruto's current condition, and they wouldn't. At least not while he's in the weakened state that he is now. That's why she decided to use brain damage as an excuse for not being allowed any visitors. The tests they had ran on Naruto proved that his brain had already been restored to its full capacity and had regenerated the needed brain matter, but he had agreed to let them use such an excuse while he recovered to an acceptable condition. Is Naruto okay now at least? Kushina managed to stutter out as a single tear rolled down her face. Tsunade sighed. His injuries haven't fully healed and he expended a lot of his energy earlier when he blew a hole through his room, but he should be fine, given time to rest. Minato brought his hand to forehead and massaged his temples. The high levels of stress he was feeling was enough to let his age show. What of his arm? You've said his brain has recovered, or something of the sort, but what of his arm? Will you be able to make him a prosthetic limb like you had been doing for me? That's the thing, I was only able to cultivate enough of my grandfather's cells to create a single limb. Tsunade informed the two seriously. She really needed a drink after everything that had been going on recently. Using my grandfather's cells, I'd be able to construct a fully maneuverable prosthetic arm that would allow you to return to the line of duty. I've told you all this before, but from the records we've found in Danzo abandoned root base, Danzo had been commissioning Orochimaru for human experimentation to replicate the Mokuton Kekkai Genkai, of which Yamato was the sole survivor. Tsunade had personally been to the laboratory where Orochimaru had conducted this particular experiment. It made her sick just remembering what kind of things took place there. Orochimaru was nothing short of a monster hiding in human skin. Danzo's disappearance may have been one of the best things that could have happened to Konoha, seeing as how if he commissioned Orochimaru for these kind of experiments, then she couldn't imagine what kind of things his disbanded root faction had to experience. That's not all they did. Danzo harvested my grandfather's DNA and gave it to Orochimaru for further experiments in the future, most likely as an advance payment for the enhanced soldiers he would receive in return. The cells that I'm using to construct this prosthetic limb are the last that we have within Konoha's walls. In other words, it's up to you, Minato, whether you want to return to the line of duty and continue to protect the village, or if you want to use it to help your own son. The will of fire still burns. Separate departures. The past week had been long and hard, but those who had been involved in the Banero incident had started taking their first steps forward. It was as though time had stopped for a short while and the world was just starting to move once again. The crackling of flames could be clearly heard as the clearing floor was covered in a vast sea of flames, where a lone individual stood facing the cliffside. Naruto stared at his newly attached prosthetic right arm in disdain, the small craters on the cliffside from the punches he threw not drawing his attention in the slightest. His rehabilitation process had been proceeding at astounding rates, but no matter how natural it felt, his prosthetic arm simply couldn't produce the raw physical strength that he had become so accustomed to. Normally he would have never accepted this arm. Whether it was because of pity or a step towards bridging the gap between father and son for Minato, Naruto didn't care to consider. His pride had demanded that he take the arm and burn it to ashes the minute that Tsunade and Minato had entered his hospital room and gave him the choice of whether to remain crippled or not, but now was not a time for pride or stubbornness. He had been thoroughly defeated and destroyed when he was in top condition. Anything less than 100% would mean utter defeat the next time as well. Taking a deep breath, Naruto steadied himself and slammed his right fist into the cliffside once more. If normal rehabilitation wasn't enough to get this arm up to par with the rest of his body, then he would simply beat it into submission. What was strange was that it seemed to be working as well. Damn, still isn't enough. Naruto muttered to himself as he glanced at the spiderweb-like cracks that had spread from the epicenter of the impact. Strangely enough, the loss of chakra hadn't hindered his movements in the slightest. Every cell of a person's body was intertwined with their chakra network, even civilians who hadn't even unlocked their chakra. Because of this, strength, stamina, speed, reflexes, and most other physical abilities are deeply connected with a person's chakra. For instance, if a shinobi is low on chakra, then their basic physical abilities will drop as well, and vice versa. However, Naruto felt lighter, faster, and stronger than ever before. His body felt like it was overflowing with energy. There were even instances where it felt as though he was subconsciously drawing in energy in from the surrounding world as well. It was different than simply gathering natural energy for the use of senjutsu as well. To enter any kind of sage mode, a person needs to remain completely motionless and mix the natural energy in with their chakra. Too much natural energy and there will be dire consequences, too little and the desired effect would not be achieved. It was hard to describe this particular sensation. The best word to describe what he felt was awakened. He dismissed those thoughts for now. Whether he had chakra or not, it made no difference. While he had been capable of performing numerous different jutsu, he only ever used a handful of them in actual combat situations. Relying on his Logia abilities was his preferred fighting style, though he had come to realize that he couldn't remain as he was now. His face twisting into scowl, Naruto let his white-colored haki erupt from his right arm before slamming the side of his fist into the mountain. He didn't even flinch as half of the cliffside was completely shattered and the remnants of the rubble rained down from above, the shards of splintered rock passing through his intangible form. Looks like I can't control that just yet. My inner turmoil is still causing my haki to go haywire. How troublesome. Uchiha household. The composed sounds of two people eating and making small talk outside on the veranda permeated throughout the courtyard. Naruto and Satsuki sat on the veranda of the home they had lived in together for as long as they cared to remember, a plate of onigiri set in between them accompanied by a pitcher of iced tea. A comfortable silence settled in as the two continued to sip on their tea, content with simply being in each other's presence. And one could expect, the last few days had left the two feeling hollow. The majority of the tears had been shed on the day that Naruto had woken up, but the tears were the easy part. It was easy to sit there cry about the misfortune that had been dealt, but what was truly difficult was trying to move forward beyond that point. The emptiness that filled their hearts wouldn't just go away after a few days had passed, it was there to remind them to never let something like this happen again. Finally, Satsuki decided to break the silence after taking a small bite from the onigiri she held in her hands. I was thinking that it was time to move out of this house. Naruto looked over to his withdrawn little sister before shifting his gaze back to the vast courtyard that they were facing. You want to move away from here? You've lived in this house ever since you were born, doesn't that make it hold some kind of significant value to you? A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips as she recalled all the good times she had spent here. If someone were to tell her that she would be making this very decision a few months ago, she wouldn't have even considered it. Things were certainly changing. Yeah, there are so many good memories here that I can't stand it. I want to just walk back inside and continue living my everyday life with you and Kaa-chan, but I know that's impossible. If I stay here, I know I'll wake up every morning thinking that all this is a dream, that if I walk into the kitchen, I'll see Kaa-chan there making breakfast for the three of us. If I keep living the way that I am now, I feel like I'll never be able to move forward. Naruto shut his lone eye as the memories of Mikoto's death were as clear as ever. Was that why you were going through all of Mikoto's belongings yesterday? To see if there was anything that she had left behind? Naruto was the only one of the 4 members who had returned from the Banero incident that required any kind of rehabilitation. This was mainly due to his prosthetic arm, but the new muscles and tissue that had grown from his body's regeneration needed to be worked in as well. Light scarring covered the majority of his chest and legs, but they were so faint that they were barely noticeable. The only bandages that he was still forced to wear were the ones covering the left side of his face. He was released from the hospital after his rehabilitation session yesterday, and had been deemed fit to be discharged. When he returned to the Uchiha compound, Satsuki had been in the middle of looking through all of Mikoto's belongings. He had simply dismissed it at the time as Satsuki's own way of grieving that she needed to do on her own. Apparently there was a little more to the story. Yesterday morning, when I was walking out the door to visit you at the hospital, I yelled out that I would be back in the afternoon and to not prepare me any lunch because I had already made a bento. When I realized that no one would respond, all I could do was slide down against the back of the door and cry. This house was where the 3 of us lived together as a family for so many years. It just doesn't feel like home without her here anymore. Naruto was silent for a minute as he thought of how Satsuki must have been feeling, how hard it must have been for her to see this as the only possible outcome. He had never really had a place where he belonged before with how he was raised. It was funny that this had turned into his safe haven of sorts. Last night he couldn't sleep at all. The comforting warm home just wasn't there anymore. All it was now was a house that provided shelter for the night. Perhaps Satsuki was right. He remembered how he felt during the time he lived at the Uzumaki Namikaze compound. The mansion had felt more like a prison than a home. The only freedom he ever got was when he left for training with Shisui or when he had a day off from training and spent the day with Satsuki's family or Hana. Loneliness had been the primary emotion that had always made up his being when he lived in that prison. He wouldn't let Satsuki live through the same experience. You won't be able to move forward with the past holding you back. Naruto frowned as he set down his cup of tea and rose to his feet, grabbing Satsuki's hand and leading her to her feet as well. I may sound like a hypocrite since I still hold negative feelings for my family for what they've done to me, but that's not what I'm talking about. The past is what makes us who we are. Don't let it hold you back, but don't forget those memories that you hold dear either. Satsuki looked up at her brother figure, concern in her eyes, as he intertwined their fingers and gripped her hand tightly. Her other hand fingered the complex sealing scroll that Obito had designed to hold more than its small size should. Inside of that small scroll were all of her mother's and her own possessions. She squeezed Naruto's hand right back, giving him her consent. As self-proclaimed siblings, and enough history behind their relationship to considered blood-related ones, they could usually tell what the other was thinking about with a single glance. With a small nod, Naruto set his hand ablaze with a small flame before bringing it down onto the veranda. There was a deep burst of crimson as the wood ignited and spread to cover the entire wooden surface before reaching the main house. Satsuki felt the tears falling from her eyes as she watched the house that she had lived in all her life swallowed by flames. Time seemed to slow down as she stood there, watching as the structure collapsed as its framework was eaten away by the fire. Her natural reaction was to move away from the house as the fire began to spread to the courtyard, but she was stopped by an arm wrapping reassuringly around her waist, pulling her in close to the owner. Naruto held Satsuki tightly as the crimson fire that engulfed the house reflected in his lone eye. He recalled the first time he had ever come to this house all those years ago with Shisui. Back then he would have never expected that he would find something akin to a family or a place where he could really belong. Things really had changed since then. The two siblings in all but blood stood there in silence as their skin was bathed with the crimson-orange light given off by the fire. With a single swift motion of his arm, Naruto extinguished the fire as its objective had been completed. The flames dissipated, revealing that nothing remained of the place they once called home except for the thick layer of ash that coated the ground. Neither of them moved for the longest time, but that standstill was broken when Satsuki buried her face into Naruto's chest, letting her tears soak into his shirt. Please, promise me that you'll never die, Naruto and I, even if it's an empty promise, please do it for me. I don't need to live 1,000 years. If I just live through today, that'll be enough, but I can't just go leaving a hopeless little sister like you behind. I won't die, Satsuki, that much I can promise you. Naruto quietly spoke as he gently ran his hand through her long raven hair. Satsuki buried her head into his chest even further while clenching his shirt. It broke her heart to see her home burn down right in front of her, but she knew that if it still stood then she would keep returning to it and continue on with her daily life as if nothing was wrong, as if nothing had ever happened. She refused to run away from or pretend that the hole in her heart wasn't there. If nothing changed then she was likely to continue to cling to the past, never moving forward. To stand still is to remain stagnant. She still had a few people left in this world, this time she would keep her promise. We should get going, Naruto whispered as he wiped away the tears from her eyes with his thumb. I know that if I stay here any longer, I won't want to leave, besides, there's a place that it's time you visited. Naka Shrine. Why are we here, Naruto and I? You don't really seem like the type to pray. Satsuki asked as they reached the entrance to the Naka Shrine. On New Year's Day, she would come here with Mikoto and Naruto and pray for good fortune for the year. It was something of a tradition that all Uchiha followed, though since the Uchiha massacre the three of them were the only ones to carry on the tradition. Even back then Naruto had always been skeptical about praying to a deity. He was the type to not care about supernatural or superstition and instead rely on what he could do with his own two hands. Though he did end up coming along with them every year since it was tradition. She couldn't understand why Naruto would want to visit here now of all times. I suppose not every Uchiha would know the value of this shrine, especially the newer generation. Naruto ignored Satsuki's questioning gaze and led the two of them into the main hall, which was not an unfamiliar sight seeing as how the two of them had come here every year with Mikoto. It would make sense for the Uchiha not to tell their children about this place until they had awakened their Sharingan. Without the Uchiha Kekkai Genkai, the Naka Shrine was nothing more than a regular shrine with a safe house underneath. Letting children know of the place that they were meeting when they were in the process of planning the coup d'état would have put their entire plan in jeopardy. As for why Mikoto had made him promise not to tell Satsuki about this place, he didn't know. What did surprise Satsuki though was when Naruto led her over to the 7th tatami from the far right and removed the mat, revealing a large stone slab with what looked to be a complicated sealing formula inscribed around a Sharingan design. Mi, Uma, Tora, I, Inu, Tatsu, Tori, Tora. Perform these hand seals to release the Fuinjutsu on the stone. No matter how much brute force is used, this particular sequence of hand seals is the only way to pass. That is why it is simply known as the Naka Shrine Pass technique. Naruto stated matter-of-factly, remembering the first time he entered the real Naka Shrine. Normally he would have done the seal sequence himself, but the loss of his chakra prevented him from doing so. He was certain that he would be able to perform trivial tasks such as this once he learned to harness and control his new form of natural energy, but as of now he was only able to call upon his chakra fruit abilities and his Sharingan. Satsuki, still not exactly sure what was going on, simply went through the mentioned hand seals, causing the slab of stone that sealed off the entranceway to levitate high into the air so that one could descend down the hidden passageway. Naruto wasted no time in making descent, motioning for Satsuki to follow him. What is this? Where exactly are we going? Satsuki asked, slightly panicked as the stone that had allowed them entrance closed behind them. The only source of light in the dark stairwell were the old torches that ignited as soon as someone passed by them. Satsuki received her answer when the narrow torchlit stairway opened up into a large room with the Uchiha crest depicted on each of the walls and a large stone monument near the front of the room. It was strange, the monument felt like it was calling out to her. What was even stranger was that her Sharingan had immediately flared to life upon setting eyes on the odd tablet. It felt as though the tablet was trying to call upon something deeper within her eyes, so much so that they felt like they were burning. This is the secret meeting place of the Uchiha clan. Upon setting eyes on the tablet your Sharingan reacted, did it not? This is because this tablet dates back to when the Uchiha clan was first formed, and is closely intertwined with the history of the Uchiha. This tablet holds all of the secrets of the Uchiha, including the darkest secrets of the Sharingan. Naruto turned to Satsuki with his eye closed. Naruto knew the effect that the tablet had on those who wielded dojutsu that are interlinked with the Uchiha clan. His eye was still unstable, his body was still assimilating the power that it held and embedding it into his genes, he presumed, so forcing it to activate may have severe consequences. Using it during the Banero incident must have drained most of its power, forcing it to subside as it integrated itself after its awakening. With this in mind he had shut his eye closed while in the stairwell as a countermeasure for the tablet's effects. What secrets are supposed to be here? All I see is a whole lot of basic information about the Sharingan, though there are some things that I hadn't known, but the rest of it is just a bunch of gibberish. I don't see any of these dark secrets that you're talking about. Satsuki voiced her confusion after a few silent minutes of simply reading the tablet. Naruto could only smirk. His thoughts upon trying to read the tablet for the first time all those years ago were along those same thoughts. That feeling within your eyes, that pull you feel from within them, release it, bring it out to the surface. You've already read of the Mangekyo Sharingan on the tablet, you awakened it on that day. What are you talking about? What day? All I know is that my eyes feel like they're burning. That's because that is the nature of your Mangekyo Sharingan. It's screaming out for you to call it out. I can hear it. The day of the Banero incident, after seeing Mikoto run through by that sword, you surrounded the battlefield in a sea of black fire. That is your Mangekyo Sharingan's unique ability. Remember how it felt that day. Remember why you had awakened it. Naruto hated the idea of making Satsuki recall that day, knowing full well how painful it was to remember, but there was no other way if she couldn't remember awakening it herself. The images of that particular day flashed in her mind as she clutched her head in pain. She remembered. She remembered the pain of knowing that her mother would die then and there. She remembered wanting to protect her brother as he held their mother during her last moments. She remembered screaming in frustration at being too exhausted to move her own body. She remembered drowning the entire area in black flames in one final effort to protect the two people she treasured most in the world. Satsuki removed her hand from her head, revealing that the tomo of her Sharingan had spread and converged along the edge of the iris, taking on the appearance of intersecting ellipses. So this was the Mangekyo Sharingan, was it? She felt so much power flowing through her body, almost like she was on a completely different level when compared to before. Don't get too overconfident just yet, Imuro-chan. Naruto laughed mockingly, easily recognizing the look in her eyes. This whole scene was like reliving the memory of his first time visiting the Naka Shrine. Why don't you take a look at the tablet now and see how much more you can decipher? Satsuki growled at his new nickname for her before shifting her gaze back to the tablet. She skipped over the parts that she had previously read and found the section she was looking for. Her eyes briefly widened at the amount of information that was now available to her now that she had reached a heightened level of visual prowess. Uchiha Tablet. A Mangekyo Sharingan is distinguished from a normal Sharingan by its appearance, which changes the form of the Tomo seal. The exact design differs from user to user, though all resemble a pinwheel-type design. It is initially awakened by the trauma suffered from witnessing the death of someone close to the user, or another type of severe emotional trauma. Uchiha have historically misunderstood this criteria as the user needing to be responsible for the person's death, and for that reason they developed the practice of killing their closest friends in order to gain the Mangekyo Sharingan. The Mangekyo Sharingan retains all of the Sharingan's generic abilities, such as casting genjutsu and the ability to distinguish chakra. In addition to these, the Mangekyo grants powerful abilities that differ from user to user, though abilities may be similar in nature. Those of the same familial line may inherit abilities of the same nature, though the extent to which they can use them differ. Each eye of the set of Mangekyo Sharingan holds one unique ability. The abilities of a Mangekyo Sharingan may not even be the same for both of a single user's eyes. The Mangekyo Sharingan's abilities drain a considerable amount of chakra when performed. Its usage and activity also place a great strain on the user themselves and over time deteriorates their vision until they lose their light. Their vision can be restored by receiving the transplanted Mangekyo of an Uchiha with strong blood ties, ideally a sibling, thus attaining the eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, which ensures that the user will never again lose their light. Their Mangekyo-based abilities are made stronger and they no longer suffer any negative side effects from the usage. According to Otsutsuki Indra, the first wielder of the Sharingan and the origin of the Uchiha, the Mangekyo Sharingan is proof that an individual continues to seek something despite experiencing great losses. The Mangekyo Sharingan is even powerful enough to control the Biju, though this control is not absolute and may only last for a set period of time. Only one ability of the Mangekyo Sharingan is capable of controlling a Biju for prolonged periods of time. The balance of the world is entrusted to those 9 Biju. Should they ever fall to the corruption of humanity, then it shall be up to those who are able to control them to restore the world to its former glory. As with any dojutsu, Mangekyo Sharingan can be transplanted into non-Uchiha, granting them all its abilities albeit with steeper chakra demands. Though in the case of transplanting eyes for the eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, abilities are not transferred. Abilities of a Mangekyo Sharingan can also be programmed to activate under certain circumstances, either within the user's own eyes or in a target of the user's choosing. This programming remains even after death. Satsuki drew her eyes away from the tablet after she read of the single ability that was currently available to her. The rest of the script turned illegible immediately after the explanation of her left eye's ability. She was still trying to wrap around all of the information that had just been burned into her memory. Ugh. To think that such knowledge has been here all this time, why didn't those who were able to decipher it let the other clan members know? Naruto, who was leaning against one of the side walls with his arms crossed, rose his head though his eyes remained closed. Think about it. Though they come at a cost, these eyes hold incredible power. If someone who had already awakened the Mangekyo Sharingan and deciphered the tablet went and told the rest of their clansmen about it, then Uchiha would have been killing each other left and right. Families would have been torn apart, friends would have hunted each other down, and their own thirst for power would have led to their own extermination. This is why the Mangekyo Sharingan is known as one of the Uchiha clan's darkest secrets. No matter what you do not tell anyone of those eyes, especially this generation of Uchiha. It's time for the curse of hatred to finally die out. Satsuki reached up to her head and ran her hand over her face, letting her Mangekyo fade back into its normal 3-tomo state. She only had them active for 10 minutes or so, but she could already feel the strain that they put on her body. It seemed that this version of the Sharingan wasn't something that she could use carelessly. The curse of hatred? Hopefully something you'll never have to experience as long as I'm right there by your side, though if you were to fall to it you would have done so by now. Naruto responded in kind. I think I'll just leave it at that then. I hate to sound selfish, but I need you perform another set of hand seals for me. The sequence is a bit longer this time. Naruto asked, pushing himself off from the wall and walking towards the center of the room where Satsuki was standing. You know that you don't even have to ask. Naruto smirked seeing that Satsuki had done a complete 180 upon getting her mind off of everything that had happened recently. Tatsu, Tora, Inu, Uma, Hitsuji, Inu, you, me, Tatsu, Saru, Ushi, Na, Tora, Tatsu, Uma, Hitsuji. Without a second thought, Satsuki performed the requested hand seals. Similar as to how they gained access to this room, the tablet levitated into the air allowing entrance to a rather long stairwell. As Naruto took his first steps to descend down into the darkness, the row of torches that lined the wall ignited. "There's another secret room beneath all this?" Satsuki questioned as she followed Naruto into the stairwell. "Yes, though no one knows of its existence other than me." The remainder of the descent was spent in a comfortable silence. Though it wasn't that neither had anything to say, but that they were preoccupied with what was going on within their own minds. Satsuki was still trying to process all of the information she read on the tablet. Meanwhile, Naruto was concentrating on what he was coming down here to retrieve and how to proceed afterwards. Finally, the torchlit stairwell opened up into a large entranceway. The sight of the two concrete doors protected by a high-level barrier was a familiar sight to Naruto. Naruto walked over to the complicated ceiling array on the side wall and pushed his haki into it. He figured that since he inherited the will of the one who constructed this place, then using haki should be able to allow him entrance easier than rewriting the ceiling formula. As he had thought, the heavy doors slowly started to open as the barrier dropped, revealing a large cave-like room. "You coming, or do you plan to just stand there all day?" Naruto asked rhetorically, as he had already moved a dozen or so feet into the cave, while Satsuki had yet to move a single muscle. Satsuki, who had been standing there in shock at seeing something easily equal in size to the arena where the Chunin exams were held, quickly shook herself out of her stupor and raced after Naruto as he had already turned around and started walking towards a doorway on the left-hand side of the cave. "Why'd you need to come down here anyways?" Satsuki asked as they entered what looked to be an infirmary of sorts. Satsuki's question was answered when Naruto stopped at a particular shelf and found what he had come to retrieve. In Naruto's hand was a medical container filled with a clear fluid that was meant to preserve the lone Sharingan eye that was floating within it. Naruto smirked as he held the medical jar in his left hand. It had taken his years of continuous work with his limited skill in medical ninjutsu, but this was the fruit of his labor. After countless sessions of reconnecting nerves, repairing that vitreous humor, mending the cornea, and reconnecting the iris, but he had finally managed to bring the eye back into working condition. "To retrieve the eye that completes my set of Sharingan, I can't be walking around with an empty eye socket, you know." Ichiraku Ramen. The frantic and unrefined sounds of slurping could be heard even from the street. Such undignified sounds had drawn the curiosity of many of the civilians trekking through the streets. Tough continued on their merry way once they found the source. Natsuki and Narumi could be found within the confines of the Ichiraku Ramen stand, shoveling down bowls of the delicacy, in their opinion anyways, down their throat in a single gulp, the emptied bowls piled high next to each one of them, suggesting that each of the Uzumaki Namikaze girls had downed at least 10 portions and showed no signs of stopping in the near future. This had been the first time that either of the girls had been able to get their hands on their favorite food in weeks. The way they were eating, though, it seemed like they were trying to consume 2 weeks' worth of ramen in a single sitting. Their parents had been quite adamant about their recovery, even going so far as to keep them on a strict diet in order to get them back to top condition as quickly as possible. It had worked too, seeing as how they had just been cleared by the hospital. As one would have expected, as soon as they were determined that the electricity had been broken down by their bodies and was no longer a concern, they raced to Ichiraku's, leaving nothing but a trail of dust in their wake. Both girls slammed their 11th bowl back onto the counter after slurping up the broth, taking a deep breath to reintroduce oxygen to their lungs. The 2 girls were the only customers at the stand. The other villagers knew better than to eat at the stand at the same time as those from the Uzumaki Namikaze family. Ayame quickly moved over to the counter opposite where the girls were sitting and began clearing away the empty dishes. It was always a workout keeping up with the orders of their best customers. The 2 of them were just like their mother. "Natsuki-chan, Narumi-chan. You might want to slow down so you can actually taste the food. We might just run out of ramen if the 2 of you keep this up." Ayame teased with a good-natured smile, cleaning up the last of the empty bowls. "But the ramen here's the best." Narumi sitting herself back up normally from the hunched-over position that she sat in to devour her ramen. "And we haven't had any in so long. Besides, we'll burn all of it off during training anyways." "Speaking of training, Narumi, what do you think about the training trip we're going on?" Natsuki asked with a slight frown as another bowl of miso ramen was set in front of her, as well as her sister. Narumi almost didn't hear her sister's question as she was already slurping up the steaming hot noodles. She glanced over at her dining companion, swallowing the mouthful of noodles before a questioning look spread across her face. "What do you mean?" "I think it's a great opportunity for us to get stronger, especially after seeing how much we need to improve from that last mission, but I don't really understand why we have to leave the village to do it." Natsuki gave a nod of understanding to her sister before turning back to her own bowl. "Yeah, I know. I want to get stronger too. It still pisses me off how easily I was defeated. We never even learned who that guy was, But why now of all times do they want us to go on a training trip? And why does it have to be with Erosenin? I dunno. Tusen said we'd find out when everyone's there at that meeting in a few days, so we'll just have to wait till then. Narumi answered while she continued to shovel ramen into her mouth. Ever since Minato had decided to give the prosthetic arm that was being constructed for him to Naruto, he'd limited himself to council work and working closely with Obito in the Hokage office. As the Yondaime Hokage, Minato retained a seat on the Shinobi Council, which granted him with a position that held even more authority than a clan head within shinobi affairs in the village. With the permanent loss of his right arm, he would never be able to match his past strength, as his strongest maneuvers relied heavily on the combined usage of the Hiraishin and the Rasengan. As such, he decided to retire from the front lines and leave the safety of the village in the hands of the next generation. I think it'd be nice to get away from everything for a while though. Too much has happened recently to stay focused on missions and just keep going on with our everyday lives. The invasion, that mission to the border, Nawaki's defection, it's just getting to be too much. Natsuki sighed as she slurped down the rest of the broth from her bowl. You mean like a vacation? I thought you wanted to start some serious training. Now that I think about it, we really haven't gotten any stronger since the Chunin exams. It had been roughly around 2 months since the end of the Chunin exams. Sure, they had made it to the final tournament and were quite a ways ahead of their graduating class, but that didn't really prove anything when their utter defeat was still fresh in their minds. I do, but knowing Erosenin, he'll just fool around the whole time. Natsuki sighed, remembering all the times that Jiraiya had been supposed to train them and had ran off to peek on woman at the hot springs instead. She was slightly disappointed that her mother wouldn't be the one teaching her, since she still had so much she wanted to learn about her Uzumaki blood. Then again, maybe Jiraiya would get his act together this time and take their training seriously. Only time will tell, I guess. Forest of Death, 2 days later. Naruto let the silver aura around him fade to admire his handiwork. The Mangekyo Sharingan within each of his eyes were filled with disdain as he glanced over the bifurcated forms of monstrous spiders and other insects that often frequented the area. It still wasn't up to snuff yet, though he supposed it was a good enough improvement from yesterday. He let his Mangekyo fade back into its regular 3-tomo seal before covering his right eye with an eye patch. He didn't need questions being asked such as how he obtained it or who the eye originally belonged to, at least for the time being. As such, he had decided to cover his newly implanted Sharingan with his old eye patch that he kept in the cave. Shirsue's remaining Sharingan had accepted him easily enough. Perhaps it was because he was already in possession of the other half of the set, or maybe since he was more experienced with a Sharingan now than he had been back when he had obtained the one in his right eye. He remembered just how difficult it had been to make use of the Sharingan's abilities years ago, though now he could do so as if it were second nature to him. Though his newly achieved Mangekyo was a different story entirely. He wasn't kidding when he told Satsuki to tell no one of her new eyes. Even a normal Sharingan would be dangerous in the hands of an enemy, especially if they were aware of the Izanagi or Izanami, the 2 forbidden jutsu of the Uchiha. As such, the only medical nin that he could trust to implant Shirsue's eye was Hana. Dojutsu transplants are usually very delicate procedures, but the complications usually occur when removing the eye that currently occupied the eye socket. Since Naruto's procedure only involved implanting the eye and mending the optical nerves, the procedure was much simpler. The left side of his face was still terribly scarred, but he could live with it. It would eventually heal over time, especially with his newfound cellular regrowth abilities. Though what really mattered was that his skull and nerves had been reconstructed through his advanced regeneration. He wasn't sure if he would be able to integrate Phoenix Chakra into his body anymore, seeing as how he no longer had a chakra network, and as he was currently unable to summon due to his lack of chakra. Naruto gritted his teeth in frustration at such a devastating blow to his being. In theory, he should be able to harness his natural energy to perform a majority of his former abilities, but the true form of natural energy was still a large unknown. As of now, he could only access his flames and Sharingan abilities. His chakra fruit abilities were a given, seeing as how it gifted the eater with the innate use of a specific nature of natural energy, but then there was the Sharingan. Perhaps he was able to retain its use because of its relation to the Rinne Sharingan, which was attained by Kaguya when she first ate the original chakra fruit. For now he was able to use his abilities upon instinct alone, but he knew that couldn't last forever. Naruto didn't even turn around as another person suddenly appeared in the impromptu clearing that he had formed. He didn't need to, he had sensed her presence long ago with his Kenbunchaku Haki. This newly awakened form of Haki was more perceptive than even the most experienced of sensors. Her oncoming presence was why he had originally decided to end his training for the day. She was clearly here for a reason. Nico? At least that was what Naruto thought her porcelain mask was meant to resemble. Rarely any of those ANBU masks looked like the codenames they were given, at least in his opinion. "What can I do for you?" The ANBU, codename Nico, gave a small dip of her head in acknowledgement and respect, causing her long purple hair to sway with the flow of her motions. Though he may have forsaken his surname, Naruto was still the son of the Yondaime Hokage, and as an ANBU operative it was required of her to show the proper amount of respect. "Chunin Portgas, your presence is now required at the Hokage's office." "I thought I still had some time left before I was cleared for duty again," Naruto replied calmly, though he couldn't help but wonder why he was being requested. He could understand if it was Minato. The man didn't know how to stay out of his business, though he was thankful for the arm. It changed nothing between them. Obito was different, he wouldn't overstep his boundaries due to personal feelings. "I am afraid that I do not know the details, but Hokage-sama did express that this meeting is of the utmost importance. He said it was related to your last mission, if that helps in any way." Naruto sighed in relief as he was informed of the topic of the meeting. As much as it hurt his pride to admit, in his current state he'd be crushed if he came across another S-rank shinobi. Silently, he took his eyes from the female ANBU before him and guided them toward the dense foliage of the treetops. "Take me away then, Nico. I'm a little tired from training, mind giving me a hand?" Naruto lied, not able to shunshin due to his lack of chakra. He reached out his hand, which Nico grabbed before the two of them vanished in a standard shunshin. Hokage office. A minute or so later both shinobi appeared in the center of the familiar office, though only Naruto remained in place as Nico quickly retook her position in the shadows amongst the rest of her squad within the office. Naruto groaned as he regained his bearings. It was never enjoyable traveling with someone who was not an expert in the shunshin. Naruto took a quick glance over the office and was greeted by a whole host of familiar faces. As expected, Obito was sitting behind his desk dressed in his Kage robes and hat. Minato could be found standing behind and off to the side of Obito, a serious look spread across his face, while Kushina stood next to him on the opposite side of Obito. Jiraiya had taken a seat on the windowsill as per usual. Natsuki and Narumi had occupied the seats that were directly in front of Obito's desk, and even Satsuki was in the room. Before Naruto could even take a single step forward, he was enveloped in a bone-crushing embrace by both Natsuki and Narumi. Naruto resisted his natural instinct to throw them off or ignite his body. They had not seen him in over 2 weeks and had probably not even been informed of what kind of condition he had been in when he was first admitted to the hospital. Just this once he would let them do what they pleased. This meeting would go quicker if he didn't make a scene anyways. Kami knows that Minato, Kushina, and Jiraiya would try to drag things on if he did. "Is there a reason why all of us were called here?" Naruto asked after calmly removing himself from the two girls' grasp. There were clearly two sides to this meeting. Satsuki, Narumi, Natsuki, and himself were on one side while Obito, Jiraiya, Minato, and Kushina were on the opposite side. These two sides only had one major difference: one knew what was really going on while the other did not. "Yes, but before we get into that, could you please brief all those in the room of the second half of your latest mission? Out of all those here, you and I are the only ones who are aware of the specifics and you are more familiar with them than I. The reason for all of you being here ties into this briefing." Obito was the one to answer Naruto's question as he moved the 4 files that were stacked on the far side of his desk and spread them out in front of himself to refer to at a later time. "Very well." Naruto sighed. The nightmare that became known as the Banero incident by the few who were there was still fresh in his mind. The original objectives of our mission were to infiltrate Orochimaru's hideout near the border, recover any documents we could find, obtain a sample of the source of the cursed seal, and destroy the base. After we had completed those objectives, we were to investigate the nearby agricultural town, known as Banero Town, and determine if any Suna or Oto shinobi remained within the borders of Hai no Kuni. That secondary objective was simply a precaution though. It was already speculated that there would be no shinobi residing within the town's borders. Naruto took a deep breath before continuing his recount. After completing our primary objectives, we continued on toward the town, but not before sending all of the sealing scrolls that contained what we recovered back to the village via personal summons. Being the censor of the group, I determined those who had the potential to be enemy shinobi via chakra levels, natures, and signatures. We split up into teams. Satsuki and Mikoto covered one section of the town, Natsuki and Narumi covered another section, and I covered that largest one, being the only censor. As expected, there were no foreign shinobi amongst the townspeople, at least, not the ones we were expecting. "You're talking about the man that Natsuki-chan and Narumi-chan fought?" Kushina determined after recalling who it was that exactly put her babies in the hospital. The girls didn't know much since they were rendered unconscious almost as soon as they confronted the man, but it seemed that Naruto could fill in those unanswered questions. Naruto ignored Kushina's interruption in favor of briefing the room on what had actually occurred. As I was making my way back to the designated meeting point, I was ambushed by two shinobi. They claimed to be members of an organization known as the Akatsuki, an organization whose goal is the capture of the Biju. An organization who you've all known about for quite a while. Naruto was doing his best to rein in his anger, but he couldn't hold back the scowl that crossed his face. He wasn't foolish enough to believe that every secret known by the upper echelon should be shared with low-ranking shinobi, but they should have known that Natsuki and Narumi would be targeted sooner or later and that anyone who was with them would be disposed of. He couldn't bring himself to blame Obito or Kushina because their knowledge of the subject would have most likely been limited until recently, but Minato and Jiraiya knew full well the consequences. Natsuki and Narumi's eyes widened as they heard what Naruto had just said. Their father had wanted to bring up their training trip, but he had never given a reason why now of all times they were being given this opportunity. They would have spoken up at this point, but they were shocked speechless. Enel, Nuke-nin of Kumogakure and Zetsu, affiliation unknown. These were the two that were there that day. Naruto continued speaking, not in the mood to antagonize anyone at the moment. I engaged Zetsu while Enel went off to deal with everyone else. Had his body been that of a normal human, I would have killed him several times over. Unfortunately, it wasn't, and he was even capable of nullifying chakra with a single touch. Towards the end of our battle, Mikoto shunshined into the area with a near-unconscious Satsuki. Enel appeared only moments with Natsuki and Narumi's unconscious bodies in his hands. After recovering their unconscious bodies and getting them to safety, I had no other choice than to engage both Akatsuki members at the same time. I was the only one in any shape to do so. Naruto paused in his recount of the events from there on, knowing full well what happened from there. I fought the two of them off for a while, but was quickly overwhelmed. Just as Zetsu was about to deliver the final blow, Mikoto, she came out of nowhere, she protected me, and died in my arms because of that. The next thing I knew, everything went white. I don't even remember how we managed to end up back in Konoha. The room was silent for a minute or so. Most were trying to process all of the information they had just been told. Others, namely Satsuki, were still grieving over Mikoto's death, though she had improved by leaps and bounds since when he had first visited her in the hospital. Clearing his throat, the Godame Hokage was the first to speak up as he glanced over the four shinobi of the newer generation. It seems that a while ago, Jiraiya's spy network discovered the organization known as the Akatsuki. Not much is known about them, but we do know that their current objective is to hunt down Jinchuriki for their respective Biju. Knowing more about the organization than anyone else, as it was his spy network to discover it, Jiraiya continued where Obito left off. The Akatsuki consists entirely of S-rank Nuke-nin or criminals of the same stature. Right now we only know who a few of their members are. Deidara, a Bakutun user formerly of Iwagakure. Uchiha Itachi, who I believe you are all familiar with. And now the two shinobi that Naruto has just mentioned. The most recent information from my spies claim that due to the death of the Ichibi, they can't truly begin hunting the Biju for 3 years until it reforms, as the need to collect them in order from least tales to the most. The reason for their sudden appearance is that they wanted to assess the current Jinchuriki before they began moving for real. So, when they start coming for us, we'll be the last? Natsuki asked, trying to wrap her head around the idea that an entire organization of shinobi at the same level as that Enel coming after them. We're not sure of anything, but if they need to wait 3 years before they move because of the Ichibi, then it's safe to say that they'll be starting with the Biju that possesses the least amount of tails. Each Biju's strength is relative to the amount of tails it has. The more tails it has, the more power it has at its disposal. This is just speculation, but we think that they need to capture the Biju in this particular order. Minato spoke for the first time in the entire meeting. Does that mean that all of the other Jinchuriki were attacked like we were too? Narumi questioned as she stared at the ground. She had heard what kind of lives most Jinchuriki lived. It was only thanks to the Sandaime Hokage that she was able to live with her parents and her sister. Had things just been a little different, then she may have lived a life of loneliness and despair just as they had. We contacted Kirigakure just a few days ago. Yugura hasn't been targeted as of yet. Minato answered once again. As for the other villages, our relationship with them is strained at best, volatile at worst. Neither Iwagakure or Kumogakure would respond to the messages we sent. They won't target him. Naruto interjected into the conversation, earning a few raised eyebrows. Zetsu said something that bothered me. He said that Natsuki and Narumi were his targets, like he already knew that Nawaki was no longer a Jinchuriki. I think he was there during the invasion. Not to fight but to record everything that had happened. That's why they still had no information on Narumi and Natsuki. They didn't really fight to their fullest potential during the invasion, if at all. That is indeed troubling. Obito muttered under his breath. Satsuki could only look around awkwardly as the conversation unfolded around her. She was a part of the Banero incident, but she really had nothing to do with all this talk regarding Jinchuriki. Though learning that Itachi was a member of this Akatsuki was useful information. But it begged the question, why was she called here? Not that I don't care about all this, nor do I want Natsuki and Narumi to be captured by this Akatsuki. Satsuki interrupted for the first time since she entered the room. But informing us of all this wasn't the only reason for summoning us here, was it, Obito-sensei? Obito shifted his gaze onto his other student as he now felt all eyes on him. Ah, thank you for mentioning that, Satsuki. Now we're finally getting to the main reason of why all of you are here. Out of all those within the village, you four have the most drive to combat the Akatsuki. It goes without saying for Natsuki and Narumi, since you will be two of their primary targets, but I can't see Naruto or Satsuki just leaving the Akatsuki alone with everything that their members have done to them. What are you saying, Obito? Are you trying to encourage my son to start seeking revenge? I thought we agreed that we just wanted them to be able to protect themselves. Kushina yelled, breaking her previous calm composure. She had thought it best to simply remain silent while Jiraiya and Minato briefed those in the room of the Akatsuki, since she had only found out about the organization recently, but she couldn't hold herself back anymore after hearing what Obito was trying to influence her son into doing. She had already lost one to power and hatred, she refused to lose another. I now hold the position of Hokage. That means that if a threat is to come within the village walls, then I am to deal with it, but I can't leave the village myself to combat the Akatsuki. Doing so would put the village at risk if something were to happen while I was away. Jiraiya is the only one capable of operating his spy network, so he can't ever spend too much time within the village if he wants to remain up to date with any information they may have attained for him. Tsunade is the head of the hospital and cannot leave patients unattended, so missions and such are out of the question. Minato-sensei is now weakened in his crippled state and would only be able to keep up with S-rank shinobi for so long. Out of the village's strongest shinobi, only you and Kakashi would be able to fight the Akatsuki head-on if it came to it, and even then how long would you be able to last against other Kage-level shinobi? Obito explained to Kushina. But even so, Kushina tried to argue, but was quickly cut off. Kushina, the Akatsuki is too prominent a threat for you to protect them from alone. If they plan to go up against people like this, they'll need to be prepared. Obito announced, after which he turned his head to look at the small group of Chunin and Genin. That is why that I have decided that each of you will be going on a training trip. With a grin, Jiraiya pushed himself up from the windowsill and stepped towards the middle of the room. It was already predetermined that Natsuki and Narumi would be going with him, but his hopes for the meeting were to make his student son even stronger than he already was. It would be a great benefit to have another powerful shinobi that could be there to protect the girls from the Akatsuki. Though it seemed that he and Satsuki were a package deal. That's why the four of you will be coming along with me. Natsuki, Narumi, Naruto, it's time for you to finally see Uzushiogakure and learn of what your Uzumaki blood can really do. I don't really know of what I can teach you, Satsuki, but I'm sure I'll find something. Satsuki merely gave an uninterested gaze to the man. It was clear that she was only an extra and that the three others were the main purpose for Jiraiya's training. Though it wasn't as if she needed it. She needed to learn more about her Mangekyo Sharingan, though she would make sure not to overuse it. Blindness was something that she couldn't afford at the moment. Then there was the summoning contract that she had picked up earlier in the week. True to Naruto's words, she had managed to find the Hawk contract in the oldest section of the Uchiha clan library. She wanted to visit their realm as soon as possible. She had already been given permission to do so by the boss Summon's eldest son. No. Naruto breathed out the simple one-word answer nearly as soon as Jiraiya finished speaking. There was no need to think about Jiraiya's plan, he had more important issues with his body to deal with. Goofing off with Jiraiya on this little training trip would only serve to hinder him. This is no time for you to be stubborn, Naruto. You should know better than anyone that these people aren't playing around. One person you cared about has already died because of them, how many more will it take for you to open your eyes? Jiraiya yelled, causing a few unsuspecting individuals in the room to flinch. He and Naruto had their share of differences, but he was willing to put them to the side for now in order to train him. Though it seemed that Naruto had no plans to do the same. Jiraiya was more agitated than anything. He was foolish to believe that someone as selfish as this could ever be the child of prophecy. Do you think of me as stupid, Jiraiya? Or are you just so narrow-minded that you believe yourself to be the only one that is capable of training a person to new heights? The mocking tone of Naruto's voice was unmistakable. I have already taken steps in preparation for the training that I need to undertake, but now that something like a training trip has been offered, I think that would be a much more viable alternative. Obito smirked as he knew this was how things would play out. He opened the files regarding Portgas de Naruto and Uchiha Satsuki, pulling out 2 detailed forms with the Hokage's approval stamped at the bottom. Since his Sharingan was constantly active due to the nerve damage he sustained when his face was crushed by that boulder when he was a genin, it was not hard to subtly cast a genjutsu on Naruto to create a mental link of sorts. Are you planning to visit the home of your summons for your training? Obito asked within Naruto's mind. Naruto, not at all surprised by the voice since he could see through the genjutsu being cast, responded in kind. I had planned on doing so for a while now. I think a lot of my body's problems could be solved if I could learn to harness natural energy properly. That, and I know that I could become far stronger if I was left to myself for the time being. I need some time to think about things without any kind of disruption. Obito made no outward motion that he and Naruto were having a mental conversation as he simply appeared to be in deep thought. How will you get there if you can't access your chakra for a reverse summoning? I believe that I'll be able to create that spatial rift that you told me I used to get all of us back to the village. I've been meaning to find out how I was able to do something like that anyways, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. Obito opened his eye back up to look at Naruto, appearing to those in the room to have come to some kind of decision. And what of Satsuki? I don't imagine her going along with Jiraiya and the girls. She found a summoning contract not too long ago and has been practicing on summoning for the past week or so. Actually, her summons seem to have really taken a liking to her and have invited her to their home. I imagine that she'd like to do just that. Obito cut off any further communication and looked around at the occupants of the room before releasing a deep sigh. I thought that you would say something like that, Naruto, which is why I have already prepared a separate set of orders for you and Satsuki. Obito motioned for the 2 to come forward and handed them the documentation that he had removed from their shinobi files. The 2 shinobi formerly of Team 11 looked over the various pages of the documents they received with unmasked curiosity before returning them to the first page and giving a small nod to relay that their orders were acceptable. Obito, you can't seriously be thinking of letting these 2 leave on their own, can you? Jiraiya asked incredulously, a bit insulted that the original plan for the training trip was declined. Though it would be better for him to focus solely on Natsuki and Narumi since they were the ones that were actually being targeted. Perhaps it would be better for him to just train the girls. Adding 1 or 2 more members might be biting off more than he could chew, seeing as how he needed to keep in contact with his spy network and conduct his research. He was supposed to release a new book later this year, but he still hadn't found the right inspiration just yet. Relax, Jiraiya, I already have everything taken care of. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you if they get themselves captured or killed. Are those conditions acceptable for the 2 of you? Obito asked as he shifted his gaze from Jiraiya to his 2 students. Both of them answered with a nod of their head in the affirmative. Good, then the 2 of you are dismissed. I still have to brief Natsuki and Narumi of the specifics of their training trip, so you may go on ahead. Good luck and have a safe journey. Naruto and Satsuki answered Obito with a small, polite bow before exiting the room together. Now that reliable of the newest generation of shinobi were gone, Obito propped himself up in his chair before switching the 2 files that were in front of him with the 2 that still remained off to the side. He had only given Naruto and Satsuki basic outlines for their respective training trips, things such as when they needed to leave, when they needed to be back, that they needed to send in progress reports every 2 months or so, just the basics such as those. Only these rough outlines were given because he knew that neither of them would slack off in the slightest and wouldn't even waste a single minute of the time off they were granted. Natsuki and Narumi were another story altogether though. Not them precisely, but the one who would be training them. Jiraiya, while one of the strongest shinobi within the elemental nations, had a habit of fooling around too much. To be honest, Obito had his doubts about what the results of this training trip would be, though he chose to have faith in Jiraiya over his gut instinct. Now, why don't we go over the specifics of this training trip? Konoha Main Gates, evening. So this is it, huh? Satsuki asked as she took their first steps outside the village gates. Naruto followed right alongside her after receiving back their documents from the gate guards that were taking the night shift. They really didn't need to exit through the village's gates as they would be traveling to their destination via spacetime ninjutsu. This setting for their departure was something of a nostalgic or a symbolic path rather than a necessary route to leave the village. It had only taken them a few hours to pack up their things out of the apartment in the Uchiha district that they had occupied, and prepare for their departure. The paperwork that had been authorized by the Obito stated that they were to leave the village by the day after tomorrow at the latest. Though there was really nothing left for them to do in the village at this point, so they saw no reason to delay their departure. Yeah, it's gonna be a little weird not having you by my side for an entire year. We've been pretty much inseparable since the day we met. Naruto reminisced as the two of them stopped walking. 1 year. That was how long they had been allowed for this training trip. It would take roughly around 3 years for the Ichibi to reform and the Akatsuki to start moving again, but it just wouldn't be possible for a shinobi to remain outside of the village for such an extended period of time unless it was for a long-term mission. Konoha was still in a tough spot because of the losses that were suffered during the Suna/Oto invasion, and the situation with the Akatsuki only made things more dire. At a time like this where all shinobi would be needed to keep up with the flow of missions and keeping up the village's image of strength, allowing some of the promising genin of this generation to leave for such a period of time was more than generous. The only response Naruto received was Satsuki wrapping her arms around him and burying her here into his chest. He heard her mumble something but he couldn't quite make it out. "Satsuki? You better not slack off without me around," Satsuki declared as she pulled back from the embrace. "I'll be disappointed if you come back weaker than me. An older brother always has to take care of his little sister, you know." Before Satsuki could walk away, Naruto caressed the back of her head and planted a small kiss on her forehead. Satsuki had the decency to blush before letting a small smile grace her lips. "Goodbye then, Satsuki, 1 year from now at the promised place." Naruto released Satsuki from his hold, allowing her to take several steps before she turned around to give him one last smile. "I'll be waiting for you there, Naruto and I." With those words of farewell said, Satsuki went through the hand seals for a reverse summoning, disappearing in a puff of smoke as she landed on the last one. Naruto let out a deep sigh at her departure. He wasn't lying when he said it wouldn't be right without her there with him, but this was something that they both needed to do. As difficult as it was to separate for what they knew would be a long period of time, it would shatter their entire world if they were to lose each other because they weren't strong enough. These most recent events were evidence that such an outcome was all too possible. Knowing that he was simply delaying the inevitable, Naruto activated his Mangekyo Sharingan. These past few days, his right eye had begun to settle down and stabilize, meaning that this new stage of the Sharingan had finally assimilated into his body completely. Tracing the power within his eye into its depths to find the source of such power, he finally felt the pull and small burning sensation he had been looking for. Naruto opened his right eye, revealing what looked to be a red-colored Rinnegan. He felt an incredible surge of power within his body, just like he had that day. Though it seemed that he wouldn't be able to draw upon this eye's full power right away, he could feel that its true power was still sealed within the depth of the eye. He would need to train with and master it first. Though his mind had gone blank after the awakening during the Banero incident, his body recalled what it had done and transferred those feelings to his mind. Even with his inexperience with such a power, Naruto formed a black rift of space that opened up as he concentrated his eye on the space in front of him. Yomotsuhirasaka. Naruto thought to himself, remembering the name of the jutsu from all the times he had seen Kagaya use it in the past. Naruto turned around to get one last glimpse of the village that he was leaving behind before stepping through the portal. He didn't know where it was going exactly, but he would figure it out along the way. It would be a good way to train with such a technique. The portal closed behind him once he was fully inside, leaving no evidence that it was ever there in the first place.